to verify that and to move on. I personally, again, want to thank everybody. This is a Saturday afternoon. It's going to be in the high 60s or mid 60s this afternoon. We chose to come here for the betterment of the town, so I want to thank you all for that. So, all that said, let's get to work, get the job done. The T's have been crossed, the I's have been dotted. Let's get it done today, and let's move on and make this a better town financially. Thank you, Paul.
All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to be going through our financial policies. So as Chairman Bishop had mentioned, we began this process last year in updating our financial policies. Most communities do that around every 7 to 10 years. There have been several meetings with, there was one meeting with the joint group. We've had a number of meetings with the FinCom, the Board of Selectmen, the School Committee. There has been a series of chairs meetings where the chairs of each of the 3 committees have met and sort of teased the document in and out. So that's what we're going to be going through today. We'll sort of proceed in a consent agenda fashion. We'll go through each item. If there's general consensus that we're happy with it, we'll move on to the following item, and at the end, we'll sort of all vote to adopt the financial policies, and then each board, I think, will do that at their next regular meeting. We have a couple of agenda items today, although the main one is to review and approve our financial management policies. A couple other items that are on the agenda is looking at the MOU related to the override. There was one recommendation to talk about free cash and FY20 budget, just so we have everyone around the table. We'll discuss that. And Dr. Thompson and I are going to talk about some budget changes for FY21. I'd love to get into a quick discussion on shared facilities, probably if we have time. I will not be here till 1 or 2 in the afternoon, but I've been very close that we should try to get out of here for 1 or 2. Some of us enjoy getting together on Saturday morning and talking about this So just a couple of grounds as we get started. We're reading on the final part. We are setting policy, comments and formatting, words, everything, language, continuation, etc. That's not what we're discussing today. We'll have a final process where the staff will ensure it looks good and everything is in the right place. The only wording will change is if somebody wants to make a substantive policy change, we say that the objection is, or the recommendation is 9%, we get you 7. Have that debate discussion among yourselves. Somebody make a motion, go from 9 to 7 or 7 to 9. But changing the words to sound better is not really what we're here to do. We're here to focus on that policy. Everyone here is attending with a different level of, different background, a different level of financial expertise, particularly municipal finance. So those of you who are newer, be courteous to your colleagues. Also feel free to ask whatever questions you want, because again, we're all approaching this from different knowledge bases. And as I said, much of the detailed work has actually taken place over the last year, so this is not new. This has been vetted, or everyone has looked at it again and again and said, you know, policy number 12 looks good. So with that, we're jumping right in. As I go through the presentation, I have these up here on the screen. It may be easier for you to read on yours, but the first one, if we're ready to go, is our assessors overlay policy. And just in brief, for everyone who's not familiar with what assessors overlay is, annually we are required to appropriate a certain amount of money to cover exemptions and abatements for property taxes. It's statutory required. This just talks about the assessors actually have the statutory right to approve the overlay. They also have the requirement, they also handle overlays and abatements. What we're looking at is just trying to make sure that there's some balance over a 5-year period, that we're looking at it, we're keeping an idea and keeping an eye on our assessor's overlay. We did have a bump a couple years ago of a few $100,000 up in the overlay. We want to try to smooth those out, but at the end of the day, the overlay is sort of one of those commodity-like costs that we have to do it, and we can set a policy, but at the end of the day, whatever the required number is, we're going to have to raise that number. I met with the Board of Assessors on this policy several this one is probably about 6 months ago. We made some changes. They're fine with the final determination. The second half is just talking about overlay surplus. At sometimes you do build up a surplus in your overlay account where you start looking at you're appropriating, let's say, $1 million a year, and then at some point you realize you're only doing $600,000 a year in abatements. You generate surplus, and at certain times you do want to release that surplus, and we're just saying that if we have to release it, we're going to put that into an override stabilization account to pay for the next 10-year rebound. We really haven't had any surplus released in a long time. That usually means that we're keeping the number pretty reasonable, but sometimes it does happen. Every now and then you have a large drop in your abatements and you build up a little bit of a surplus, and you just need to actually go ahead and move the surplus on. Not to keep us here all morning, but the state changed the way we handled surplus overlay recently. You used to have to keep an overlay account for each year. They've now said you can combine all of your overlay accounts into each year into one single year, which was supposed to be a modernization, but now we've also been told we still have to track it by year, so it's one of those things that the state did but didn't really makes sense. So, questions, comments, overlay surplus?
Is there any proactive thought about the passage of an override and how that might increase the amount of abatements we get?
It may, however, the abatements would only be valid if the actual value of the property isn't accurate. So, if my home's valued at $500,000, my tax bill may go up, and I may say, uh-oh, they've done something wrong, I'm going in for an abatement. But unless they can prove that that home is actually overvalued, it wouldn't make a difference. It could trigger somebody who's always felt that their assessment was fine, and now they're looking at it, and maybe there is a mistake. So you'll see, sometimes you see a genesis in that, but the reality is if the assessments are generally close to reality, you're not gonna see much of a difference. Similar to the CPA, there were a lot of people who all of a sudden wanted to file for abatements with the CPA, but if your property's not actually overvalued or undervalued, it's really not gonna make a difference. Yeah.
During my review of this, I had some questions about the explanation of the overlay surplus.
Yep.
And so I thought that it might be a good idea that we add another paragraph. I did some,
Oh, so are you talking about amending the policy or just adding something to the purpose, or, because if it's something like that, we can deal with that. We need to get agreement on what we want our policy to be today. That's what we're here to do.
this is part of the policy.
Okay.
So I did make copies for everybody, so I'm gonna pass them out, and these are copies of my thoughts on all of the things that we're discussing today, so it would be easier for you to follow along. When I was doing this, I noticed that Mr. Hajar had questions on this same thing about the, I believe it was discussing the stabilization fund versus the, it's mentioned as a stabilization fund in one area, as an overlay account in another area, so we might want to clean that.
So two separate things. The
Yes.
surplus, overlay surplus, isn't a separate account. That's just what's in your overlay. We would deposit surplus when we release it the following year into a stabilization account.
Right.
Is it the same stabilization fund?
It is not the overlay stabilization fund, overlay account, correct?
Correct, those are two
So
separate
that
accounts.
needs to be explained, and I
Okay,
believe
but
that,
do you agree with the policy that we should do that? Because that's what we're here to
should
focus on
we
today, is
do
the
a
policy.
policy for this? Yes, I agree to that, but I don't agree to the wording of
Okay,
the
but
policy.
the wording we're not here to take care of today. If we know what
The
we want to do.
wording,
No, but you
excuse
don't
me.
know to change the wording unless she brings it up.
I'm not going to vote for something that we cannot agree on the wording on.
Okay, but we're here to talk about whether the policy is what we want to achieve. We've gone through a number of rounds of the
We
wordsmithing.
went through one round.
It's gone to the chairs multiple times, it's gone out to your committee several times, so really,
Excuse me, Mr. Mizuko. This is a meeting to approve financial policies that will affect this town.
correct.
And if there is wording in those policies that this group does not agree with, then we should discuss them.
Correct. But my question is it impacting the policy, or is it just wordsmithing to make something clear?
I'm not gonna say
What
it's
policy
wordsmithing.
change would you like to make?
I want to make these changes. I want to add the wording, overlay surplus. The overlay is a reserve the town uses to offset uncollected property taxes and other unrealized revenue resulting from the property tax abatements and exemptions. At the conclusion of each year, the Board of Assessors will submit to the town manager and the finance director an update of the overlay reserve with data that includes, but is not limited to, the gross balance, the potential abatement liabilities, and any transfers to surplus. If the balance exceeds the amount of potential liabilities, the Board of Selectmen may request the Board of Assessors to vote to declare those balances surplus and available for use in the town's capital improvement plan, or any other one-time expense. The references, I believe, are also different. Let me get that. Yes, this assessors overlay and overlay surplus only references one Mass General laws. This references 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Mass General laws.
Do we want to make a change to the wording? Because again, this isn't really that substantive of a policy change.
It explains, it gives people an explanation of part of what is going on during this process.
So essentially, Ian, you're adding a more of a definition
Fine,
That sort
we
of
can put it under
clarifies.
purpose, we can put it under applicability, or we can put it under policy.
So is Ann, is that a motion?
That is a motion. I will put it under,
Can I make a recommendation that
Yes.
if there's a lot of comments like this, maybe we just add a section to each policy that says definition of policy or whatever, and that can be, like you said, dealt with after the fact, if that's something that we have to do to define it, but we can vote on the basic policy. That would, because it sounds like this is gonna be a reoccurring theme throughout it, and that might be helpful for the general public to see that. I agree with Ann on that.
Sure, so, Christina, you have notes for the DOS, do you wanna, I mean, is this what we're looking to do, is just we wanna add the language? There's a statement in here, Board of Selectmen may request, I mean, whether that's a policy, declare these surpluses in the town's capital improvement plan or other one-time expenses. So that's actually different than what's proposed here. So again, are we changing the policy, is that what you want to achieve? If folks wanna do that, that's fine, but that's what we're talking about.
I don't necessarily agree with this as it's been recommended to us by Ann, because it says, you know, basically in layman's terms, if there's an imbalance, we're gonna take it and make it for another use, but you're earmarking it for particular use, town's capital improvement plan. I'd much rather have the
I could-
flexibility
I
to be
could
able to
delete
use it
that.
where we think it should.
I could delete the capital improvement, the direction.
So,
Of
so
the
the
monies.
difference there is when we have overlay surplus, and we may not, we may go 10 years and not have it, do we wanna put it into a fund to pay for the next reval, because every 9 years we have about a $500,000 reval, or do we wanna just say, let it become free cash? You can do either or, whether we wanna be sort of conservative and save that money because we raised it as overlay, we don't need it, but we know every 10 years we have a reval. If we want it to just go to free cash, that's fine. We really need to focus on the policy that everyone wants and not the detail of the wording.
Did yours up there say it goes for the rebound?
The year following the release of overlay surplus, that amount hits the town's free cash, that amount will be allocated to a special purpose stabilization fund to get us ready for the next reval, because we know we just paid $450,000 for a decennial reval. In 9 years, we will be doing that again.
That I believe with, because it's associated with all that work, but
That's fine.
putting it off to the capital improvement plan, I don't necessarily agree.
Okay, I can delete the capital, movement to the capital outlay.
Okay.
So, but is it
Fine the
just
way it
go-
is.
So it really says the same thing that's up there, right?
Do we want it to go to free cash, or do we want to just, the idea is you're sort of putting the money away, because we know come hell or high water, in 9 years, we have to spend money on another 10-year reval. Because this isn't really found money, this is just, I don't even say we've been over budgeting and overlay surplus. We haven't actually had a lot of surplus, but let's say in 3 years, we say, gee, abatements aren't matching up, we've kind of gone through a reval process, we've got some surplus money in there, it gets released to free cash, we want to sort of squirrel it away, because we know we've got to pay for a reval in 10 years, and they're very expensive. Or do we want it to just hit the free cash, and then it becomes free cash? That's sort of the policy decision that we're at. Tom?
So I just think financially it makes sense the way it's written, because it's the same purpose. It's elected for the purpose of the Board of Assessors and what they do and what they control, and this puts away savings fund. So I think it's fine.
Okay.
David?
Well, I like the first part of it, of what Ann is proposing as a definition, but what Tony has written, it talks about keeping it in the, you know, for the semi-annual revaluation, which I think is great, that way we're not hitting one time big in 1 year. But it says if there's money that has fully funded that amount, then anything else will go into free
Sure.
cash, which is, I think, what we want.
We would never have-
We don't wanna keep building up that fund, so it's got like, you know, $2 million in it, just enough to cover the next revaluation, 10-year revaluation. So I like that wording, but I do think the clarifying definition above does help.
Okay, so since we're three body, oh, sorry, Maya.
So I just wanted to say that I think that obviously the most important purpose of these policies is to make sure that we're all on the same page about how we handle our finances. But I think another reason why we were taking on this task right now is because we want the general public to be more confident that we're all in agreement and to have everybody feel like they have more understanding. And I think that, like, you just felt the need to define overlay to this group here. And so I definitely think that the general public would need a definition of overlay. So I am in favor of adding these first few sentences as a definition.
So
How
is that,
about if I make a motion that we include the first part of this, my suggestion, and stop it where it says if the balance, since
Yeah.
it would be the.
Does everyone agree to that?
I'll make that motion.
Consensus vote, we're good
Second.
with it. Next policy. Is everyone good with the assessor's overlay? Is that the,
No, is that, so, I'm sorry, just, because I move slowly on a Saturday morning. The overlay surplus, the overlay is reserved, et cetera, down to, and transfers to surplus.
Yes.
We're gonna add that to what? Purpose?
Sure.
purpose, or we'll have definitions at the beginning.
Yeah.
Really what we
Good
want
enough.
is just a consensus on the
I'm in
policy.
favor.
We can pretty it up down the road, we can add more definitions.
Well done.
Well, just,
We have a, Mr. Chair.
just to get nitpicky, we're saying here that the overlay, the amount of the overlay shall be allocated to a special purpose stabilization. We can recommend that, but only town meeting can do it.
That'll come up throughout many of these policies, and I'm fine with the word shall in many cases, because at the end of the day, you're right, town meeting could decide to do whatever it is they actually want to do, once that money gets released. It's actually the assessor's authority to release it. What we're talking about when we look at our financial management policies is what the Board of Selectmen agrees to do and recommend, what the school committee agrees to recommend to do, the FinCom and the staff. So we shall do that because that's what we'll do. If in May, town meeting doesn't want a fire department, we're not gonna have a fire department. I mean, ultimately, it's their determination. So sometimes we're gonna want strong language, sometimes we're not gonna want strong language. That language is for us. So us collectively, the three, the FinCom, the Board, the Selectmen, and the staff at the school and the town level will sort of guide ourselves by this. This is what we will present to town meeting. This is how we will manage our finances. So we can use those shall languages. At the end of the day, we may never have surplus. We could say, our policy says the surplus goes into a special purpose stabilization account, and town meeting could say, nope, you're gonna pave roads with it, or you're
How
gonna.
about if you just say subject to appropriation by town meeting?
Well, but then we'd be putting that in everything. It's all subject to appropriation by town meeting. We can say we want to keep $6 million in stabilization account. Town meeting could want to give themselves a tax cut and do that, so. Again, this is us. It's all subject to appropriation.
Okay, we'll change it later, don't worry.
Any other questions on the assessor's overlay?
Again, not to harp, but, excuse me, is there an existing, special purpose stabilization fund for the assessors? Is there one today?
Not yet.
So we have to create it, and only town meeting can approve the establishment of that.
Correct. Only town meeting can approve really anything, so.
Right, so at some point, someone has to write an article so that that gets approved to create that fund.
Sure. And that's a relatively simple process to just have town meeting approve it when we're ready. We're probably several years from having overlay surplus if
Don't
we're
need to
going
do-
to
we
have
don't
it.
need to do it till you're ready.
We've just agreed on a policy, so everyone give themselves a little reminder pause. We've gone through one, there's only about 15 more, so let's keep moving. Next one is capital improvement planning. So this one took up some discussion because we do have a capital outlay committee and we do have other capital policies, but this is sort of a general guideline for how we'd approach some capital. It really focuses on capital outlay continuing to do their job according to the bylaw. It talks about our goals. We shall set aside a portion of the budget for capital investment. And it talks about annually that we want to just submit a capital improvement plan. One of the reasons that first statement is in there is one of the challenges towns end up facing when budgets get tight is they'll draw back on capital, and then capital plans tend to fall apart. People stop doing them because they say, gee, we're not really funding them, and we don't have money to do it, and then you kind of get off track, and then you try to fix yourselves years later. So I'm a firm believer, and it's a good sound fiscal practice, that you should always be putting together a capital plan, even if for some reason you get to the end of it and you say, there's no money for anything. We need to be planning, the public needs to be aware of what our needs are, and we need to be able to go to the public and say, look, for X years we've been planning on this and the money hasn't materialized yet, and that needs to be memorialized. So this doesn't get into more specific definitions of capital. Some towns do have a more detailed planning process for capital. We have a bylaw. We would address this first at the bylaw and then with budget balancing, but this is just an overarching, our approach to capital. We're gonna do it every year. We're always gonna plan, and we're also requiring that we submit plans every year, even if there isn't a dollar in funding for capital. Questions?
Yeah, I don't have comfort that this has gone further enough. Our current policy that we voted in 2008 in place, it gives an idea of what a capital project is, and this does not define that. It also says that there's a financial threshold of what is and isn't considered a capital item, and I think that's important that it be, and if it's a policy, that's part of the policy, that's what's guiding us, and I think we should be inserting that here. Myself, it would be something that's gonna have a life expectancy of more than 5 years, and be worth so much money. When we did it last time, it was one half of 1% of non-utility revenue, which in 2008 worked out to an item had to be at least worth $375,000 of value. And I think we should have, if this may be it, if it's something different, fine, but I think it should be stated as part of the policy.
So we discussed that at capital outlay, and we do know probably after town meeting and after the override vote, when things sort of settle down, we do need to take a look at our capital planning process. So this was intentionally left a little on the generic side to just talk about how we sort of manage it up here, because we do have a policy in place, we do have a bylaw. If you like what we can do, because this is also not the end of our financial policies, we're not going to just adopt this and then never look at it again. I've never loved the term living document because you need something to sort of guide you and to take you and look at it. But if that's your recommendation, maybe we insert the current language we have, and then later when capital outlay can sit down, maybe over the summer and the fall, and decide what they want it to look like, we would make any changes there to those specific points.
But that would have to come back to the three boards. If this is a policy that all the boards have agreed to, then anybody recommending a change would have to go back to all three.
Correct, so my suggestion is we insert the current language, and then we're gonna have to spend probably a good 6 months actually deciding what we want capital to look like and what we want the details of capital planning and capital outlay to be. Once we do that, we could then reconvene the group.
I make a motion for what's presented to include from the 2008 document on page 4, capital outlay, paragraph 3 and 4.
Second?
Wait a minute, which one, paragraph what?
3 and 4, line 3 and paragraph, I guess 3
In
and 4.
the existing capital.
2008.
Okay, so, and so everybody knows, because I don't think everybody has a copy of that. That would be, the following criteria will be used to evaluate relative merit of each capital project, that?
And then
and-
the fourth one,
Okay.
which is the non-reoccurring items.
Okay, so let me read those. Projects will foster the town's economy, economic vitality, will preserve the town's heritage and infrastructure, will be consistent with the schedule of adopted plan. Projects which implement a component of an approved plan will receive priority. Projects included in an approval replacement schedule will receive priority. Projects which reduce the cost of operations or energy consumption will receive priority, and projects will not duplicate other public and/or private services. That's 3. 4 is a little easier to read. Non-recurring items which receive 1/2 of 1% of non-utility revenue will be considered a capital item. They give an example as defined in debt policy of FY 2009. Non-utility revenue is $75 million, thus a capital item. I don't know, shouldn't you leave that section out?
No,
When-
my
It can be
recommendation would
updated.
Just,
Go with the existing.
just the math gets replaced with current numbers.
Right, go with the existing policy, because for us to change our whole capital outlay policy, we do need to look at the bylaw, and that's where we're a little different. Not every community has a capital outlay committee established in their bylaws, so we do need to take a little bit more time with it. That's one of the reasons it wasn't included, is there's all these, remember, we've got that bylaw in the back of the mind, that's sort of guiding what we're doing as well as our policy. Tom?
The only reason I don't want to insert that language is because when we adopt these financial policies, this is what the rating agencies look at. And right now, we're violating their policy.
They noted
Right.
that. In several places they noticed that.
Right, so I don't think we should put into this document, it's something that says we're not gonna spend more than every item has to be over $375,000.
To be,
Because we're not,
to be considered a capital item.
Yes.
but I mean, if you look at our capital plan now, we have 1 million items that are under that amount. We would only be talking about fire trucks.
Right.
If we use that language. So I don't mind putting in the wording, but I don't think you should define a dollar amount. I think capital outlay should be items that are 5 years of life or more to be considered. You should make it more broad so that you can't get hurt by the rating agency.
I would agree. I think what we're looking at now is, let's start with the policy we have integrated in the document, and then capital outlay does want to sit down and look at that policy, look at that process. And you're right, because there's 2 schools of thought here. On the one hand is the $50,000 DPW truck capital, maybe or maybe not, but the town of Norwood spends $700,000 a year on vehicles. So from a financial standpoint, from an auditor standpoint, they don't care that we have a police cruiser and a fire vehicle and a rec vehicle and a school van. they look at the value of your vehicle fleet and what are you spending on vehicles. So you're right, it should really be focused more on a 5-year period or a 5-year use of it, because a $70,000 facility job, somebody might say, well, that's not really capital, you're just replacing some ceiling tiles or some carpet. But what if you're doing that in 15 different buildings? You're spending substantial money. So my recommendation, if it goes, at least for now, we'll put the current language in there. Capital outlay will begin after June, working on what they want that language to be. Probably by the fall. We may need to bring something to the town meeting if we do want to adjust our capital outlay bylaw, because remember, we've got the bylaw, and then we've got a specific capital policy, which is more or less how the committee operates, and then we've got our financial management policy. So I guess I agree with both of you, but I just want to make sure we have a process that gets us there. Does that make sense?
Things over here.
What's that?
Well, I was just gonna, you took part of my argument, which was the whole vehicle thing, which when you look at the total, we're well above that. Tom, as chairman of the capital outlay, was trying to put a small group of people together. I think we all got caught up in, we had too much politicking to do to be able to get to that. But he was trying to put a small group together to look at the bylaw itself and try to define it better than what we do today, because Tom pointed out that we're really not following it at all. If everything has to be over $375,000, most everything that is in the capital outlay list individually is under that, except for the big major items. So
Sure.
I wouldn't want to put that language in this, and then, I would rather work with folks like Bill and others to try to come up with a better language, and then propose an updated bylaw that reflects this policy as well, so everything matches. I wouldn't want to just throw it in there just to say, okay, because that's what we have
Sure.
today. Let's leave that off to the side, knowing we have to change it so that we don't have to come back and keep amending.
Okay, so there's consensus. We know we have to look at the capital outlay definitions and a little bit of the process of the capital outlay. I think there's general agreement on that. Roads is another example. A road may be $40,000, but in total, we're spending $1 million on roads. So do we want to insert the current language or keep this the way it is?
My motion's to insert the current language. I think we're here to set goals and policies, and because we're not meeting the current goal, doesn't mean we should lower the standard. We should change our practices to meet those goals.
Can I make a suggestion here? By the way, when Ann read, was paragraphs 3 and 4, there really should be a great big or between the two, and we talked about this at capital outlay last year. So really, it's like, if an improvement meets these, whatever it is, 5 or 6 criteria, that's one thing, or if it meets this dollar threshold, it's another. But perhaps we adopt Bill's motion now, and we'll work on the language later in the year in the capital outlay side and bring it forward.
I think that's fine. Yes, there's a concern about the rating agencies. We're not following our policy. Why do we want to put it into the new policies? But it's actually our current policy as it is. And that's just sort of a stutter step until we get to taking a look at it, which normally we would have already kind of run through, but we have a bylaw, so it's a little bit more complicated.
Can we back up for 1 second? So, can you give an overview of what the purpose of these policies are? Because, so let me ask why I'm asking this question. So, I think that we can all agree that some of the financial policies that have been followed, they've been followed for a reason, but they've led us in a probably not the best place financially and where we are today, right? So is the goal of these policies to kind of right set those policies that were in place to kind of put us best on best practice of how we manage things moving forward? Or is the purpose of this just to set a policy that we want to live with based on the current environment that we work in?
Well,
I think that would be really, really important for everyone to know.
Slight correction on that is, the policies haven't gotten us in trouble. Not following the policies have gotten us in trouble. And we set out to do this originally to update them, to make sure they're current, and also there are a number of things that the current policies aren't even addressing that we figured should be part of the policy. So there's new items in here that were never in the old policy.
For example,
So-
assessor's overlay is
Yeah,
one.
that's
So the
what-
reason I ask this is, to me, reoccurring stuff that's operational, like the purchase of a police cruiser, you have to do that every 10 years. That to me is part of an operating budget as best practice. It's not part of a capital outlay. I agree with Bill that I don't think we should be lowering our standards of what qualifies as a capital plan, because our existing plan includes items that really belong in an operational budget.
Sure.
If the goal of this is to put us on the right financial footing, to start really following best practices, so we manage, if the override passes, our override funds in a manageable way that it lasts 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years.
Can I just real briefly on that, there's actually a little bit of a history to that, Kelly, which is that there was a period late in the last decade where we were borrowing to buy things like police cruisers because we just didn't have the cash to do it. And so the theory was, well, put it on the capital plan so people will know, town meeting will know what we're borrowing and why. And it just sort of stayed on there. And the feeling was, well, when in doubt, leave it on, and people see what they're paying for. But you're right, the Capital Outlay Committee, and I know probably everyone in the room agrees with this, agrees that the rolling stock is, below a certain threshold, rolling stock should be part of your operational budget anyway, and we are moving in that direction. I think we're
Absolutely.
good.
And it's not to say that those still wouldn't find their way into the capital plan. The funding source is just the operating budget, because you're right, a cruiser is about $45,000. We buy 4 a year, now you're looking at closer to $200,000, and our total vehicle investment is around $800,000. So we always want to be cognizant that you can have a capital plan where 30% of the stuff is in the operating budget, and it should be. For an operation our size, a couple of DPW trucks, school vans, we're using free cash to buy school vans. We know we need to purchase 1 to 2 vans a year to keep the special ed fleet up and running. More and more should be in the operating budget, but it still can be part of a capital plan as sort of how are we managing our $800,000 a year in vehicle purchases.
As Tom said, we've been working towards trying to get there because we know we're behind the goals. And something like the override successful will help us get there faster, reset us so that we can move forward in that direction. If the override doesn't pass, it's still our goal, but it's going to take us a lot longer to get there.
Sure. So, Paul, do you want to take comments from the public, or do we want to wait till the end?
We'll wait till the end.
Okay, we'll wait till the end.
I just had one that was pertinent to this conversation.
Is it a quick question?
It's a very simple question. In regards to the capital outlay, I'm sorry, but Kevin, on the policy that's being worked, I'm glad to hear these conversations taking place. In town meeting, when we vote on it, I've continually lobbied in town meeting to say, let's do a line item for each capital outlay, because one could be, for say, a fireworks department project and not something in other aspects. And it's confusing. Therefore, we speak of that at town meeting consistently. The conversations about that separation of line item take more time than the actual discussions.
Sure.
If we had a policy to that effect, it would be beneficial to all.
Sure, that's a discussion for town meeting. That's not a financial management policy. Our rating agencies don't care how town meeting approves capital. We're here to talk about management of the funds as a whole. We're not here to talk about how town meeting would go and approve it. That's a different discussion for a different day.
We have a motion on the floor.
What is
I want to just address, Kelly, sorry, I had a quick question about just going back. In addition to best practices, we adopt financial management policies, not only to guide us and to make decisions, but the rating agencies who determine what our credit rating is, what we have to pay for debt service, look at our financial management policies. And one of the things that's actually changing, to both of your points, is it used to be that they just sort of looked at your policies and they'd say, oh, Teresa's got great financial management policies, good credit rating. Now they're paying more attention to, are you following them? So you don't want to lower your standards. You can't just say, well, our financial policies, we do X and make it so generic and so bland that it doesn't matter. But if you're saying, well, we're going to spend $1 million a year on capital, or we're going to pay cash for anything under this, and you consistently don't do it, they're looking at your management as poor. That's one of the things that rating agencies are doing now that they didn't do before as much, and in particular with OPEB, they're looking at how you're actually managing things. Because just because you happen to have a lot of money in the bank or things look good on that balance sheet, it's how are you managing it? Because as we know, there have been companies in the United States and municipalities gone from lots of money and doing very well and very successful to all of a sudden they're Enron. That was sort of the example. Enron on paper looked good, and then if you actually looked at how they were managing things and playing games with their numbers. So the policies are important. They can't be too watered down. The other side of that is they can't be so strict that we're never going to meet them. In a perfect world, we could say, well, if anything's under $1 million, we never borrow for it. Wish we could get there, probably not going to be able to happen anytime soon. We should have a lot more in the operating budget. We can't just say, oh, just plop it in the operating budget. I wish we could, but it's not as simple. So we need that balance between, they can't be so strict that we're never going to meet them. They can't be so watered down that there's no point in meeting them. We got to find that balance in the middle, but we have to actually follow that. So, Ann?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you,
Nope.
but just.
Sometimes you
could
have to, I
somebody
won't stop.
Yeah. I got it. Would somebody restate the motion, please?
to add the current policy into this, until we have a chance to sit down
So add
and.
Well,
3 and 4
3 and
of the
4.
current policy onto this statement.
Okay.
Again, we can look at these every quarter or every 6 months. You don't wanna constantly be changing them, but this is not, oops, we've done it and we can never change our financial policies again.
Move the question.
So, move the question. There's been a motion made and a second. Does everyone want to include it as is? Raise your hand. That looks like a majority. Now down to 2.
No, I have a question.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, it was separate, somewhat related. So, in the spirit of the conversation that was going on, the third line in the policy, the town should set aside a portion of the annual operating budget annually for capital investment. Do we want to set a goal there?
We
As a
should at some
percentage.
point, that's another one of those aspirational goals that, we squeezed a little bit of money into the budget last year and then we kind of hit a hard stop. Now, the challenge there is, somebody could go to a rating analyst and say, well, there's $1 in the budget for capital, therefore, we've got money in the budget for capital, we're meeting our policy. And a rating analyst would say, well, $1 doesn't do anything. If you can throw something in the budget and you're doing something, at least we're meeting that goal. What we can do over time, and we'll need to get into a little bit more detail with our policies over time, is we would set our goals and then match up our goals every year and see, well, where are we? And we've tried to do that. The problem is you try to grow this way and then you kind of get a hard pushback, and you try to grow this way and you get a hard pushback. We should have $500,000, $1 million built into the budget for some of these capital items. We don't have that flexibility. The same thing with facilities. We should have a general facilities line in the budget to take care of a lot of the smaller projects that go on. I mean, we're putting not only into the capital plan, but we don't have money in the operating budget to do a small amount of work in most of our buildings. We kind of just keep things up and we patch them.
But the question is, should we be setting an aspirational goal?
You mean a dollar amount?
A percentage makes more sense, right? Or a dollar amount, but if the goal here is we're supposed to be creating financial policies that we all agree to live to, we know that we need, as has already been discussed and agreed to, a recurring capital, operational capital budget. Many of the other policies in here do have percentages attached to them, so it would make sense to me that we would set a goal, even if that is a very small goal, even if it means we could go back and historically look at a trend over the past 5 years to set that goal, so we don't have to set the number today. But I guess I'm making a motion as
I
to
would
what.
say we should, but we should take that in context of looking at our capital as a whole when we look at our bylaw and the more detailed capital policy. Because here again, we say we should budget a number for capital. What I'm mainly referring to is there should be a line item in the budget that says basically cash capital, and that's money we take and put towards our capital plan every year. We have police cruisers in the budget. Is that capital in the budget? Depends on how you want to look at it.
That's in line 930 something.
Yeah.
I'm opposed to that. We have to have a discussion about that, but that's not really necessary for here. Is that part of this policy?
It says that we should be putting cash in the budget for capital expenses.
It says we're setting aside a portion of the annual operating
Yeah.
budget, and I'm asking for
I
more
disagree
definition
with
around
that
portion.
entirely. We had that problem last year, and we should take that out of any budget plan for this year, because you appropriate, identifying in your budget, and then we immediately go and appropriate it under capital. That's just setting it aside in your planning at the beginning of the budget process, that you're gonna put so much towards your capital. It doesn't need to have a separate line in the budget. And if you're trying to build it up over time and get a big balance there so that you don't have to borrow and you can use that money you've saved up, then that should be a stabilization account set up, not something in every year's budget, because every year's budget, if you don't immediately use it, at the end of the year, the clerk just swipes it out of there anyhow.
Right, the idea would be that you'd have a line item towards your capital. So your capital plan comes forward, and you know you have some small items, maybe you have a $100,000 piece of equipment, you have some larger items, you need a $700,000 fire truck, and then maybe you're doing a new school's probably a bad example, but a new roof on a building, so it's a big amount of money. How do you fund that? Well, some of it should be free cash, some of it's always gonna be borrowing, and then some of there should be some flexibility in the operating budget every year to take care of some of those
But
items.
it's,
Whether it's one line or in the
when
operating.
you're setting the operating budget, the amount of money that you're talking about putting in that line item in the budget, you just set it to the capital item. And if you're talking, if your purpose of trying to put money in the budget, as I said, is to accumulate over time, then you can't do that in the budget, because at the end of the budget year, it gets taken away because you didn't use it.
It's not designed to accumulate over time. So there's currently $250,000 built into the budget. In a perfect world, that number would be higher, so that every year we know we've got this much flexibility in the budget to address our capital needs. The rest is gonna have to come from free cash or borrow.
But we've just set up the budget this year.
Yep.
Everyone hasn't necessarily totally voted on it, but it's pretty much put together.
Sure.
And it includes capital items. The money in there is for capital items. Last year, I tried to put it in a special line got all confused, and they said, oh no, we're gonna appropriate that right now to this budget. So what we basically
part of
did
that-
is ended up with extra
part
money,
of that bill was
200,000 that we didn't use.
There was an incorrect explanation given at town meeting, we spent 25 minutes walking back that explanation. What you wanna prevent is the budget doing this every year, so you're trying to target a level that says this is the amount of cash we should have
I
available.
agree, but that's in the budget process, not in
Well,
appropriation.
but again, the idea is that we should be targeting a cash level, not just saying, well, this year do 300, next year do 500, the year after do 175. We should be targeting a portion of the operating budget that's allocated to capital.
That would be in policy, and then we implement it during the budget process, not a line item in the budget.
That would be number 4 in the capital outlay policy that is our existing policy, as Bill tried to discuss. Non-recurring items which exceed 1/2 of 1% will be considered capital items. You know, and
I think we're having confusion as to what the purpose of this is. Is this a fund that we're allocating money from our operating budget to build over time to?
This is not a fund. It is
Right.
not-
Okay.
and that's the problem, is last year at town meeting, somebody said, yes, it's a fund, and then we spent a half an hour walking back that it's not a fund. What percentage of our budget is allocated to capital? We currently actually, other than police cruisers, both on the school side and the town side, we don't have anything in the budget allocated to capital.
We do. When we usually used to be, we're changing the format of the warrant, but it always was Article 11, capital items. And we appropriated it.
Yep.
So you don't need it in the Article 5, the budget, because you're doing it over here. We were doing it in 2 places.
So forget about the warrant at town meeting for a minute and think about just the town's budget. Where's the line item where we have money for capital? We don't currently have one. We're throwing it into different departments, but that's
We
creating
do,
that.
and we're
We
setting the
do.
budget at annual town meeting. You've got Article 5, you take Article 11, at the end of the year, that's your budget. You just appropriated it.
But traditionally, Article 11, we've funded either from free cash or from borrowing. We haven't funded it from the operating budget, right? So I think that was the idea, was that we would say, let's fund some of this from operating budget.
Operating budget is, as I keep trying to say, I'm not saying it clearly, I guess, is if it's in your policy, and when we sit down at the beginning of the year, here's our revenues, what are our expenses? Our policy says of those revenues that we've identified, 2%, whatever, is gonna be capital. Boom, it's done.
What we're
And you
saying,
go to your capital and decide what those items are gonna be.
Right.
If you put it in the budget, it can't get to capital that same year, and it can't be saved to accumulate for previous years, because at the end of the year, if it hasn't been spent, it's gonna be swiped away.
we're not saving for, this is not about saving for future. Tom?
Well, I know Mr. Plasko said it didn't get into budget, but really, it was used last year. So what we did was, these are not the right numbers, but say that the whole capital article on Article 11 was $1 million, and we appropriated $750,000 in the capital Article 11 because we already had $250,000. We still had $1 million worth of projects that we did.
Right, but
So
that
we
two,
did
the
use
250 you're talking about, we put in that line item.
Right.
But it's ridiculous, because it's that same line item in the same budget.
Right,
So if you just identify that
Yeah.
250 and vote it here, you don't have to vote it twice.
Well,
you'll vote
I
it
think
once.
the whole purpose of setting up 250, with the original plan was 250 that year, 500 this year, 750.
Right,
Right.
build
So
it up.
that would
So that would
squeeze,
be
so that
policy.
eventually you'd have it in the, most of the recurring items would be within the base operating budget.
Right.
But remember, so
that
think,
would be policy, and then we would follow it, and then we would do it under the
But
capital
you said
plan.
earlier, we didn't
But
use
there's
it.
no need to put
We
it
did.
in the budget.
Well, the problem with the 250 last year was just appropriated as $250,000. There were no specific projects associated with that in the actual budget. We had to go back, to Article 11 afterwards to identify the particular projects. I think the problem is that if you identified particular projects in that 250, there would have been no confusion at all.
Right.
And I think that's what the intent is to set aside a certain amount of money every year in the operating budget for specific capital
well,
projects.
so,
So
but
we
we're
do that
targeting a
on
dollar
Article
amount,
11.
not the specific project. So
Yeah.
take a step back and think of what capital comes before the town to approve every year. How do we then fund it? You need to have funding from different sources. Some is free cash, some is the operating budget for non-recurring items, but still could be money in the operating budget, and then some is always gonna be borrowing. You're always gonna borrow for larger projects. The way most communities approach their capital planning is here's what we need to achieve for the year. How do we fund it? Here's our various sources that we're funding it. And some of that should be sort of an off the top or off the bottom contribution from the operating budget.
Yeah.
The way, the further west you go and then the financial management structure of towns is different, they will say our capital budget is $6 million a year. The projects come and go, but they have $6 million a year for capital, or whatever it happens to be, I'm making that number up.
Got your capital plan here.
Yes,
There's items that are gonna be borrowed, there's items gonna come from free cash, there's items gonna come from CPA.
correct.
There's nothing that's gonna come from taxation.
And hasn't for
That
years.
line would be taxation.
So,
Correct.
so to Bill's point though, we could change the capital outlay plan that we have.
And put it in that line.
And one of the funding sources, you know, for a couple of the specific things could come from that portion. So in other words, you don't have to use as much free cash, right?
That's the goal.
Correct.
The idea is that the budget
So
needs to
maybe that's
have,
all we have to do is change.
You know what might help, not only people here, but people at home? Can you roll that screen up, that under policy, the section that we're talking about isn't really showing. It should be the last paragraph, I think, in
Right there.
policy?
It's the bottom one.
Yeah. And that goes a little further, Tony, can you, or is that gonna mess things up? Yeah.
No, it does, it gets cut off, yeah. There it is.
Ah.
So, last year, as Alan just said, we had a line for capital items, but we didn't have any items.
Right.
And this year, so far, I don't think we have any capital items identified yet.
well,
So we
that-
either
So
should
we're
say that
putting-
some of the capital items are gonna be covered by taxation and
Yeah.
put them in that article.
Right, exactly, that's what
Or-
I'm saying, yeah.
Or
So if
or
you
not
want the
have it
warrant to be-
because it's a waste if you don't
if
have
you want the
items
warrant to be
identified.
structured differently, we could do that differently. Again, what most communities will do, and I know there's a discussion here in town about, do we adopt every line item, every capital item by the line? What a lot of communities do is, their capital is one article, it's this is what we're doing, and here's the funding sources.
Well, that's
Budget,
Article 11.
which to your point, taxation,
So I'm saying have one up.
I'm off, but believe me, I'm fine with one article. For our policy though, we're just saying that, I guess to your point, Bill, yes, should some of our capital come from taxation? Every year, what are we putting up for some capital? Because you're gonna have a $400,000 project that comes up every 6 years, I don't know, 16 years or 60 years. Should the budget have some flexibility to accommodate it? It's where we wanna get to, because what we wanna do is borrow for larger projects and not just have to borrow for the smaller projects. So departments should have their recurring costs built in, but I'm not gonna have a $500,000 capital cost built into the rec budget. I mean, other than facility work, there's no real need for them to do it. Police, it's realistically, they're cruisers. The DPW, it's the cruisers. The schools should have their vehicle fleets built in. That money that we had in the budget last year, the initial proposal this year, because that's actually still built into the budget, is that would be money for the facilities department, because they need some working capital if we're gonna have a functioning facilities department.
Well, but none of what you just described requires a separate appropriation in the budget, though. That's why, I thought it was confusing last year, too, where we set up a line item and then we turned around and appropriated. Why would we go to all that trouble? I mean,
I think part of it's that this.
Well, let me just finish it.
Sorry.
The 250 probably is best used, as you just described in your last sentence, which is, it's money that'll, if we do have a shared facilities department at some point, that's where that money goes. So as long as we don't require town meeting appropriation for what the facilities department calls a repair or, some sort of upgrade, that's better use of that money than to bring it in and say, we're gonna use it for police cruisers and turn around and not put it, just forget that line item. The money is, you're just doing a two-step process, as Alan said, for a one-step procedure.
So
Thank
it
you.
sounds like we're in agreement that this town should be setting aside a portion of its annual operating budget for capital investment. Right, that's kind of what we just, yeah. I still have the question of, should we set a goal for how much the town should be putting aside
Well,
from its annual budget?
You know what, Joan, that's a good point, though, but the question really is, as Bill points out, do we do it at all? Or do
I thought I was hearing consensus. If I'm not, I apologize.
No, well, because Bill's saying if you put it in the operating budget, it can only be used in that operating year.
Okay.
So otherwise, if you want to set up a separate fund, that's a different matter,
But that's also not, we're not talking about a separate fund here.
Well, that's exactly the point, but right, so that's why I think probably either we keep that sentence in or we take it out, the town shall set aside.
So I think my recommendation, some of the capital plan every year should come from taxation if available. We should have funds available. We don't, the same reason we don't have operating budgets in there. We should do it. How do we get there is the is the question. In the warrant article, I think that was probably not placed in the best place in the warrant, and there was some information that went out that it just became confusing at town meeting. To your point, you look at an article and say,
It's gonna be perpetually confusing if you put it in the budget and then turn around and immediately appropriate.
here's the thing, the way most towns do that is.
I don't care how most towns do it.
I know, but remember, it was confusing because of the way we chose to do it. You put all your capital in one article, and then you're approving the funding from
That's
multiple
my point.
sources.
It was confusing because of the way we chose to do it.
But if you put a lump of money in there, it's gotta have a purpose for a fire truck,
Right.
for this, not just a lump of money. It's called for capital projects. You gotta have projects in there.
You're talking about in the warrant, right?
Yeah.
That can be done.
No, in the motion, the town meeting.
Right.
I think I agree with what Alan was saying, where we should be allocating a percentage of our operating budget for capital expenses. Those capital expenses may not be defined during the budgeting process, but when we go to town meeting,
Correct.
that money will be allocated to specific projects that might cross a broad spectrum of budgets. There might be trucks for the school, there might be police cruisers, there might be facility management.
Correct.
That's the purpose of it. It's to have pre-planned spending so that it's predictable, like you said, and we're not fluctuating or all of a sudden saying, now we have to grab free cash, now we have to grab free cash, now we have to grab
Right,
free
so
cash.
the idea is-
That's my understanding of what's being
Here's your
said, or
point.
what Alan said.
Right,
Here's your capital
correct.
plan, and here's how you're funding it. Free cash is always a little different, borrowing is always a little different. We should have a base amount that we know we have available every year to cover the capital expenses that we know are coming forward. So to the original question was, should we be setting an amount in this policy? My suggestion is we should leave it as it is, because when we take up looking at our actual bylaw, that's when we would then be able to come back with a recommendation and say, okay, we've looked at everything, we've looked at what we consider a capital project, what we should borrow for. Yes, we should target a goal of X dollars.
So I'm uncomfortable with it if we don't at least have a plan around what portion we're gonna
I
allocate.
just think that we're adding two sections, we're adding two sections from the current, but we know we're gonna revisit this whole thing again from the bylaw up to ensure that we're being consistent, and I think the word "or," like Tom was saying earlier, needs to be in there, because right now, we're not following the policy at all, because there's no "or," so it's making like this is what you need to do. I think this whole thing does need to be revisited, but in the context of with the bylaws, so that we're in sync. So it doesn't matter to me for this round whether it's in or out, because it can always be changed. We know we're gonna come back and look at this again. So I just think we should just move on, and knowing that we're all gonna come back and have probably a better crack at it once we try to sink in the bylaw.
Right, and the capital is a little bit more complicated because there is a
It is.
bylaw, so
It
we
is.
can't have a policy that edits the
Right.
bylaw.
Right.
All right, so did we vote to add sections 3 and 4?
Yes.
We did.
Yeah.
How did I vote?
Now
No,
we're
wait,
now we're on to the next thing.
Okay,
all right,
so, are we set with this as it is?
yeah. that's
So
fine.
I need to be, I'm sorry, I'm not clear. So we are saying we are going to set aside a portion, and we are fine without setting a goal for what that portion of the town's annual operating budget
We're
will
gonna
be.
wait for further recommendation in the
Right.
future to modify this again, but for now, we've just identified that that's a goal. And do what you're saying
Wouldn't know what to
later.
put in there.
Just to let everybody know, I just read through the bylaws, and in the bylaws, it doesn't say that, it tells you what the capital outlay is supposed to be doing and that sort of thing, and it does not mention anything about funding in the bylaw. It's just
It says you're supposed to recommend funding.
Yeah.
That's what the capital outlay committee does.
recommendation for scheduling financing of capital outlays.
But they're gonna go back and talk about maybe even amending that bylaw.
I was just gonna say that I agree that at some point we need to define this portion, but I think that we do need to look at the trends, and we need to be a little bit more clear on the definition, because would you say that the police cruisers that are currently in the budget, would that count towards this portion? And so I think there's like a little bit of confusion there, so I think for now I'm in favor of keeping it generic.
Yeah, 1/4% of the revenue or 0.5% of the revenue, depend when you get that definition.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
The-
Motion to accept then? Can we do, is that what you, I'm sorry, was looking for a motion to, oh, I'm sorry.
I think we're not changing it. Is what-
Yeah,
I-
yeah.
I don't want to make a
Right.
motion to not change it. I have one more question. I think it's just simply a clarification question. So it's about paragraph 2, items that should, last sentence, items that have been added generally should be added to at the 6-year mark unless pressing matters require the item to be advanced to a close year. I wanna make sure I'm reading this right. So the capital outlay committee will be the determining factor of whether or not a project is pressing?
Yeah,
And
Ultimately,
to put forward and.
yeah, to move it, that's what I'm saying, to advance it, so the capital outlay
They-
committee
Right,
makes
we
that
propose it to
determination.
town meeting, that's right.
But that's your proposal, that's that committee's authority, is to make that recommendation around where things should fall on that 6-year mark?
yes,
Yes.
to defer to capital outlay.
That's fine, I'm just trying to get clarification.
At town meeting, I mean, that's,
Correct.
they're right.
And
And then-
remember that the
yeah.
warrant that goes to town meeting is ultimately the selectmen's warrant, so capital outlay could say the next most important project is to buy a, I always use a joke. with a
Sewer
mansion,
vac
not a-
truck.
To buy a sewer vac truck, and town meeting could say, nope, we want
Yeah.
to, you know, pave the roads with gold, or whatever it happens to be, but we generally defer to capital outlay for them to say, okay, we think this is what's next. I mean, that recommendation first comes from the staff.
Yep.
So if I were to say that, you know, new carpet in the town manager's office is the town's #1 priority, capital outlay might say, you know, maybe we should fund, fix a leaky roof first, and then, you know, go to the board of selectmen and everyone say, you know, what do we actually think our priority is? Again, town meeting could go with the manager and put new carpet in my office instead of buying a sewer vac truck.
And what's the representation on capital outlay committee?
Ann has the bylaws.
These are just
One
it's,
school
three
committee,
major
one
boards,
FinCom,
the general
breakout,
manager. No, not-
library.
Okay, so everybody who would have a stake in this is represented on that committee. That was a newbie
Yeah,
question.
not
Thank you.
nine voting members, nine voting members and 4 ex officio.
Okay, thank you.
So, and to your point, I mean, the reality of the situation will always dictate what moves up. We had a culvert collapse, that's on the special to borrow money to fix that culvert. That's always gonna be first on the list,
Yep.
as opposed to, you know, new carpet in the manager's office, which is, I make a joke about it now, I'll never get a carpet in my office now. Not that it needs it, it's actually relatively new. Any other questions on, capital improvement planning? Next, we have our debt management policy. And one of the things that's important to know about debt management is this is largely statutory in nature. Some of it's about the limits we want to set, but we also have sort of statutory debt limits. Any questions or comments? Again, you know, the term of any debt cannot exceed the expected useful life. That's actually required under statute. This is one of those policies that rating agencies really like to see, but our hands are a little tied here. We can try to get to a certain number, but debt management's often statutorily controlled.
Trying to get a couple of questions. One in the first sentence where it talks about the reference of long-term debt, can we clarify, again, for policy, what we're meaning when we say long-term debt? I just think whether you put it in
Which-
brackets behind in the very first sentence, the purpose of this policy is to establish guidelines and measures governing the use of
Oh, so
long-term
I
debt.
would say it's actually 5-year, because we would never borrow before for less than 5 years, but we say long-term borrowing because we actually generally don't do short-term cash flow borrowing. And what that is that's sort of the borrowing to meet your payroll, because our money, like a lot of businesses, doesn't come in all at once, it doesn't come in evenly every month. We get chunks of money different times of the year when tax bills go in and out. We actually generally don't do, Tom, I don't think we've done cash flow borrowing.
You know,
Mainly because of the light department, we don't have to do what we would call short-term borrowing or cash flow borrowing. Many towns do, we have the benefit of commingled funds with the light department, so that actually saves us some money, although cash flow borrowing isn't
Okay,
very
now
expensive.
you answered the question, that's good, I think it should be in there. 2, in section 3, where you say, the town will adhere to the statutory debt limit of 5%. 5% of what? It
I
should
think
say-
that's actually 5% of your assessed value is the statutory debt limit. So,
I just think it should
I don't think so. I think it was supposed to be 5% of the operating budget.
so.
The
here,
non-utility
our-
operating
Our
budget.
policy is that the state has a statutory limit on how much money you can borrow. There's actually the statutory debt limit and the statutory double debt limit. We're nowhere near that.
Right.
They're just saying that you can't borrow a certain amount. I think it's 5% of your total assessed value, which, so for us, I mean, that number would be.
I mean, do we even have to say that if it's, within state law? I think the
Again, that's
intent.
one of the things that the rating agencies
Yeah.
like to see. You like to say that, look, we would never exceed this, even though the state tells us you can't, although there is the double debt limit, so.
Mhm.
And maybe this line was intended to go with the current policy, maybe not, but in the current policy, we had set, back in 2008, we had said that our debt service would be, non-utility debt service would be maintained at approximately 5%.
Of non-utility revenue, isn't that what it says?
Right.
Correct.
Not operating budget,
Right.
non-utility revenue.
Right, that's
Right.
right, yeah.
That's a lower number.
Yep.
So that, it it's almost like a shared cost. You'll always have $5 million or whatever it is, and right, that's built right into your budget, and it's going to address your capital items. So the wording here was the town will maintain an annual fund debt service levels at a target range of approximately 5% of current non-utility revenues, except for the debt excluded tax revenues. And then it goes on a little bit from there. Maybe we should just put this line 4
That's
in.
probably a good idea. And remember that so we are talking about two different numbers here. When we refer to the statutory debt limit, again, that's the maximum amount of money the state would ever let us borrow. We are nowhere near that. The state just sets these limits for cities and towns to make sure you just don't go into a complete financial mess where we're borrowing $50–60 million every year, and then all of a sudden we end up sort of bankrupt, and as a political subdivision, the Commonwealth would have to bail us out, although if you intend to do that, they won't bail you out.
I think it's critical that we add that line,
Yep.
that
Yeah.
we keep it.
So I make a motion that we add under the line that says town will adhere to statutory debt limit, that we add
Further,
number 4 on page 2 of our 2008 debt policy.
And that's an upper limit that Mr. Plasko is referencing, so we
Yeah.
always talk about that's not a goal.
Right.
So our goal is
Thank
not,
you.
all right.
Thank you.
You know, only 4% of the operating budget is debt, what do we wanna go borrow for? Let's find things to do, so that's an upper limit, but it's not a goal.
Actually,
Also-
Tony,
also-
you,
Also says approximately, so it can vary a little.
Tony
It
had,
should say up to.
Yeah.
Up to, yes, that was in my notes.
Yes.
Tony had an
Up to.
idea at some point, we talked about it last year, which is that you sort of use this, perhaps it's not I don't know if it's really a policy we ought to put in writing, but you take that 5% of non-utility revenue, subtract what your debt service will be, and take the rest and put it aside in some sort of a shelter for paying down future debt, so that your debt is constantly going down. I don't know if that's a good idea or not. I mean, again, it's
It is, because one of the things you wanna look at is what a lot of towns will do. You never wanna feel good about your budget because you saw a savings that's not a real savings. So you go into a year and great, we paid off the bond for the police station, everyone says, oh, there's $600,000 more in the budget, let's go spend it and let's do this. And then a year later, you're saying, all right, well, we need to remodel one of the elementary schools, so we have money to do it. No, we spent all those savings. So the idea is if you have a drop off in your debt service one year, you say, okay, we know maybe we're not borrowing this year, and we don't wanna borrow for the sake of borrowing. We'll be borrowing in maybe 2 years for a project that we're coming up with. Well, let's take that, pay down some other bonds, and then in that third or fourth year, you're going to be in a better position financially overall. You'll overall compress your total debt payment that way, because again, we don't want to see our debt schedule go like this, and then, oh, it drops, it's great, and then it's gonna jump back up. Again, we wanna prevent the peaks and valleys in the budget. And over the summer and into the fall, we're gonna come up with more of a sustainable debt model and a debt management model, but you also don't wanna move projects around when you're borrowing just to make your model look nice and convenient. You don't wanna say, well, we're gonna remodel X elementary school this year or put a new roof on it. Well, do it 2 years earlier just because we wanna do it 2 years earlier. I mean, if there's a need to and you can advance a project, that's one thing, but we don't wanna say, yeah, let's just go ahead and you know, do it so that our number stays stable. So some of those years where you have a drop off, you might say, okay, let's use that, allocate it to pay down some debt service early. That way in 2 or 3 years, when you do have a borrowing coming up, you're sort of staying stable. And that's what a lot of these policies, the assessor's overlay, capital in the budget, that, an action like that, that's what it's designed to do, is to try to have some of that stability, prevent the peaking and the valleying of the budget.
Which is, you know, what occurs to me, I think non-utility revenue is projected to be about 110 million in the upcoming year, so that would leave you at about 5.1 or 5. I forget, 105, 110. So, and I think we're gonna, operating debt service about 3.6 for the upcoming year, so you're kind of well below it. But again, you're right, that's good.
You don't have to have that as a goal.
We're not chasing
Yeah,
it
it's not
5%.
In time, what we can do is we can take our financial policies and you create a matrix and you look at it every year of, are we meeting our goals, are we meeting our targets? And, you know, maybe that 5% is the upper limit, and maybe we say that, you know, at some point, 4% is kind of our target. We, you know, if we're spending less than that, then why are we spending less than we should? We don't want to not invest in our infrastructure. And you put that on a spectrum and you say, all right, did we meet our target this year? Did we not meet our target this year? Did we exceed our target? Are we making progress towards our target? So eventually we'll be able to tie this up with some financial performance indicators to say, okay, here's what we sort of set up to do. Are we meeting it or are we not meeting it? And then what are the warning signs? Well, all right, well, we're at 3.6 million and 5 million, just conveniently that 5 million and 5% happen to be pretty close. We're at 4.8 million, all right, well, we're a little bit higher than we want to be. We're at the high end. Why is that? Okay, well, we borrowed for an important project. If we're at 5.2, at one point, you've got sort of a crisis issue there.
Yeah, I mean, the reason we haven't been at, you know, at 5 million or 5% in any given year is because fiscally, we couldn't afford it. Because, you know, you take, you know, $1.5 million out of the budget to put into the debt service, well, that's $1 million to, you know, $1.5 million less you can give the general government and the school. So it really depends on a budgetary situation, whether or not we can get up to that 5% or $5 million at any point in the future.
Right, in the need. Again, it's not a
Right.
goal to just say that we should always be spending that much on debt. If we don't have a need for it,
Right.
we're doing well and everything's reasonable.
Right.
We don't spend
That's
money.
why
so
it's
spending money.
it's a goal, not an upset limit.
Can I say one thing about section 3 policy, the first line, I have the
Yeah.
same feedback, Selectman Plasko had about significant capital projects. I think we should define what that means.
So we,
Well, that would be defined in the other section.
But it should reference that section.
Yeah.
we can add a as defined in X as
That's
a
cool.
line. The other thing is, again, we actually, depending on your size and scope, you really can only borrow for, I guess you're right, significant in a borrowing sense versus significant in our capital plan would be different.
Two things.
Borrowing as defined in the capital plan.
That's cool, that's
And-
totally
and I know that language could be restrictive if we ever had an emergency, but if we had an emergency, that's a different situation. That's why you have an emergency is an emergency.
So where are you putting this borrowing for what?
So I
First
think we should
sentence
add a
of
line that
section
says something like, as defined in, the town's capital,
plan.
capital plan, capital improvement process.
I'll make a motion to that effect.
And to include the, Mr. Plasko's language, we already included
And
that.
to include
It's
Mr.
all-
Plasko's
yeah.
language.
All right, so both of them, everyone in favor of both of those changes?
Yeah,
All right. Sounds like unanimous vote or close enough.
And you're
Moving
also
along
clarifying
quickly.
long-term debt.
Yeah, we'll add in the, yeah, 'cause we can't borrow for less than 5 years. And again, to the point of where we're trying to craft a document that both makes sense for borrowing agencies, but is somewhat understandable for the public as well. We can include a separate, eventually we'll conform our budget to a different, budget system that will have a lot of these definitions in the budget, not in the budget itself, but as part of the whole budget document, then our financial policies would be in there. So these terms will then be in that total vocabulary, so when we look at our financial plan every year, it's our budget, it's our capital plan, it's our financial management policy, it's all together sort of in one. But it's a challenge to how much you include that it then becomes unreadable for the average member of the public, where you say, well, we've got a 38-page policy on debt management, and eyes glaze over.
I
All right.
I have one other thing to add.
Yeah.
And I want to add this because the rating agencies do look at these
Right.
things, and I want to make sure that we give ourselves a little leeway when we're developing our policies and when we implement policies. So, in the second section, under policy, the second line, starting with, the town will refrain from using debt to fund any recurring, operating and maintenance expenditures.
Which
And-
we're actually prevented from doing anyway.
Which is,
Yeah, you can't do that by law.
Yeah, so just to make sure, real, sorry, I don't want to trouble, just so everyone knows, we don't borrow the way the federal government does. We are not allowed by law to borrow to operate. So if we have a deficit this year, we can't just borrow $3 million to cover that deficit. That's not allowed.
Right, we know that, but can we
Yeah.
finish, let Ann finish
Yep.
what she was saying?
But I just
well,
wanna make sure-
I was just going to add whenever possible, but, you know, it's fine. But we
I think
already
we
have to,
legally could do
so
it
we have to
anyway.
by
It's
law,
not
so
something by law you can do anything.
we don't need it. Never mind.
Yeah, but just so everyone's on the same page, we're not allowed to borrow to operate, nor could we, you know, it says something about maintenance expenses, we couldn't say, well, can we borrow money to pay the electric bill for the next 2 years, we're not allowed to do that. The federal government just borrows, they allow whatever they want. Any other questions on debt service? Sorry, I think
So,
it was,
could we review what we're changing here, please?
So it was, we're just gonna clarify the, long-term is 5-year, which is statutory. We're gonna add the language about the town's debt limit is, 5%. Our own sort of target is a maximum of 5% of the non-utility operating budget.
Non-utility
Paragraph,
Revenue.
paragraph 4 of the current debt plan.
And then, Tom, what was the other small change?
Have wording as defined in the capital plan.
Yeah.
Yep.
Tony, as we move to the next one, I have a question about something you said. You said eventually we're gonna have a dashboard with indicators so we can measure our financial health. Does a dashboard currently exist? And if not, when will what's the target for those dashboards to exist?
Do we use a dashboard? Not currently. Do models exist out there? Yes. Could we build a model with financial indicators? Yes, we'll get there. It's probably gonna take us in the next year and a half. One of the things that's occupying a lot of our time right now, in addition to the budget balancing work, the regular budget process, the override work, is also adding on that we're going through a software conversion, which is a nightmare. It's not that it's not going well, it's just, it's
a
occupying.
conversion.
Yeah, so I'd like to say for next year's budget process, we could have some indicators. There is a trainer I'd like to bring in, a colleague of mine who's a sort of an expert in looking at your financial indicators and what you should be targeting. That's ultimately the goal, is we've not just changed our software and our budget document, but to start looking at that every year. And there's multiple indicators that you can look at, and then every community has to decide sort of, well, what indicators are relevant to us, what makes sense to us.
So we're looking at a year or 2 years to get to the dashboard type thing for, okay, thanks. Yeah, it was just a point of clarification.
Not a problem. So, the fee policy. And this is more internal than it is as opposed to rating agencies, but it's also good when you're on the call with them to be able to say, if Dave, did you have a?
Yeah, just somehow, you know, we can wordsmith or whatever, but the school committee sets fees for schools.
Yeah.
So, and this doesn't,
This has no impact on who statutorily sets fees.
Right.
Again, what this is it's an agreement among everyone, the administration, so you and I, the elected officials, the school committee, the board of selectmen, and the finance commission, that we're always gonna be looking at this, and we're always gonna try to be up on top of it. We don't want fees necessarily to go so long without being reviewed. The Board of Health actually has statutory authority to set their fees. The school committee sets a lot of their fees. There's some fees that are statutorily set that we don't have any control over. I think the airport commission statutorily can set some of their fees, but we just wanna say, as one entity, as one organization, one town, one whatever, we wanna look at our fees, we wanna look at the fees that we're charging, we wanna make sure that they're fair and that they're equitable. What we don't want to happen is the school department, for instance, every year to have to raise the sports fee, and we're not raising the liquor license fee for 20 years. And we do raise fees, we have raised the liquor license fee, but that's what we wanna make sure we're trying to avoid. Sometimes you find these fees out there that you just haven't looked at in a long time. And remember, we're statutorily required to cover the cost of a service with a fee, we really can't exceed that. That's something that I always remind folks, we could not charge $5,000 for a birth certificate because we couldn't legally justify that it cost that much to issue a birth certificate. People also wouldn't get them, so we wouldn't make any money off of that. But what we don't want to do is have a situation where we just let fees go too long, or we just raised building fees. We're on the average to higher edge for building inspection fees, but we don't want a situation where we're never raising building fees, but every year we're raising the dog fee another $2, and we're making you pay more for your dog, but we're not making you pay for a building fee, or vice versa. We're gonna look at parking fees soon, parking ticket fees soon, not the statutory speeding tickets, we don't have control over that. But we don't wanna go 30 years without raising a parking ticket fee, but we're making businesses pay more for a DBA license or something like that. So all this really says is, we look at our service charges, we try to make sure that the fee covers the cost of service to the extent practical, understanding that there's certain areas where you don't want to do that, where you're trying to provide a low cost or subsidized service. But where we can do it, we want to do it. I think school lunches are an example where the goal is not to make money on school lunches. It's intentionally, in most cases, it's a break even. In most of our operations are a break even.
I want to make that point you just brought up. None of the fees are intended to be make money, profit.
Correct.
But we're required by law to only collect back what covers our cost.
Right.
So that they're basically a break-even point on your cost of providing that fee, that service that fee's covering.
And the
And
understanding
not just to try to be an income source.
There are certain things, recreation programs, senior programs, where you're intentionally subsidizing them. Your goal is not always to have every fee cover every service, because some of them you're intentionally subsidizing just the nature of the nature of what the program happens to be, but we can't intentionally profit on.
yeah, so, and again, I think there needs to be some wordsmith, because if you look at the policy, first paragraph, the town Norwood through its board of selectmen shall develop this consolidated fee schedule, that the school committee is a separate organization that separately sets fees, so I'm not quite sure that's.
So what that is, hold on, what that is just an administrative item to say, who holds one list of every fee in town?
I was thinking along the lines of the same as you.
Hold on, if I could, hold on one second, if I could. So that's just an administrative item. We don't actually have one document that lists every fee in town. So we're just saying, whether it's the board of selectmen, you can have the school committee, if you guys wanna manage it for us, that's fine, but there's no one place in town that we list every single fee that we charge, nor do we keep track of all of those fees. So if somebody were to say, well, I wanna know what's been going up for recreation fees versus what we're charging at the school department, I've gotta call multiple departments to get that. So that's just about housing it somewhere.
That's not what it says, though.
So
That's not what it says.
That's not what it says, right,
That's
you're
not what
right,
it says.
that's
'Cause
not what it says.
Right, 'cause it says
And I think
develop.
that I have something that can help us here. Now, Tom, being our chief financial officer, I think would be the appropriate person to have the list. Now, and then we need to make sure that within this policy, we identify or
Yeah, you come up
say
with a
that.
document that shows who sets that actual fee, who has the statutory authority. That's all we're talking about, is who's gonna house it. We can't pass a policy, well, I would disagree. I mean, I wrote it with that intention, so I know you may be able to read it that way, but that's certainly not the intention. Remember, no policy can change statutory authority, so I appoint the police chief in Norwood. We can't pass a policy that says that Dave gets to appoint the police chief. You know, yeah, I know, we talk about it all the time, we're looking at it, you know, we might be able to pass a bylaw that does that. So it's just saying it needs to be housed somewhere. I'd rather have it just housed in my office. Tom has a lot of work to do, and we pay him a lot of money for the good work that he does do. Just physically holding onto that list is something we can have administrative support staff do.
So I had the same question when we talked about the selectmen developing it, because we don't control other departments, we
Yeah,
can't control.
develop may not be the best word, but it's just.
But I think from hearing your explanation, this is just appointing somebody. You suggested the selectmen, could be somebody else.
Instead of
And we
saying
take
develop,
out-
say
we take out the
maintain.
word develop,
Or, yeah,
consolidated
establish,
to maintain a consolidated.
Yes.
Changing the word is fine. The word develop is just who's gonna physically put the document together and hold it in one place. You know, we could make the HR department do it if we wanted to. We could make the Veterans Office do it if we wanted to. It's just, it should be housed somewhere.
So,
It doesn't matter.
Tony, your office
Doesn't matter what way they are.
is looking at a budget analyst, so one thing I think that would be good for that person to do is, you know, when they have time, is to go back and get, like, what were the fees July 1st of each year for the last, say, 5 years,
Right.
by department. Well, then you could easily see it, you could just maintain that over time.
That's the
And-
goal.
And
That's the
that's, I
idea.
think, what you were saying, but where it says will develop, just say, the selectmen's office will maintain it or something.
You
And
okay
then
with
maybe
that, Joan,
person-
maintain?
I'm fine with that, but then we need to change may design or modify revenue in the second. So you've defined, the problem is you've defined the town of Norwood as the Board of Selectmen in the previous paragraph. And then the town will review charges annually, and we're not limited by law, may design or modify revenue systems.
I don't think we're defining the town as the Board of Selectmen. The town is all of us. So again, this is an agreement among everyone.
Then
But can we just strike through its Board of Selectmen in the previous sentence?
Fine, we can just say the town of Norwood shall maintain a consolidated fee
Yes.
schedule that lists all
Yes.
fees and charges, and then it'll
Yeah.
just administratively get assigned to my office.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
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 Fine. Darn, you caught me on my secret plan to have us set, you know, whatever
Sometimes
fees the
intent,
schools,
sometimes when you're writing, the intent doesn't come through to lay people who are reading.
No, it does really come, you know, I think that's fine, but to me, it's clearly in section 2. Policy applies to all fees charged by the town of Norwood that through its various boards and officials have the authority to set. So I don't think there's any intent or anything in this policy that says that there's a consolidated effort by one department to set fees.
Well, but I am confused by the last sentence. The Board of Selectmen will act as the
Well, again,
manager of the
that-
fee
that's just
structure.
Somebody
It's a
needs
system
to
of
hold that
communication.
document somewhere. We want to assign that responsibility, so in
Could
5
be the
years.
school committee if you wanted, one body has to be assigned, or person.
Right, so we can have it, the administration, we can say that generically, but what we don't want is in 5 years, somebody says, hey, you got a policy, who has the fee schedule? Well, I don't know. Well, who's responsible for it? I don't know, because that happens too. Policies get passed, everyone says, this sounds great, it gets put on a shelf, and then in 5 years, somebody says, can I see where our fee schedule? Oh, we don't actually do it, so it's sort of
Who do you
dumping the
hold-
responsibility on the
who-
board.
who
It
do you
could just
hold
easily be the general
responsible?
I would
manager's
put it under
office.
town administration because elected boards are transient, meaning they turn
Right.
over.
Yeah.
So you would want that to be maintained by someone that's more permanent.
Yeah, that's fine, we can make those changes. Is there otherwise agreement in that? Again, the goal is to make sure that we're just looking at it holistically and we're not whacking one area versus another area. And not that I'm particularly concerned about, let's say, liquor license fees, but we don't wanna constantly be raising liquor license fees and never raising fees anywhere else.
So we're gonna call that the town, instead of Board of Selectmen, it will be town.
It'll just say the town of Norwood shall. And then at the bottom, it'll say the general manager's office will maintain
Thank you.
the consolidated fee schedule. Free cash, probably some discussion coming up on this one. So I know that there was one concern about, actually, the first line, free cash, sorry, yep.
Sorry.
Go back to fees.
Yeah, so it doesn't say fee schedule, it says fee structure.
We can change structure to schedule.
Okay.
Free cash. So the first line, because I know Bill had this comment, free cash is not to be used to offset operating expenses in the annual budget unless absolutely necessary, determined by a vote of the FinCom and Board of Selectmen that a fiscal emergency exists necessitating the same. That's fairly strong language. We are using some free cash in the budget this year. It's really to just pay for Forbes Hill. So we may want language in there about, or, unique circumstances. I mean, here's one of the challenges where you can't have a policy that's so strict that you can never meet it, nor do you want a policy that says, well, we don't want to do this, or here's kind of the idea, but if it doesn't happen, then that's okay, and here's 52 different exemptions when we want to do it. So this is one of those challenges where we got to sort of find that middle ground of what's a reasonable policy, what makes sense, versus not picking something that's either too loose or too strict that it's not going to work for us. And then the dollar amount that we want to try to keep in free cash, that too is it's a matter of discussion. Not that the goal is to just spend the free cash. If we get $6 million in free cash, we don't say, all right, good, we've got 5.5 to spend, let's intentionally spend it all. It's just better to move it to a stabilization account if you're going to save it than just let it linger in free cash.
I don't mind the 500,000 today. I think that's a good goal. DOR recommends that they refer to it as a percentage. Don't go below a percentage. My only concern with the 500 is just that over time, it's not current anymore. It becomes obsolete with inflation and so forth. But for today, I think that's about the right number. If we put in a percentage, I'd want the percentage to come out to the 500. But I'm just a little concerned that over time that becomes outdated.
That's a good point. We could pick a percentage. I'd almost want to go to a percentage down the road once we've kind of clarified some of our enterprise fund structure, because we're a little unique in how we handle that, how water and sewer and light generate free cash.
So maybe we'll leave it like that with a kind of a footnote in our minds to make sure this is something we update and reevaluate, and maybe in the future change it to a percentage.
Sure.
Or you could say minimum 500,000 that could be adjusted annually for inflation or something, so that it gives the boards the ability to increase without
It does say minimum, and that it's only a goal. If it's an absolute emergency, we can violate this policy. It gives you that flexibility right here, but it's, again, a goal, an intention.
Correct, and here's an example where, on the one hand, town meeting will hold us accountable, but we're setting a policy. We will at some point have fiscal indicators where we can check every year, are we matching our policies, are we close, are we not close? If I were to say, all right, we spent down to 500,000 in free cash, I really need $30,000 for my carpet in the manager's office, and are we gonna go and violate the policy for that? No. The culvert collapsed on Dean Street, we need to spend every last dollar of free cash to fix it? Yes, we're gonna do it,
So this year we got $1.6 million.
Yep.
We gave $1.59 million or whatever to the schools.
No, not $1.59 million.
509.
But if you want to give us another million, we'll take it.
509, 509.
Five, and if we follow the policies as recommended so far, the budget capital is another five. So we got about 6.
And some of that we needed a special, so we're gonna be
And
very
some of
close
that's left,
to-
so we're gonna be basically right at this
We're
goal.
gonna be below it probably,
Probably by,
100,000 or so.
yeah, but that's the way it goes.
yeah, and again, you never want something, if your policy says you will never go below that amount of money, you're gonna run into trouble, nor can it say, well, we need a policy, we need some sort of guide. What it is again, the recommendations will come from the staff, the boards, and everyone generally agree that this is how we should manage our finances. Free cash is not a number we can set. It's not a fee that we can say, well, the fee shall be X. So you need some flexibility in there, but this is something we would be monitoring year in and year out as one of those fiscal indicators. Are we doing well? Are we doing bad? And then we have to be rational with ourselves as well. We can say that we want to get here, and let's follow the steps to get here. If we're never generating enough free cash, if 5 years in a row, we're always below $500,000, you could say, sure, we just need to be better and not spend it, but it means we've got some other issue with the policy, and maybe it should be $250,000. I think $500,000 is a good number. Just as I say that the max should be $5 million, not that you'd ever have a max, but at some point, if we're generating $10 million in free cash every year, well, maybe that $5 million becomes $7 million or $8 million before you say, okay, we actually had some really one-time surplus. Just put it in the bank and sort of forget about it because it's a sort of an anomaly. Questions on, and we'll do a little wordsmithing on the language at the front, but questions on the 500 and 5 million numbers.
But, no qualms with the 5 million, but in really the last sentence of that same paragraph where you talk about 500,000, it says, in any year where free cash exceeds 5 million, any amount over 5 million shall automatically be transferred to stabilization, or utilized to pay down, I'm not sure what,
So the idea behind that is, let's say we had a really good year with free cash, we went way over.
I'm gonna stop you, because I know what the intent is. I'm suggesting that it should be voted to transfer, any of the existing I don't know what you mean by, it sounds like you're talking about one particular stabilization fund. I would just,
So the reference there was just the general stabilization fund. The idea
but
being
we're
that.
also establishing some special purpose, so I would open it up to allow where we think our priorities may be for the next couple of years. And I would say, shall we vote to transfer to any of the existing stabilization funds?
The thought process was, we have that odd, really good year where we do a lot of free cash, just put it in the bank and pretend you didn't have it. Because if we know we have a series of special purpose stabilization accounts and we need to hit certain financial targets, by taking the free cash and throwing them at them, it may sound good that we're hitting those targets early, but then we're not necessarily hitting a sustainable path. So it's kind of like, oh, we did better than we thought, just stick that little bit of money in the bank and.
But we're talking excess of 5 million.
Correct.
We're not talking about rating the existing free cash amount so that we're depleting it for other purposes. This is excess. And I just think we're really trying to pigeonhole and confine ourselves to say it's one general stabilization fund that won't put the money. I think.
But that was intentional, it was a town savings account. We had a good year, put some money in the bank.
They're all town savings, all the stabilization funds are purposely savings accounts. I just
Sure.
think that we should not.
The general
really confine
stabilization fund
ourselves,
is
that
not.
We should be open to saying, okay, which of the funds might need a priority over the next couple of years and move that.
So are you looking for the
You
word
could just put
any?
a stabilization fund in
Yeah,
front of
you know
it.
what, that might be the easiest way to do it, is
You
just
could
put
just
a
put the word
stabilization
A,
fund.
and then it
Just
can
the
go to
idea-
any of them.
Any or A.
The idea that we want to put that money in the bank, because again,
I agree.
it's a super non-recurring revenue source, so we're inventing new financial terms here. I mean, we assume that our free cash will target within a certain area. We had some really good year, we want to put that in the bank for the future.
All right, so it'll be, read shall automatically be transferred to a stabilization account or utilized to pay down debt, et cetera.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
No.
We should take out the word automatically. It can't happen
Yeah,
automatically.
automatically.
Yeah, I was
Again,
wondering about that.
Same as I have problems with the word.
Well,
shall.
Automatically.
The idea is that so the staff would if we have 5.4 million in free cash, the budget would come to the various boards as $400,000 going into, and we would make a recommendation based on what it is, and you collectively would say, yeah, we're doing that, you know.
It's the same as the argument whether we should keep shall in or not. You said it will be throughout the document, but this doubles down, shall automatically. We'll concede the shall to you, but take out the automatic.
I have two things. When we get through with this policy, if we could take maybe a 10-minute break, that would be good. Everybody's getting up and walking around for the moment. Under section 3, the first couple of words, it says free cash is not to be used, and I think we should soften that a little bit, because is not to be used if it's looked at by our rating companies and we're not doing that, we're using it, then we have a problem there.
So
So should not soften it a little bit and say
The way I
should
would
not,
soften,
that is not.
the way I would soften that is take out the next line about, declaring an emergency vote, because if
I actually wanted to take that out too.
Yeah, if you took that out and we say it's not to be used, and then we are using it, so if I had a call with a rating agency in the fall and they said, hey, you said you're not supposed to be using free cash in your operating
But
budget,
here
but
it
you
is,
are,
you can use-
the response is, well, but we're paying for Forbes Hill is what we're doing. Now, we may operationally be moving the money around so that the school department gets the benefit of that. They don't care about that. That's sort of a one-time thing. Or if we're saying, yeah, we used it to, because either we had an enormous amount, or we used it to prevent layoffs, that's an easy argument to make with a rating agency. If we say, well, we just did it this year because it was easier on the balance sheet, then that wouldn't work. But I think the way to soften that is to cut the second line out.
I actually don't think we should take it out, because I think that I think making it more difficult to utilize free cash will prevent people moving forward from doing it. So if you have
I
to
agree.
require
I
a
think we should never
vote,
use free cash
that
for
means
budget.
that someone's gonna put some extra foresight into it before actually doing it. If you just make it, it's up to someone's discretion, I can quantify an emergency, then it's gonna make it much, much easier to fall back into the pattern that we've had over the last 20 years. So I don't agree with taking it out.
Well, I can live with leaving it in if we take out the second sentence. Be absolutely necessary, determined by the vote of unless absolutely necessary. one way or the other. We
I-
gotta give ourselves
So how about we just put the word
smidge.
should in there? Free
So
cash
instead
should
of
not be
is,
used.
should not be used.
Because it shouldn't be. but
That's what I
sometimes
said.
it- And the other thing is, this,
That's
if
fair.
our,
That was
That's
my
fair.
first one.
if our
Okay.
financial picture changed dramatically, we may go back to using free cash. Not that I'd recommend it, but if every year we were generating 10 million, you can't justify not throwing a little bit of it back. Some towns do have policies where they always put some of their free cash back. Our generation is just not that heavy anymore, and that's nobody's fault. It's just a matter of the changing economy. Throughout the United States, the economy has recovered. We have a great jobs economy. Local and state governments and even the federal government have not seen their revenues grow the way the private sector has. So we'll make that change. We'll start with 505 million. Those numbers may change over time. Again, we may see after 4 or 5 years, we're looking at our indicators and it's too low, it's too high. Any other changes, questions, comments?
So to go over the changes, we're kind of changing free cash should not be used to offset operating budgets, and are we leaving the absolutely necessary in, or are we taking that out?
I think so. I mean, the idea is that we're not trying to make our lives
Leaving it in.
easier.
Okay,
Trying to
but
do
we're
things right.
changing it to should, okay? And then down at the bottom, it's automatically, in the last paragraph,
Tommy,
automatically being transferred, that
will-
goes automatically.
We'll delete the word automatically, and we're gonna add the letter A
A.
to stabilization.
Any stabilization fund.
A
A stabilization fund.
Well, put
Okay.
an S in the bracket after accounts, because it could be more than one.
Yeah.
It's going to stabilization account.
Yep, sure. The idea is we wanna save that money.
All right.
All right.
Shall we break for a few minutes?
If there's consensus to take a break, my suggestion is we keep it to like a 2.5-minute break. Again, I love doing this. I'll stay here till 10 o'clock at night, but you know.
Yeah.
Calling in for lunch, and we'll be more than happy
I'll
to
call in
stay.
for lunch. Again, this is
Perfect.
fun for me, so we'll take a 2-minute quick break.
We're doing that.
All right, we're reconvening after a quick bathroom break. The next policy on our list is our investment policy, similar but even more so to our debt management policy. We were actually very restricted statutorily in how we invest funds. You need an investment policy because there's no rating agency out there that would look at you if you didn't say this is our investment policy. However, it is very restricted by statute. We don't have a lot of flexibility in how we choose to invest money. We do focus on the best return, balancing it with the safety. There's a lot of statutory requirements on what we can invest in and what we can't invest in. So really, this is a policy we need to have, but it's almost, I would almost call it boilerplate from the Commonwealth because we're very restricted in what we can actually do for investments.
Has our treasurer signed off on this?
Yeah.
I know that he was at one meeting, but I wanted to make sure that there's been no changes since.
This is virtually a
I know,
copy and paste of
yeah,
statutory
I've
language.
seen it in the.
You almost don't need an investment policy because we couldn't do things differently anyway, but you have to have the language in there.
But I wanted to make sure that there's been no changes in this since.
No, and I secretly wrote a treasurer's policy and didn't consult Mark Good and intentionally went in the opposite
Fine.
direction of what the
Thank
treasurers
you.
want. Any questions on the investment policy? And there's just one quick note I want to make. So as it relates to our pension fund, we are sort of the holder of a pension fund, but those are actually not our funds. They belong to our retirees and those contributing to the fund. So when it comes to those investment decisions, they're actually made, again, strictly regulated by statute, but made by the retirement board. So we actually contribute to that fund. We're sort of the custodian of that fund, if you will. We are obligated to pay that fund and that liability, but we don't actually control that fund. Whereas the OPEB fund, even though it's statutorily locked away, is a little bit more controlled by the town.
John, just
Yep.
one question that, I didn't see any reference to a report similar to what we had in debt management. Is there, should we recommend that the town treasurer provide, a yearly report or a semi-annual report? I mean, just
It's really what's our interest level, because again, we don't do a lot of money moving. Most of our funds have to be kept in very secure instruments. So we say the word investments, and it's not like it's like our stock portfolio and how do the town's investments do. Everything is more or less in a savings account, and that's both statutorily required and good practice for our cash. Remember, the pension fund does invest in a lot of different areas. That's nothing we actually control
No, I
directly.
understand, it's just that I would like to see some output of something that says this is what we're doing. It's not a critique of the treasurer, it's just making him say this is where we are, at least once a year. This is
Sure, I mean, we can, but it's, most of the town's money's in a savings account or a bond somewhere, and we do spread our cash out among a multitude of banks, but if you'd like sort of an annual write-up from the treasurer, sure, we can put that in there.
Thank you.
Any other questions on the investment policy? Again, it's one of the ones that it's really just language we have to have.
So that would be under the policy itself, David, that you'd like to add that?
Yes, under the policy, yes.
That the treasurer shall report to the selectmen?
That is who you
That's
report
what
to.
he works for.
Just prepare a report annually on the town's investments, and that might be a one paragraph, sort of. Any other questions on investments? Moving right along. One of my favorite topics, OPEB. Just so everyone's aware, OPEB, other post-employment benefits, is our retiree healthcare liability. We are statutorily required to provide retiree healthcare to our retirees in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, so that is the law. That is not a law we can change. It is not a benefit we can just arbitrarily change in most cases. So, we talk about a couple of things here. I'll run through this quickly in the OPEB policy. Annual allocation, we will contribute a bottom line allocation to the OPEB trust fund, which we're currently doing. The base dollar shall not decrease until such time as we reach 120% of our required contribution. So what that's saying is we're not going to cut down our OPEB allocation. Now, if somehow we came across a $200 million windfall and we no longer had an OPEB problem, sure, this would be completely irrelevant. But what we don't want to do is say, gee, it's a tough budget year, let's cut this over here, because what we're just going to do is create tougher budget years down the road. That doesn't mean we have to increase it every year. We should try to increase it every year. And it doesn't mean that that increase needs to be substantial, but we don't want to go backwards. In particular, because of some changes in GASB reporting, which is the Government Accounting Standards Board, most towns in Massachusetts now technically have a net value of less than zero. Rating agencies aren't treating that as a credit event, but what they are looking at is how we're managing our OPEB liability. Are we doing anything? They know that it is this enormous mountain to climb, but they also know there's a difference between sitting in your house and looking at the mountain and opening the front door. So that at least will allow us to continue to make contributions. The 120% number, Wellesley as an example, as a town, was funded in their pension plan at about 106%. They're now down in the high 80s, so they did really well, and then they went down. So that 120% number is probably where you realistically need to be in terms of your total funding before you're safe for both the OPEB and the pension. We could debate that number, but we're years and years and years from it. So when we get a little bit closer to it, we can have a little bit more of a discussion of whether it should be 120 or 110, and then you've got to start changing your discount rate and some of your other figures to get there. But we're many years from being there, so that's sort of a goal. As we get closer, we'll pick a number that's a little bit closer. This we're doing this year, transferring the remaining amount of unexpended funds from the health insurance budget to the OPEB. Medicare reimbursements, we're not going to be getting those anytime in the future, but it may come back, so we're just saying try to find some of these one-time areas to throw money into the OPEB fund in addition to that annual allocation.
Can you just expand on the next sentence where direction of these funds to any other fund or account or expenditure shall only be by affirmative vote of the Board of Selectmen consistent with required town meeting. What do you mean by that?
That means that neither the finance director nor I will recommend that we do something else with it. Remember, the warrant that goes to town meeting is ultimately the purview of the selectmen, as is the budget for general government. So what we're all agreeing to, we're not going to propose this. Now, if there's an emergency, of course we're going to propose something different. Again, your policies are never so strict that you say, well, this is the policy, so let's go ahead and drive off the cliff. You know, you may have a policy that you never slam the brakes on your car, but you slam the brakes on your car when you have to. We're just trying to put in measures so that in the future, because again, you know, to Kelly's point, boards do change, staff changes, that we're saying this is not something we're going to do because we have to realistically start to address it. It's going to have an impact on our credit rating, and it's going to have an impact on our ability to fund services in the future as well. And we don't want to just try to make things easier on us today and sacrifice those for the future. Utility costing, this would actually be beginning in FY21, the enterprise-like funds, and I use that term because we don't actually practice direct enterprise accounting.
It is 21?
What's it? Yeah, it would be 20. Well, we've already closed the FY20 budget, so it would realistically be FY21. We're going to begin to move towards the full costing in our enterprise-like funds because we have that flexibility. That's going to cause an increase in rates, but what we want to make sure is that the rates are paying for the rate required OPEB cost and not vice versa, because the way it's structured now, the town has a OPEB liability that exceeds $100 million. Part of that is rate funded. We need to make sure that the rates are paying for what's rate supported. We would do that in the general fund with town and school employees. If we had the flexibility, we don't. If we do find that this cost burden ends up being way too burdensome, we would of course come back and adjust that.
So you're saying this is a 5-year ramp up to that required level?
For the utility
For,
funds.
just for the enterprise-like utilities?
It's for the enterprise fund like utilities, because we want to make sure over the next 5 years, what we also do is we're clarifying what's against the tax levy
Right.
and what's against the utility funds, and we don't want
Okay.
any subsidies one way or the other.
Yep.
That's not to say that we won't continue to generate revenue from things like the light department, that's fine, we just want clarity in what we're doing.
Understood,
And
yep.
moving towards the separation
Okay.
of those items.
Are the rates for the light, in this case, would they be set by town meeting?
No, that's all set by the Board of Selectmen,
Got it, you guys.
the light
Okay.
commissioners, in their capacity as light commissioners.
Okay.
New positions, and again, this would be in FY '21, and this will be a challenge, especially if we end up adding several positions, but we should begin accounting for the cost of OPEB when we add positions into the budget. And it's a little tougher on the school side because some of the special ed positions tend to be a little bit more, I use the word transient, that's probably not the best word to use, but there's less of a there's a little bit more peak and valley. So maybe what we would do is it would really be, are we adding full-time permanent staff, not just sort of that flexibility within the special education budget. So if we're saying next year or in 3 years, I want to bring on 5 new English teachers, well, we need to realize that if we're adding to that staff level, we are adding to the cost of OPEB. Add that cost in the budget now. Now, that makes it difficult to add staff, but all we're doing is sort of kicking that can down the road. So if in 2 years I say I want 2 human resources directors, all right, I should be adding $10 or $12 or $13,000 or something to that budget for those positions as well, just to account, even if it's a smaller amount, even if we say that we'll try to, for new positions added to the budget, we'll try to ramp that up over 5 years, let's stop adding to the problem without trying to at least solve some of it. It may slow the growth in the budget, but it'll help the overall financial picture. Though Dave and I had talked about, we would probably look at it for full-time permanent teaching and administrative positions, and then the same on the town. The special ed positions are a little too up and down that we need a full-time person just to account for that.
So I was gonna ask, should we define that cost? Is it the cost of a year worth of benefits over a 3-year period? What is that
So,
cost? Because we just say cost, you can put $1 in there and that meets this, right?
Cost will be placed in the OPEB.
It's a new position.
So, okay, so yeah, it's new positions, and I don't mean if somebody leaves and then we fill a position, that would be perfect, but that's, you might have 12 people retire in a year, and now we're looking for 200 grand in OPEB, and it becomes a little bit crazy. We can come up with a cost. There's different ways to figure out what you want that cost to be. You can take your ARC and divide it by your current employees. So there's no way to ascribe I don't want to say a real cost, but an actual cost to say, okay, we hire, Maev, and her OPEB cost is $7,800. I would say it would probably be best to do it at the cost of a current year's health plan.
Okay.
Because if you think of that, if somebody retires prior to 65, that's what we're paying anyway. It goes down dramatically after 65. Once they switch to Medicare, we're paying for a Medicare supplement. But as costs go up, somebody who joins the system at 22 and doesn't retire for 40 years, you would almost need that full amount of money. Real quick, one of the challenges with OPEB, if you think about it, somebody could retire at 55 and be on a family plan for 10 years, and that's gonna cost us $180,000. And then they could live for 20 years with their spouse, and that's another $70,000 or $80,000. Somebody could never be on our health insurance and never cost us anything. So whatever it is, the number is sort of just it's an academic average, I would call it, but I would set it at whatever the, or maybe the delta between a single plan and a family plan. Tom?
Medical insurance.
So Tony, these are not the correct numbers, but let's say that all the utility employees represented 10% of our total employees, schools and, because this is health insurance, it's everything, right? So let's say they cover 10 and we have a $150 million liability. So their liability would be 15 million. Are you saying that over 5 years we want to make up that 15 million?
Over 5 years, we're gonna get to the ARC, which is what we
Right.
should be contributing every year. I'd love to get to their full in 5 years, that would be
Right, so
probably
you're not
possible.
talking about trying to get them fully funded like that?
Not in 5 years, God, no. I'm trying to talk about the amount that we should be putting aside. What we do is and they've changed it, it's not an ARC, they call it something different now, but our auditors will tell us that, look, this is what you should be contributing to OPEB every year to be fully funded in 20 to 30 years. That's the number I'm talking about the utility funds getting to in 5 years.
Okay, so the answer, I think, Kelly's question, we would really sit down with the actuary,
The actuaries,
figure
yeah.
out what it should be, apply some percentage, and then
Yeah.
say, oh, it's
Yeah.
$2,000 a
Yeah,
person.
it actually
or
comes
whatever.
into close to around what the cost of an actual plan is. It usually ends up statistically being kind of in the middle. So it'll never be, you know, I think we pay $9,000 or $10,000 for a single plan and maybe around $18,000 for a family plan on the town side, I should say. The number is almost never 2,000, but it's not 40,000. It generically comes in around where we are. But you're right, we'd have to sit down with the actuaries and get exactly what that number is, but it's probably 7,000 or 8,000 per employee.
So, just on the trust fund, could you just speak to who's responsible for managing that fund from an investment standpoint?
So technically the treasurer, it's just another fund that we manage. We set up the fund properly, I think just last year, right? We'd sort of been dumping money into a savings account. There's now an appropriate OPEB trust account, so we can't take money out of that fund for anything except OPEB.
So I think the plan is, right now, we only have about approximately $2 million.
2.1, I think.
Yeah, approximately $2 million in the fund. So the treasurer doesn't have much flexibility on where you can invest it. But if we get to the point where there's $20 million in the fund, you know, we might want to consider having like a retirement board or asking the retirement board to
Trustees.
exist to help manage it or something, but.
I guess my point would be that I noticed in the I just don't think it's clear that where the segregation of the financial policy is in terms of who is responsible for making decisions on the invested funds. So,
Actually, I added a line.
so
Yeah.
excuse me, just like in the pension, the next policy, we do set in the, that the pension fund is controlled by an independent retirement board under state statute. I think it might be beneficial for us to have language in there that's similar to that in terms of making it clear who is responsible for that fund, the management of it.
Eventually be treated the same way as the retirement fund. It effectively is. I have a feeling at some point in time they're going to come under retirement board's authority because it's a fund maintained for liability that we're legally obligated to. Right now, as Tom said, there's not a lot of money in the fund, and we can't spend it any which way we want, nor can the treasurer. I mean, when we say the treasurer invests the funds, I mean, we use brokers and we use, are we in the state fund for it?
No.
So, you know, there's certain state funds out there, and there's a big Plymouth County one. So, I mean, the treasurer just doesn't pull up, you know, what are some of the online stock companies?
E-Trade.
E-Trade. He doesn't just pull up E-Trade and say, all right, I got $2 million in the OPEB fund, this stock looks good, that stock looks good. It basically goes in a moderate yield fund managed by a broker.
Bob, would it help,
That's
under,
actually covered by law too, doesn't the law say?
Yeah, that's the thing.
But that-
Similar to any other investment, we don't have a lot of flexibility. We couldn't just pull up
Right,
E-Trade and say,
right.
let's, you know, throw the pension fund in E-Trade or this. So it's currently the treasurer under statute. As Tom said, we eventually would want an OPEB trust board. The challenge is, we could set one up, but there's just not a lot of money in there, and you meet once a quarter, and they'd say, well, our $2.1 million, we gained $1,800 in interest, and
Understood. But eventually it will be at a point of, in terms of its balance, that we need to have that. And I'm just from a point of clarity, I think it might be advantageous to at least have one sentence that says that the trust fund itself is, according to statute, is managed by an independent, or by the treasurer or a other entity, where I guess the other entity would be at some point, we'd have trustees of the fund, but,
we, Tom, we'll make that edit. And technically, the treasurer is the trustee of the fund, and again, as Tom said, it depends on the purpose of the fund. Treasurer is generally the trustee of all of our funds, but there's a difference between
Sure.
a $800 flower account that he's technically the trustee of versus this. But you're right, we'll eventually get
I think
there.
that
With
makes
the
sense, and
funding, we'll be
just-
there soon.
under applicability, I had suggested that we add the CFO and town treasurer responsible for accounting and the investment of the OPEB funds. Is that simple enough?
I think using the term trustee
Trustee
makes
is better, yeah?
sense, because that, you know, that could change in the future as the fund grows. We may, you know,
Yeah.
it could be a board of
Well, I
trustees.
think,
Trustees
isn't
report.
the treasurer the trustee at the moment? I believe under,
Technically.
I think, under a piece of paper I saw,
Mhm.
at one point in time, it was the treasurer was the trustee. So
And,
where do you want to add it?
and applicability notes under section 2. What's the liability today? It's like
Oh,
150 plus?
How much was it?
$155 million. But we have two.
Less than 2%
How did our net worth
funding.
only swing 103 million then, from 41 up positive to 62 negative? I thought it was.
Because actuaries come up with complicated numbers
Okay.
and future values and discount rates and everything else. I mean, the town of Norwood's net value, we're technically worth negative under $40 or $60 million. And you always gotta take, municipal, valuations in a little bit of a grain of salt, as I always say. Dave?
Yeah, so just, transfer funds under, policy.
Yep.
And Medicare reimbursement going to the OPEB trust fund. Currently, that counts as revenue, am I correct? So that's a change?
No,
No. Okay.
it's what we have been doing anyways.
Okay.
Other than the last couple of years where we gave the schools $350,000 to prepay the next year's, any of the excess has been going to the OPEB that was left over.
Well, that's the leftover health insurance, but what he's talking about is Medicare reimbursement, the reimbursement.
For if the, the schools provide OT, PT, and services that are then billed. We do a lot of work to build Medicare.
That is recorded as revenue, it's still
Right.
recorded as revenue.
Right, so
This
it's,
is not talking about that, because Bertie would know better, but there was a federal program to give Medicare reimbursement other than those.
okay,
those-
all
that
right,
was
so it's not
reimbursement
school,
related to
okay,
grants.
all right.
This was general Medicaid,
Mhm.
or Medicare
And it's actually,
reimbursement.
it's going away.
It technically ended 2 years ago, but the state's lagging behind paying us, so this year we actually got $300,000, which there is a motion on the April 25th town meeting, special town meeting to transfer that to OPEB. Even though technically, for people not, OPEB and group insurance are on the same voting line,
Mhm.
so technically, we don't have to vote at town meeting, but we're doing it as a vote so that everyone's aware of what, technically, management has the right to just move 300,000 over because we have access, because it's on the same voting line, but we're showing the two P accounts is moving from in that motion, so town meeting takes action.
Okay, thank you.
Other, did I cover trust fund and other question, and this is something that we'll probably have to look at every year as we adjust it and make changes, because OPEB is complicated. There's reform being proposed at the state level. The governor's office first indicated no interest in that and then indicated interest in it. So we're preparing a legislative platform to try to look at making some changes that would help these costs and would help the long-term liability. But as you know, none of this is easy stuff. Any other questions on the OPEB? Moving on next to pension funding, something else that is important, something we've done well on, but also something that's largely very structurally required. We have to contribute a mandatory amount according to the State Retirement Authority, but it's always good to have it in policy to achieve funding, and then the post-funding is what we want to get at. And again, we picked the number 120% here because towns have gone from being about 105, 106. The market takes a dive, and all of a sudden they're at 85%. You would realistically change some of your assumptions, and you would dial them way, way, way back and get a, so when you think you're at 104, you would dial your assumptions back and you'd really be around 90. And what this is we want to make sure we don't, again, get to a point where we have peaks and valleys in the budget. We would never want to hit a point where we say, great, we're fully funded, and then instead of having to spend $5.5 million a year on the pension system, we only have to spend $2 million, and then 2 years later, the market takes a dive, we're down at 86%, and that cost soars up. We want to make sure we get to a point where there's enough money in there and we're fine, and we just have to make our direct contribution and not the full contribution.
Question on PARAC, Tony?
Yeah.
Just,
Which real quick is the State Retirement Authority.
yeah, so PARAC tells us what we have to contribute. That's, was a minimum or a mandatory?
Yeah, they sometimes
contribution.
will give you a menu of options, but there's still a minimum on the menu of options.
Okay, and then is it, are we looking at a period like, say, 8 or 9 years out, at which time that required, that mandatory is gonna drop down significantly?
That's what we're talking about here. So technically, all the pension funds in the state need to be fully funded by, I think it's 2029.
Okay.
Which is actually a very good fiscal policy that the Commonwealth put in place many years ago. However, 2018 was supposed to be the year that all the state's pension funds were fully funded. So that goalpost continues to move, and I guess if everyone's making progress, that's fine. Are we at 84% funding?
That's good.
Around there? We used to be well over 90.
We're actually over 100
We're
at
over
one
100.
point.
100, so perfect example, we were
So
in
we were
great
like
shape.
Wellesley, yeah.
The market took a dive, and now we're still paying for that years later. We've done good with extra contributions to the pension system. That's a great thing to do if we ever had some extra free cash, to just throw as much money into it, eventually solve that problem going forward. The last community I worked in was well into the 90s and then dipped down into the 70s. So because you can have swings that size, we don't want to just get to 100% and say we're done, because there again, we think $2 million savings in the budget, all of our problems are solved, everything's great, and then a couple of years, you are up against a really hard wall.
So, but the PERAC mandatory required contribution, though, is designed to get us to 100%.
Yes.
Right around 2029. We, however, can continue to contribute to it. If the mandatory goes down quite a bit thereafter, that doesn't mean we
And
have
that's what
to
we're saying,
stop.
correct, that's what we're
Okay,
saying.
and that's how well we get to 120.
So we don't want to get to 2030 where they say, hey, instead of $5.5 million, your direct rate is just 1.2 million. We say, great. That's when you really build that fund up to where you are secure. We're
Okay.
building a secure financial future for the community.
Thank you.
Because again, we don't want to take that savings and then 2 years later, oh, we're looking for $4 million, and then we're up the creek without a paddle.
Okay.
So we're at 84% today. What's the
Is Is it 84 or 88?
I thought it was 82.
All right, so 80-something%
Yeah.
today. What's the expectation for how we get to the 100 and then 120? How many years are we looking at?
So 2029, we should be at 100.
Okay?
Our current thinking is that after 2029, that excess that we will have is going to then go to OPEB. Tony has floated that perhaps we should wait till we're 110% and really take care of the pension before we move the excess. But either way,
Most
you look
communities
at
are
it in
planning that
total.
once their pension obligation is set, that a majority, because that cost goes way down, it will go to OPEB. In theory, if we moved it over to OPEB that year and then we had an issue with the pension fund the next year, you just move it back. My thought is if we're there in 2029, just wait to move that over to OPEB till like 2034, 2035. Let's wait until we're really set with the pension fund, so that way that there's no oopsies where we're going back. And whether we would contribute the additional money, so it'd be like we're contributing beyond what we're supposed to be. So right now, I think it's $5.5 million in the budget. If we were contributing $9.5 million in the budget, we'd get there a lot sooner. So once we're there, we keep that line of the budget as it is, we'll make progress very quickly. And again, whether we just get to 110 or 120%, or we just dial back all of our expectations, and then they might say, well, if you dial them way back, you're really at 92, okay, well, it'll take us 3 years, and then we're back at 100. So the idea is, let's try to solve this problem once and for all in the next 15 years or so, and then we can really look at starting to address our
But all of that
OPEBs.
assumes a certain annual return, which could be imperiled if the economy takes a turn for the worse, as happened in 2007. So it's almost, it's chimerical in a way, you know, it's fun with arithmetic, really, but,
So we're anticipating, just based on that, we have 18% left to be fully funded, about 9 years to get to 2029.
Correct.
So we're expecting about a 2% increase in our funding percentage
Uh,
per year.
No, that's not, well, yes. We would expect that number to go up several percentage
but
points
for
each
instance,
year.
last
But
year when we had a 17% return in the retirement fund, it went from 79 to only 82.
Yeah.
Because they only give you credit, if you make a lot in a particular year, they say, well, that's not what always happens, so we're not gonna give that much credit. And that, you know, that's what the actuaries.
So they normalize it based on
They
whatever the
normalize it.
current
The good
average
thing-
rate of growth would be, or rate of return would be.
The good thing of 105 plans in the in the state, we're at number 16.
Yeah, we're ahead of the curve, we're doing well, and we want to make sure we stay that way.
Yeah, I had PERAC statistics that we're like in the top 20 in terms of funding ratio.
And some of the ones that are above us, I think, are places that are like the MWRA, and
yeah.
they fully fund it through a rate,
Regional.
so they're over
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, and
You know,
also,
some of the
But like
towns
the
borrow
Bristol
money,
County,
took a big risk.
what's that?
Yeah.
The Bristol County system is in like the low 50s, Springfield is in like
the
the
state's
40s.
in 60%,
Yeah,
60%.
so this is a good right area. Years ago, I think it was Judy and Bob Thornton who decided that, you know, put extra money in the pension system, and it grows and it stays with you for a long time.
What are we putting in percentage-wise right now?
What do you mean by percentage-wise?
Well, we're saying,
$5.5 million a year.
Yeah, that's the dollar amount.
should we up it?
What,
So the short answer is
You
yes.
know?
The long answer is, where does the money come from?
Right.
I would put 10 million in a year if we could. I'd put 15 million a year. Again, it comes into the contribution. We can do one-time allocations. So if we had a really good year with free cash, does it go to OPEB? Does it go to the pension fund? We could do that. We can always contribute above the amount. It's just there again, it comes into conflict with or competition with every other dollar in the,
Well, I guess
in the budget.
the way I wanted to say this was, is the 5 million going to make it so that we are fully funded by 2000?
Yes,
Statistically,
it's designed to do that,
That-
but again,
okay.
you're making an actuarial determination. We don't pick that $5.5 million number, the state's actuaries do. That's designed to meet our funding schedule. The more it goes, the quicker we'll get there. Wish we could do it, but again, it comes into competition with everything else. So this is sort of a true policy that's not as much about what we're doing now as it is down the road. And I'll just say one other thing, if you've ever heard of a city or town, and it doesn't happen in Massachusetts because the state steps in, but going bankrupt, they've gone bankrupt for not funding their pension systems. So Massachusetts, I know everyone likes to call us Taxachusetts, and we're very liberal and progressive. We are actually very conservative when it comes to things like this. This is probably the smartest thing the state ever did, and it was a big gold medal for Norwood for getting ahead of the curve on this. Because just real quick, if there was another market dip, and we unfortunately did take a 20 or 25% drop in our pension and everyone else did, we'd be at a really tough spot. Some of these other places would be out of business. Any other questions on the pension fund? It's more about our future planning here. Moving on to stabilization fund, and the general purpose stabilization fund, we refer to this is our main stabilization fund, so our savings account, if you will. Primary fiscal security fund. We're setting a minimum goal of 5%. We do have to have some discussion. Now, that's total operating expenses. Appropriations will not grow below 5% of the total non-utility. So we're sort of saying, here's the minimum, here's the goal. Now, you can have a discussion as to why it should be 5%. The goal should be 5% of everything all in when the light department and the utilities are separate. But remember, as of right now, we are also pledged to those. So we can say that the light department owns debt, that the water and sewer service owns debt, and we have rates to collect them, but guess what? It's ultimately all our money. We will eventually sort of have some segregation with our enterprise fund accounting, but there's nothing wrong with having money in the bank. So this is, again, just our main stabilization account. We'll talk about special purpose ones later. Questions, comments, thoughts?
I think one thing that would be helpful for the public, just along the definitions, is to outline what the benefits of the stabilization fund are.
Sure.
Just so when people read this, they understand why this is important, because a lot of the things you hear are people like, we have this money in our stabilization fund, why don't we just take it out?
Right.
And we could just solve this problem right now, why do we need an override, for instance?
Yeah,
I think it would be
fair
really good to outline why we have to keep it in there and what the benefits of
Yeah,
that is.
and I will say, so we'll definitely include that. This is also probably the number one thing that a rating agency is gonna look at with the municipality.
Right.
This is your savings account, how much money do you have in savings? There's other accounts that they're a little bit less concerned about. I mean, if it's a trust fund for something specific, okay, it is what it is. But this is the number one indicator of your fiscal health and what you're doing is, what are you doing with your savings account? Are you putting money in? Are you taking money out? What percentage are you at? Questions on stabilization?
Just a comment,
Yep.
please. I took a look at one of the passes that we had for budgeting the balancing the budget this year. And I added up a few things, and 5% of what we have for general government, schools, and fixed costs comes up to $126,933,000. 5% of that is $6,346,651. I believe we are presently only at some place around, maybe we make 5% in the stabilization account at present, do we?
No,
No, I don't think
we're
it's that
low.
much.
We're even lower than 5%.
Right.
For the interest rate, yeah, because remember, this is a savings account.
No, in the account. We are
How much is in the
lower.
account, T?
$4.5 million.
All right,
Okay,
so
so-
we're about $1.8 million short of where we
Short.
ought to be.
So we are
Really
short.
minimum of where we should probably be, but that's a different discussion.
So it's important that people understand that presently we are below the level that is looked upon as the best, where we should be by the rating agencies. So it is very important, and it is important for the public to know that we are that low. That, you know, there's been discussions about an override, and people seem to think that general government doesn't need the money. But I think that this is in itself something that proves that we are squeezing by.
Right, instead of people asking, why don't we take it out of stabilization, for the town's financial stability going forward, we actually need to be increasing it,
Increasing,
not reducing it.
yes, very definitely. To be over a million short of where we're supposed to be is significant, and I'm surprised we haven't been dinged by the rating agencies on it yet.
That,
Well,
part of
they're-
that, part of that, we borrowed from this fund.
We borrowed intentionally, basically, in, I don't know, real financial terms or layman's terms. We loaned ourselves out of this account and have a plan to pay it back. And that's probably the only thing saving us with the bond is that we identified the fact that it should be built back up and that we're doing that. If we simply had taken it out, they're not very happy that we took it out.
And I think the only
Tom
thing
can
that we're
speak to that
paying
more,
back,
but that's what I've read.
I think the only thing the only money that we're putting back in is what we borrowed.
Right, in my recommendation would be when we get to putting back in what we borrow, we should probably keep that allocation there for a while.
Right,
Towns use different systems for funding their stabilization accounts. We have an allocation in there, it's several, I think, 4 years until we get there.
I think it'll be done in fiscal 21 or 2.
2 or 3 more fiscal years, we should probably keep that allocation going. That seems to be how we're doing it. Again, some towns, it's every year, X percentage of their free cash goes right into stabilization. The last town I worked in, we had a large reserve fund, whatever didn't get expended out of the reserve fund, we put into the stabilization fund. So our model is, none of those are inherently better than any other ones. We should just continue that budgetary.
Right, I mean, the intent of the memorandum of understanding we had after we borrowed essentially $3 million to pay off a portion of the DPW was not that we would stop once we funded it. It just, we have an agreement and an understanding that at a minimum, we're gonna pay this amount every year to bring us back to the level that we should. And then, yeah, right, by year, and then we would continue, you know, the intent unwritten was we would continue to put money back into the stabilization fund every year to make sure we keep it a certain minimum level.
Absolutely.
And by the way, one of the benefits of taking that money out of stabilization and using it to pay down a portion of the DPW is that it reduced the DPW debt payments significantly, much more than the $3 million that we actually paid in. So it's, you know, it's actually beneficial to do that from a long-term fiscal basis.
Bonding agents would have liked us to do it the other way.
Yeah, maybe.
They were displeased.
Yeah, and again, they haven't decreased our credit rating, but their comments have not always been pleasant with us.
Right.
Well, they're very pleasant, but they've dinged us verbally.
They've made it clear.
It's kind of like a teacher giving you a C and giving you that look that, you know, you're getting a gentleman's C, but you really got a D. Any other questions on the stabilization fund? Just to follow up, the special purpose stabilization fund, so this would be an account that you set up for anything else. I don't want to get into a discussion over what ones we intend to set up or what ones we think we should set up, but the idea is if you had, for instance, an override stabilization account, I guess would apply, but if you set up a stabilization account for a specific purpose, some towns do that, they do it for pre-funding a project, or they just say, we know something's coming, let's start putting a certain money away for it. It could be as simple as a fire truck, it could be as big as a new school building, but this would just govern how we would set them up, but it's not a commentary on what we would set them up for, or how we would fund them, that's completely separate. That's just sort of saying this is similar to a stabilization fund. We just have a policy on what our special purpose funds would be. Questions on that?
I think it's a good policy to have because it's all dependent upon a revenue stream, but there are some, it's a tool that we should be able to look at, assuming that we have the revenue stream adequate. I know David's mentioned about stabilization fund for facilities management, for example, to put aside money. Saying the school might be able to use it for some services in the future, but all is dependent upon having the available revenue to fund those stabilization funds. But it's a good tool that hopefully we'll be able to look at in the future.
Absolutely. We want a policy guiding how we would go about utilizing them. So next we have the reserve fund. When you go down to the actual policy, reserve fund may not exceed 1% of the tax levy, which is the statutory limit. And I believe we should increase that for a couple of reasons. This is also something that rating agencies look very favorably on. Most other towns or most other states, you would call it sort of a contingency. You don't want to, you really shouldn't be budgeting down to zero. You should have some flexibility, but they look at, what do you have in a reserve fund? And again, this is reappropriated every year. What doesn't get expended does close to free cash. Some towns, again, when I worked at Adams, they intentionally close the remainder to stabilization. You could close it to whatever you want or just to free cash. But it's a good fiscal cushion, it's a good fiscal buffer. It reduces over time, transfers at town meeting, and it's a good tool to sort of track where your expense is going over. There again, in a perfect world, we'd have a nice giant reserve fund every year, and we'd have a perfect cushion to absorb any issues we have. It too comes into competition with everything else that's on the agenda, so to speak.
We've been funding it at $125,000 for as long as I can remember.
Yeah, I mean, at one point it was 150, then it went down to 125. I mean, the concern that we have with having a number as high as even 300,000, let alone 1%, is that human nature being what it is, people are gonna wanna use this as a slush fund, you know, no matter what we wanna say, and, you know, no matter what safeguards that we have, asking for 300,000, when in most cases, I think there's only 1 year that I can recall, Tom, at least in the last 10 years anyway, that we've actually had to go back to town meeting and get more money over the 125. I think to raise it to a number like 300,000, just isn't, keep it as a minimum of 300,000, I don't think is a good policy. It's one thing if you say that it could be no more than 680,000, that's fine. And we have the ability in any given year to raise it up to that amount, but to have a minimum amount of 300,000, I just think is excessive. I, you know, would like to go back to the 125. You want to go up to 150, that's okay, but I think 300,000 is just too high.
You would go up over time, but remember, we do a lot of transfers at the end of the year, either out of free cash or around in the operating budget. I would rather do those out of a reserve fund. I mean, if you, sometimes you say, great, I've got some money left in this line here, but if we're appropriating money for a specific purpose, then you want that money to go to that purpose.
Yeah, but that's also a philosophical argument too. I mean, you know, should it be out of the reserve fund, or should it be out of municipal relief, or should in the end it be town meeting who approves those types of appropriations? So, I mean, I just philosophically have a problem with something to set a floor of $300,000. Plus, it takes money from other parts of the budget.
Sure, and that's what I said, it's good fiscal policy, it comes into conflict with everything else. I mean, good reserve fund is nice and healthy, it generates free cash, but the other side of that is right, it does come into competition. We couldn't get to 300 grand in 1 year. This would probably be something where every year we up it a little bit and then maybe do a few less transfers at town meeting. Again, the net total impact of the town will be roughly the same. This year we need $10,000 for legal services. So do we take it from the reserve fund or do we move it from an unexpended line? The end result is the free cash will be the same at the end of the day.
Well, I mean, I would probably make a motion that we reduce it to 150, and if in, you know, subsequent fiscal years, we could raise it a little bit every year, if that's, you know, consistent with our finances, fine. But I think setting the floor at 300 is, at this point, is just a little bit too high. So I'd make a motion, we reduce that number to 150.
Second it for the sake of discussion.
Okay?
Thank you. I would safely say in 30 years of exposure to this stuff, with 12 random years on the FinCom, and then Selectmen for 8 so far, the reserve fund is never, in my opinion, come even close to zero. A few times I've seen them go back to town meeting just to add to the money they have to get back to 125. But I see the 300 as a way of just circumventing town meeting, and I don't like that. I don't like it at all. I think we should stand up and ask the people for what we need, more than that.
To that point, why not eliminate the reserve fund and just you'd have an
Well,
additional
no,
town meeting?
it's a way, it's a reserve fund for emergencies, that's what it's
Unforeseen
for.
expenses, and a lot of what's on a special warrant, in my opinion, generally unforeseen expenses. I mean, I would certainly think that the FinCom wouldn't approve, new furniture for my office because I want new furniture for my office, or, hey, we've got this really cool idea to build a new playground, so we get $60,000. It's just, do we take it out at the warrant at town meeting, or do we take it out of the reserve fund? But
Well, but the other thing too is the calendar. I mean, something could come up in December after we've already had a special, and it's not gonna be 5 months until we reconvene, and there's something that really needs to be taken care of, and so you go to the finance and say, I need $12,000. Sometimes veterans relief has been one at some point where there's a timing thing, but I agree with Alan on this too. I'd say 150, given our history of 125, making a minimum of 150 for the time being is a good idea.
And in subsequent years, if it turns out, A, we need it, B, there's funds available, we can always raise the amount.
So is there consensus on we would go with 150? I mean, the 680 number is a statutory not to exceed.
Is that okay, Maya, 150 McGill?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
All right.
That would take it back to fiscal
The goal would be, again, we're too late into the fiscal year now to make any of these changes, but even if we said we wanted it to be 200,000 or 300,000, we're not just automatically doing that next year, you're probably looking at a ramp up over quite a few years from that. So consensus on that? All right.
That's fine.
Any other questions on the reserve fund? Moving on next are revenue projections, and here again, the revenue projections are something that we would move to over time. We can't just in one day say,
I don't think it's 300.
Alan, did you have a, what's that?
We're questioning the year, starting 20, 21.
For.
What is presently in the,
Presently, it's 125, so it'll be 21. We're too late in the fiscal year to make.
states have to be updated.
Correct. And again, some of these are still goals that we're gonna have to track the metrics over time and get to. Even if we said we wanted it to be 300,000, we're not gonna be at 300,000 next year, I can guarantee that. That's too big of a hit in 1 year. We would make our way there slowly over time. Revenue projections are another example of an area where we wanna be cautious to make sure we're generating free cash. We wanna make sure we're giving ourselves a cushion. When we over-project the revenue and we don't come in, that hits our free cash. And as you know, our free cash generation is getting a little on the low side. 90% is generally a good target for where your revenue projections should be. Perfect world, it would be 80% of the prior year or the prior several years. This is not something we're gonna get to right away. This is, again, one of these items that we couldn't just say, well, every revenue should be projected at that level and happen in 1 year. We would see too big of a drop-off. What we would likely see as time goes on is instead of really maximizing out a revenue projection, we would slowly grow that revenue projection, because we're just hurting ourselves when we don't make an accurate projection. And I think that's some of the reasons why in the last year or two, we've seen a drop in free cash, is when you project 1.8 million and you only get 1.3, you're seeing a drop-off. So again, this would not be something that all of a sudden in FY21, boom, we magically adjust every single revenue number. We just want to be a little bit conservative in our revenue projections.
Since a large percentage of our revenue comes from taxation, which is pretty stable.
Yep.
What's
So
the
this is-
fluctuation year to year in our incoming receipts?
So this would really would apply to local receipts more than anything.
Okay.
We wouldn't only project 90% of tax revenue. That
Okay.
would be an economic catastrophe.
Okay.
The-
Yeah,
State, local receipts.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
what I was getting, that's what
Yeah,
I was
they're-
getting at, okay.
Local receipts have pretty much been flat,
Okay,
you know, not much of a flux in either direction.
So an example would be, let's say we're averaging $1 million a year for permit fee A, and then we have a good year and we did 1.1 million. We wouldn't automatically the next year say, well, our revenue projection is now 1.1 million. That's not necessarily the most stable number. You would go up and you would want to get to about roughly 90% of where you are. That gives you flexibility in your budget. Again, it prevents the peaks and the valleys in the revenue projections, and it gives you a little bit of stability where you should always have a little bit of a cushion there, especially because one of our largest local receipt numbers is excise taxes. That fluctuates quite a bit based on the economy, based on good years and bad years. Building permits, you can have one really good building permit for $400,000, and then in the next year you just don't get that project. So you just want to stay. I would even be more than conservative on building permits, because you just don't want to make too much of a adjustment there. State aid, now absent this year, which was a little bit of a different year, we got a big bump in state aid. What a lot of towns do is they're always sort of a year behind in their state aid. So we would go into the FY20 budget with the FY19 numbers, knowing that it generally always goes up, but you're always a year behind. That's a really good way to do it. You would make an adjustment, obviously, in the case like this year where the state aid went up more than normal. We wouldn't say, well, it went up a whole bunch, but we're just not going to book that. You would then go book a majority of a substantial revenue increase like that.
Under the purpose, just I think to finish the thought on the last sentence, we say evaluating revenue sources and requirements, determine expenditure strategy as part of.
Oh, it's probably good financial management.
All right, either that or make a reference here to, as part of our long-term financial forecasting process and annual budget balancing processes. Just so we're tying in both our long-term look and our annual budget balancing processes into this.
Absolutely, I would agree to that, and we will add something in here if it's not clear about, we're not really referring to the tax levy, because we don't project 90% of what we're gonna receive with the tax levy.
Yeah, the other revenue we were curious about is, do you mean for this to apply to circuit breaker? I mean, if we did that, we would be,
No, because that's a restricted fund, so we wouldn't really apply this to anything that's, restricted or like a revolving account or anything like that, so it doesn't,
No, I agree, it doesn't really make sense for it to apply there, but I just think that
So we'll
the
clarify
way
that
this
we're
is
talking
written,
about
it's,
local receipts and a couple other areas.
yeah.
So, for instance, we talked about local receipts, which this year I think are 13 million ahead. And, for local aid and 15 million for local receipts, so it's 28 million. So if you take 10% off that, that's a $2.8 million hit. So obviously you can't do that in a year, but, and I think we should make some reference to the fact in here that that's our long-term goal, and we're gonna do a transition to get there. And
This would be one of those metrics you look at every year and say, how close are we to?
maybe we could do it by the way you said, which is keep the level we have this year until such time as we reach 90%. Keep that same number every year.
Again, within
Especially if the override passes, then you'd be able to.
you have a little bit of breathing room in terms of some of your local receipts. Exactly. The goal is not to do something that's going to hurt us and all of a sudden have to cut $4 million next year just because we want to meet a policy to generate free cash. We want to cushion ourselves. We want to make sure that we're being conservative in those projections, and it's going to take us time to get there.
So can we just add some line in here that talks about a transition?
If you want to make the note, I'm going to have the CFO make some of the adjustments. But no, I'd agree. And this is, it's not just aspirational. It's not like in one perfect world we'll be there, but we're going to want to work there where we're just being conservative and not saying, all right, let's solve our problem this year by just increase this revenue number and hope it all comes in. Dave?
Yeah, the term prior year, we might need to define, fleece that out a little bit more, because we're in FY19. We don't really know how we're ending. So we're really talking, and we're planning for 20, so we're really looking at 18. Well, shall not exceed 90% of the prior year's actual receipts.
Well, then
But we don't know that when we're putting up.
Well, I think what it says that, Dave, they're talking about actual receipts on the recap, which is really
Correct.
2 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Well,
So-
that's why I'm saying.
That is what we
It
do.
needs to be in prior year. So if I'm reading this and I'm out in the community, I'm saying, oh, well, we're planning for 20, so we're looking at 19, but we can't.
No,
really look at
we're
19.
talking about,
Well, that's why it does say actual receipts.
Right,
So-
okay, but see,
I
again, the layperson out there, or on town
we
meeting
could say the
floor.
actual prior fiscal year's receipts.
Yeah.
Right. Other questions on revenue projections? All right, moving along. Revenue sharing formula, and this has been left a little time to decide, but this is, do we want to put our revenue sharing formula in as a policy, or?
So I think there's too many variables right now to even consider putting a split down on paper. I mean, there's the override, there's the facilities, how that's gonna be managed, where those costs are gonna go. I don't think that right now, based on where we are as a town and with the override not decided yet, that we can make a decision on what that split should be. I think it should be reconvened after the override vote, and whether it passes or not, and then relook at it, to make sure that any deficit that would be felt is felt by both the town and the schools.
So one thing that's important to remember is the revenue sharing formula that we use is a starting point, not an end point, and it's new revenues coming in. If the override were to pass, the formula doesn't change, but what happened is the school budget goes up about $4 million. So you're seeing a big increase here, and every year some of the things that we've done, the formula's never actually been 55-45. It often ends up about 57, 58, depending on what it is. Last year, I think there was we used a lot of one-time sources, so that actually increases that 55 number every year. So this is just sort of the starting point for a projection, if you will.
And it's not 55%, not that 55% of the budget is schools, it's of the revenue.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's new revenue coming in, absent the override, which is being allocated differently. So it's just, all right, this year we're getting $700,000 in new revenue. That's sort of the starting point, and then decisions are made from there. That's why it's never actually been 55-45. It's always quite a bit higher.
So my point would be, what's the point of having a policy then? If it always gets adjusted,
always changes.
why are we gonna have a policy? I think we should wait on this until we understand what's happening with revenue, with the override, to find out what the split and allocation to each department should be, and then set it based on that, rather than doing it prematurely. That's just my thought.
And just, what would we, with the facilities department coming on board at some point, how would they fit into the 55-45? Would we not have to split the revenue there by 3 ways?
That's my other.
No, so here, it depends on how you want to do it. So if you book all of the facilities costs as a shared cost, then that means that both sides are effectively paying for those. but it also means that both sides would realize any savings. So let's say, I mean, if you moved it all over to the general government, you'd have to move the revenue portion with it as well. That wouldn't affect the 55-45 necessarily going forward, because you would just be saying, we're deleting, I'm making the number up here, but $4 million in school expenses and adding $4 million to general government expenses, but the revenue would flow with it. Otherwise, the town couldn't absorb the $4 million cost without any additional revenue. The benefit to that would be that the schools would not be responsible for some of those shared costs. However, if in 5 years we've saved $2 million in utility costs, that means that's just a general government savings as well. So I don't want to say it would actually, moving it to a shared cost, because the school facility costs are higher than the town cost, generally would benefit, there's just more staff, would generally benefit the school department more. Right now, general government pays 100% of its utility costs, the school pays 100% of its utility costs. If they became a shared cost, it gets taken off the top. Remember, it's the revenue that we split, not the expenses.
Right.
So,
But that's part of the issue that I think we need to flesh out a little bit more, because currently the way we determine our budgets is we take our revenue, and the first allocation goes to shared and fixed costs. And then the remaining revenue is then distributed 55-45. And that's where all the fighting occurs. That's where all the work occurs in terms of how do we best balance our budgets. So if we're going to consider facilities in part of the shared cost, we have to be cognizant of the fact that we can't eliminate them from the discussion about what needs to get cut. So it's the allocation of the revenue that's I think we need to work through. When I think of shared costs, I think of benefit costs where we don't have a lot of play in benefits, so they're almost like fixed costs. I think of our insurances, our other things that fall into that category.
Debt.
If
That's the biggest one.
So if facilities falls into the shared costs, technically the revenue is going to be going into them. I mean, it just seems to me that they're not included in discussion about how best do we balance our budget lines, the way we do today, the way the process works today.
sure.
Basically, I'm sorry, so basically Kelly and Bob's point is that the dollars should precede the percentages rather than the other way around now, because we don't really know the dollar situation yet, so.
Right, because I was gonna agree with Kelly, because if the override passes, and I haven't actually computed the number, but the ratio is probably gonna be more like 58-40.
57-43.
Yeah.
There we go. So someone has computed it.
Yes.
And it is gonna be,
57-43.
Right.
you know, more towards the schools would have been the will of the voters. And so, just say, you know, we'll review it,
Yeah.
you know, the formula. Currently, we use this, we're gonna review this over, you know,
Post-June 3rd.
a year.
Is there a written agreement or a written description of what is shared costs?
It's in the budget book, it's all
Yeah, the budget book.
it's the 900 sections in the
Yeah,
budget
but
plus the
but is there a
140.
policy that says shared costs includes?
No, just past practice.
No.
Okay, so
That would be good to outline here for because the general public's not gonna read a budget book. So that they would understand, you know, it's pension funds, it's benefits, it's medical insurance. That would be really good to outline here if we're gonna use this as a layperson's document.
Every town does it a little bit differently,
Yeah,
but
which is fine.
they're
There's some
generally,
examples right here.
to be honest with you, what it is in most communities is it's your mandatory costs. It's the things you have to spend money on. You know, it doesn't matter what we wanna spend our money on, we have to pay our debt service, we have to pay our pension fund, and so that's generally where it, starts.
Right.
Separately, and Dave and I have talked about how a shared facilities department would impact, again, remember, the 55-45 is the new revenues coming in, so we go into next year, we've got $1 million in revenues, it's 550 and 450. So it's not the costs come off the top. David, do you remember and we don't want to spend all day talking about facilities, I wouldn't mind, but do you remember the breakdown between school and town costs on the facility side?
Yeah.
Roughly? Ballpark?
I know it was around 4 million for,
It's about 4.6 for the schools,
and,
like 2.5 for town.
So it's 66%, two-thirds schools.
yeah, 2.3.
Okay.
So two-thirds
So
schools.
if you had that as a shared cost budget, again, in theory, year one, that would have no net impact on anyone. The actual playing of where the numbers go in the budget is a little bit more complicated, but we'd have to adjust that at a staff level.
4.4 for schools, 2.2 for general government.
So basically, by doing that as a shared cost, it's more fiscally beneficial to the school just at a top level, because now you're taking a cost that's saying it's shared, so the town with its 45% of revenue now needs to cover portion of the shared costs, their portion would go up.
Right.
And again,
And just because it's a shared cost doesn't mean that that's not something that you could, review during the budget process too. You simply don't, come up on day one, here's our facilities management department cost.
Sure, we take it.
Throw it in there and not take a look at it later if it turns out that you do have a budget concern
Right,
down the
and
road.
nor would we say, all right, well, in the shared facilities department, the police cruisers are in there, and DPW trucks are a shared facility cost, or things like that. The challenge becomes with the savings, really. So if we just made the revenue adjustment and booked it entirely on the general government side, that's fine. What happens when I save $1 million is that it's all general government savings, as opposed to those savings, which we know we'll see over time, would otherwise come out of both bottom lines, so to speak. Yeah.
So, shared facilities aside, because I don't think that's even been voted, that's not done, right? Okay, so hypotheticals aside, is this the first time that the 55-45 split has been put down on paper for financial
Is it
policies?
in the old one?
No,
No.
no, I don't
It's
think the
not
old one
the old
addressed
one.
that.
Not in here.
It's
So-
just been,
It's been
through the
done.
budget balancing.
Been voted by
years
budget
ago,
balancing
Many
annually.
moons ago.
This is the first time it's been like a financial policy though?
Yeah.
It's
So
not in
I'm wondering if, given all of the discussion that's going around about how it should happen, if it makes sense to add a new policy in today around that, or if we just agree that we need to wait for a couple of other things to happen before we put it down on paper.
I'd probably
We've been
wait
doing it
through-
forever.
I'd probably wait through the override thing and see where the dollars fall there, because, 700,000, remember, it's a levy limit increase. Town meeting hasn't voted to appropriate it anyway.
Right.
We've just, it's been so funny in this town, it's been for year after year, it's 2.5% plus new growth, automatic, that's it, so we already know. You can do it for the next 10 years, you can do the calculate, well, reasonably of new growth, but now we're at a point where we might have, sufficient, perhaps more than we need levy capacity, if we're planning to put $700,000 aside out of that. Town meeting might say, we don't want a stabilization account for $700,000. We're only gonna appropriate 5.25 out of the 5.95 allowed, so I think you're probably right on that. You might wanna see where the dollars fall first and see what the percentages come out to. And if everybody's happy, that's where you move on from there.
Yeah. So is there consensus? We'll pull this for now,
Right.
but everyone does understand that the revenue sharing formula is always applied to new revenues, just as a starting point. So it's not that we just look at total revenues and say it's always 55-45. So if next year we have $1 million, that's what's sort of split, and then any changes after that always impact what the split is. It's the starting point, not the end point.
But I think once we set the budget and we know what percentage should go to each town, maybe town government should get 50%, the school should get 50%, who knows? But new revenue, all right, so new revenue should support that. If that's what we decide the budgets are needed and that's level setting them, then the new growth should follow those budgets in the same percentage.
Well, and as you say, but actually a good example of that is the facilities thing. If we put it on the general government side, that's $6 million now that have to be accounted
Exactly.
for on one side.
You'd have to make that adjustment to cover it.
And that would change, that would fluctuate it anyway, so.
Okay.
Okay, so consensus vote, we'll pull that for now.
Basically was a split of what school budget and town budget was before proposition 2.5.
Wow, it goes back that far.
And then, along the way, at a budget balancing committee, the schools got an extra 5% because Mr. Carroll left the room.
Bill, it was Mr. Thornton left the room.
Left the room, and Mr. Carroll gave it to him.
And Mr. Thornton, who was the financial director, was angry, even though Mr. Carroll is the one who lost the 5%, he gave it away.
And that's why now, this year, except for the new influx of state funding, if we get it, still some thought we could maybe not get that, but if we get that, that saved us this year, but
Yeah.
it would have been this year, and next year without the override, we finally caught up to schools that are having a budget problem.
That's why the town manager doesn't allow me to take bathroom breaks.
It'd be the opposite, you'd be the one giving everything away.
There's a couple of things that we've discussed here, and we talked about the capital outlay, and that the capital outlay committee has to go back and work on it. And I think that this is a good thing for the budget balancing committee to go back and work on where we can wrap our arms around the revenue and wrap our arms around our fixed costs and decide really get a determination of
And
what
I
is
don't want to
going
cut you
to
off,
be.
you're 110% right, yes, absolutely. Consensus, we're gonna pull this for now, we will discuss it in the context of where we are in a few months.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I just wanna keep us
All right.
with a few other items.
Tax collection.
Tax collection, this is our second to last policy. There really haven't been any changes to this. Just a quick overview. We're good with tax collection, we don't have a critical problem, but when you let it slip, you start to see the fiscal condition of your community start to slip. So we wanna make sure we're setting a total tax collection goal, and then we're being aggressive in making sure we're applying liens. I know last time there was a concern that we're gonna force some little old lady out of her house because she didn't pay her taxes. I can tell you, with Bernie in the last 40 years, that's never happened. It is rare, if ever, that is actually the case. It is almost always that there's been some legal issue or there's some other issue. And what happens when you don't follow through on an aggressive tax collection and enforcement, everyone else in the community is paying for that. It begins to deteriorate your financial condition. The quality and condition of these properties begins to deteriorate. And what happens is, remember, we talked about we wouldn't reject 90% of our tax levy. Your tax collection rate goes down. We are levying taxes up here, and we're only collecting here. It's eating into your free cash. It's eating into your overlay assessment. It's just, we want to make sure we're following good collection processes. We want to make sure that if we, and some of these are not problems we've had, but they are communities that problems happen. There are communities that have had these problems. We have a tax collection rate. We want it to be aggressive. If we have payment programs, we always work with people if they're generally struggling to pay their taxes. We just don't want to say, okay, you're 2 years behind on the taxes, here's a plan that will get you current in 9 years, because you're gonna continue to do it. And believe it or not, that's unfortunately common in a lot of communities, and it just costs us more money down the road. So we talked about the payment plans. We need to be aggressive in placing the tax liens, because when you don't place them, you can lose out, and then the town permanently loses money. We have a responsibility to everyone that does pay their taxes. And again, there's not been a case in 42 years in Norwood, at least going back, where a little old lady's ever been forced out of her house. We wouldn't let that happen. But what we don't want to do is not be aggressive in tax collection, because I know we all like to think of the proverbial little old lady in her home, but there could be a business just sticking its finger up the town saying, well, we're not paying. When you don't place the liens on, when you're not aggressive, when you don't threaten that foreclosure, you start to run into financial issues, and very quickly you start to go, and it causes a huge issue. The other problem with that is, as you have to continue to raise taxes and then the rate goes up, the people who pay their taxes, even the people who struggle to pay their taxes, are absorbing the burden of everyone who's not. So, collection, questions on tax collection and enforcement, which again is also governed by statute. We just want to make sure we're doing good work with it. All right, the next one is, I call it a policy, but it's just really sort of outlining what our budget balancing committee is. I think we copied this still word for word, but we should just have something in our financial management policies about the fact that we have a budget balancing committee. Just like at some point, if we have a revenue sharing formula, we should have that in writing somewhere. Ann?
I'd like to make a change,
Sure.
and I'd like to make the change to 2 members from the Board of Selectmen, 2 members from the school committee, 2 members from the finance commission. The general manager, superintendent of schools, and the director of finance would be ex officio, non-voting members. And the reason why I say this, that yes, the general manager and the superintendent of schools and the director of finance all have input, and it's very important for us to have that input. But that the committees, commissions, board, that I suggest having the voting members, we're the folks that are presenting this budget. And we, the initial concept was to get the 3 boards together and working together. I will say that the finance commission could be your, I'll call it your middle vote, the persons that sort of can see both sides. And the other 2 would be presenting their budgets. And I think that with the 2, and 2, I think that we work together and can come out with a good budget for the town.
Are you saying there's a conflict of interest of having staff people, voting members on that as they're presenting information?
There is. The superintendent, this doesn't happen anywhere else where the superintendent or the town manager would be on a voting committee. I mean, our recommendation is to say this is the budget based on what we think we can afford, what we think our needs are. I'm fine with that. And same thing with the finance, it's just,
The only
The
potential
only
problem
problem
we
is
have
that
is
you
the
got an
time
even number at the end of
You
the
need a
time
yeah,
votes.
you need an odd number. of
And
votes.
that's
throw
why I
some
was
Selectmen
saying
on
this,
there.
the finance commission sort
Tony
of
breaks the
acts
tie.
as the,
Yeah, I think if you don't have a majority, then you go to the finance committee and they.
Or you could have,
Well, the truth-
you could have another member,
Yes.
and the first year they could be from the FinCom, the second year from the.
No, because then it becomes, then you have a quorum
Then you
issue.
got three
Town
members.
meeting member.
yeah.
And you have
Or
a
you can
majority.
say that
And then it just becomes
finance
a
director's
political.
neutral.
How about if we just eliminate, if you want to make the general manager and superintendent non-voting, leave the director of finance as a voting member?
You shouldn't really have
I think it's
staff.
fine where it is.
Yeah.
No.
And I can tell you personally, from the moment, this budget balancing committee is a Norwood-only thing,
Yeah.
which I'm not casting any aspersions on, but sitting there, I had a hard time personally voting, because it does put me in a position where there's an ethical problem there. For anyone who's employed who would personally benefit from their budget, there's an ethical problem there. So, I think that if there is an impasse,
All
I
right,
think it
two-
maybe
two-
goes to
two
the
and
finance
then-
committee and they look at it and they vote, or something along that line.
The other thing is, I think that, let's remember that the Budget Balancing Committee doesn't really have any authority other than to make recommendations to town meeting and to make recommendations. So I think it's okay, in, all the other boards should be an odd number of people, but I think since this is a group that's supposed to get together to make recommendations, ultimately, any tiebreaker would happen by town meeting. They're the
Right,
tiebreaker.
and at the end of the day, I mean, Dave's gotta submit the budget he thinks is best, and I've gotta submit the, the budget that I think is best. It goes to, the school committee has to approve what they think is right, the FinCom makes their recommendation to town meeting, the selectmen will ultimately decide on, sort of what goes to town meeting. So it is a recommendation body, and I mean, if you have a split vote, you have a split vote. We'll all look sort of foolish to the public if it's 3-3 on what budget balancing recommends, but you're right, at the end of the day, they're just there to recommend the balancing of the budget.
So if you wanna make that argument, that's all the FinCom is, all they do is recommend.
Mhm.
Don't have any
Correct.
actual control.
Right.
Correct.
'Cause
Can't
town meeting
actually
still-
say with our boards, we're recommending this is
Well,
what our department.
correct,
needs.
ultimately, town meeting gets to decide on it, but I'm fine with, we probably shouldn't be voting members, and I'm fine with it being 6. I mean, it's not a question.
I don't like the idea of boards coming split before town meeting. I think it sends a bad message. What about a town meeting member at large that sits on this?
No, I mean, ultimately, the FinCom has the responsibility for presenting the budget. So, in theory, the Budget Balancing Committee can say anything it wants.
Yep.
The FinCom has the actual responsibility for presenting the budget, for recommending a budget and presenting at the town meeting. And I mean, I don't particularly like the idea of having a 3-3 vote. I think it sends a bad message. I mean, if we're not gonna have, Tony and Dave and Tom or their successors be voting members, and that's really what we're gonna wind up having. And ultimately, if that happens, then the budget balancing really won't have much input into the process. It'll be the FinCom who will have even more responsibility to put that budget forward than they would before.
So BBC recommends a budget to FinCom, who then makes a recommendation to town
They
meeting?
recommend how to
That's how I
balance the
understood
budget.
Mhm.
So, for instance, you perpetually have a deficit in any city or town.
Yeah.
But budget balancing, we'll just say, look, we think that they sort of have some input on the split, we think you should do this, we think we should use this much free cash, all right, why don't we move money over here to get to a number. They don't make recommendations on, should the school hire 3 teachers in the town, should hire 2 cops, that's handled by the respective boards. They're really there to just facilitate the communication of how do we get to a balanced budget. So that way, we're not going to town meeting with me saying, well, I think the schools should use $600,000 of free cash to balance their budget, and Dave says, no, it should be $200,000, but we should take $400,000 from over here, and then it's how do you sort of facilitate that, okay, we at least gotta come to some agreement on the numbers.
Hopefully any battles we resolve before we get to town meeting.
So who
And
does
that's-
BBC
and
recommend
that's
to?
what
That's, who
That's
does
why the
BBC recommend
BBC
to?
To the
started
Finance Committee.
was to
Well, it's
to
really
get
all
the
three
boards.
boards.
Settles the arguments before we get to.
And who
Yes.
do they make that recommendation to? Like, when this budget came, when the BBC made their recommendation around a number, my understanding was that recommendation went to the Board of
Well,
Selectmen.
it actually
No.
goes to all, it goes to the.
All three
back
boards.
to
goes
school
to
committee.
prepare their
Into
budget,
all
general-
three.
General government to prepare their budget, and for the FinCom to accept that and work along the budget in the same manner.
Right, but
Okay.
but
I got
again,
it.
I just
Thank
wanna
you.
make it very clear that budget balancing makes a recommendation, which
Yep.
the school committee may vote on and the selectmen may vote on respectively, but it's ultimately the FinCom who has to make the budget recommendation at town meeting. So I don't think it's been done, but we can completely ignore anything that budget balancing says. We're not, as a FinCom, bound by any recommendation from the budget balancing committee.
Just like the school committee or the town general government could say, okay, well, the budget balancing committee said our budget should be $46 million, but we think it really needs to be 48, and they could still vote for 48. We could go into town meeting with an unbalanced budget, except that they're gonna, the FinCom ultimately will recommend something overall.
There's a statutory way that happens if you had a difference between what the school committee approves. The warrant that goes to town meeting is ultimately the selectmen's warrant, at the end of the day. But remember, the process here is if the selectmen put a warrant forward and the FinCom is voting no on everything, generally town meeting's not gonna go along with that unless nobody believes the FinCom in their town. If the school committee adopts a $50 million budget and there's only $47 million, or the selectmen say, well, we're putting forward 47, you can go in with an unbalanced budget. That actually sort of triggers an automatic contingent override vote, not an automatic, but that's what the DOR will tell you, well, that's what they put forward, that's what they put forward, the money's gotta be on there, you've gotta go with it.
So if you wanted an odd number though, FinCom may not like this idea, but why don't you just have one FinCom member? If there's a neutral, and you have 5, people can vote.
I had actually thought of that, but I think that maybe 2 members.
But I mean, if you're worried
You know, one
about, like,
FinCom member, what
they
about
want their money, they want their money. Theoretically, the FinCom's neutral.
Yeah, let's hash out some of the other things with revenue. Do we agree on what that revenue is?
Do we add somebody from capital outlay as a 7th member? I mean, this is what I get it, that, you know, you don't want a split board. Although a split vote fails, and it's a.
Yeah.
But if
and
it's
I
split,
think-
it is what it is. I mean, 4-3 versus 3-3 doesn't really make that much of a difference in perception to the public, right? That's not, that shows that there's just
Yeah.
there's discord on the board and there's a lack of agreement.
Yeah,
So I agree that fighting over the one member, I don't think really is really gonna change anything for public perception.
I do remember one issue a few years ago where there was a 5-4 vote. I mean, could it happen? Yeah, I mean, as long as people understand, if you have 6 members, potentially, you know, there could be a split vote of the Budget Balancing Committee, and, you know, ultimately, you know, the FinCom will have even more influence in putting the final budget together. That's what people want, that's fine. I'm okay with that.
So I guess the question is, forgetting about it for a minute, where that other person may come from. Do we want to keep it at 6, or do we want to find a 7th member?
Keep it at 6.
Like 6 is fine.
Okay, if it all fails, remember, at the end of the day.
We can change it.
We can change it, it's not the end of the world, it's just the budget balancing.
So the
Right.
composition is the same, it's just that
For
the ex
discussion.
officio members are being
Non-voting.
reduced to non-voting status.
Mhm.
So the wording change would make it, where it says, just above the names, where it says 9 voting members, take out voting, and then right beside each one that votes,
Yeah.
put voting or non-voting.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
On the whole change and the discussion of 2 members vote, or 6 members voting, I just, the concept behind the development of the Budget Balancing Committee was to get people together to come to a consensus, and I
think it's news.
Whoa, okay.
Motion to adjourn.
The consensus was that we were coming
Time.
together to work together. And I think that even if we only have, if we have 6 instead of 7, that if we enter into this agreement for consensus
It's really just
purposes, that we can
facilitating
do it.
the communication.
Yeah.
You can just as easily have all 3 boards get together to talk about it, but the practicality of getting 15 people together, as you know, it's.
And, you know, I haven't been here long, but, I mean, if there was disagreement, I think everybody would go back to the table and see if we can come to agreement,
Yeah.
Right.
so.
So
The
we'll make
purpose of
that.
budget balancing was to actually reduce the disagreement, that's where it came into being,
Right.
was to reduce the conflict prior to town meeting. It's actually succeeded in that mission, I think, quite well. But I suppose if the 2 chief administrators of the town are saying, you know, I've always had a little bit of a problem with the idea that I can vote on my own, but will we just tell them they have to vote? I mean, that's it.
Yeah, that's your fault. I'm okay with it being your fault.
All right, so Bob, question?
Not a question, just on the purpose. I think the Budget Balancing Committee's mission is evolving, and it will evolve, particularly if the override does pass. And in addition to the work collaboratively in the balancing the annual budget, I think we need to take in consideration that the review and update of the long-term financial forecast should be part of this process as well.
I think that's a great idea.
Because if we're going to have an override, and the override is saying that we're going to be budgeting money every year in a stabilization fund to last a 5-year period, I think we want to have this committee be in charge of making sure that that is done.
Good idea. So what was your language there, Bob?
If you say, work collaboratively in the balancing the annual budget and the reviewing and updating of the long-term financial forecast.
I like that.
Consensus on that? Sounds good. Any other questions on budget balancing? All right, now, we did, back here. So good work, everyone. Everyone give themselves a round of applause. It's tough to do this stuff on a Saturday. Two quick things. We did have a couple of other items on the agenda. My thought process is, again, I'm willing to stay here all day. The budget process changes that Dr. Thompson and I want to talk about, we can do down the road, because that's not immediately pressing, even though it's probably only 10 or 15 minutes, but we can do that down the road. The MOU discussion, I think, is going to require maybe more time than we have here this morning. I'd like if everyone would indulge me just 5-minute quick chat on that free cash in the FY20 budget related to the override, because that's come up. What we're referring to real quick is budget balancing had recommended that we will pay for the Forbes Hill debt service out of free cash, which had actually been the FinCom's recommendation prior to that, prior to this year. But that instead of splitting that according to the split, we would just give that $500,000 to the school department. Everyone's on the same page with me so far? The question came up, if the override passes, what does then happen to that $500,000 in the school budget? Because in theory, it would not be needed. My recommendation would be, if the override doesn't pass, then that's in the budget just like any other year. My recommendation, if it does pass, is that we just put that money in the override stabilization account. You'd otherwise have a net surplus in the school budget, and that would come back through free cash in the following subsequent years for the FY22 budget. But my thought is, since that's technically an appropriation we wouldn't need if the override passes, put it in the override stabilization account, which would just extend the whole process out longer. That's my suggestion. Open up the floor for.
Well, mechanically, you're not gonna know that till after the
We'd be doing it
override.
as special in the fall.
So there'd be the special, and that, then it's gonna be, you'll be taking that then out of free cash, whatever gets certified.
No, we would actually be appropriating money out of the school budget into stabilization.
Oh, I see.
So basically, let's say we have a special on November 1st. At that point in time, we know the school department's gonna technically have a $509,000 surplus. You would be appropriating out of that into stabilization, because you can't appropriate into free cash. Free cash isn't really an account. I know that sounds funny, but you can't put money into free cash. So the thought process being, the override passes, there's technically an extra $500,000 in there. What do we do with it? I would say throw it in the override stabilization account. Question.
Could we use it to fund the shared facilities department?
We could use it to fund anything. We should talk at some point about shared facilities. So in theory, we could appropriate that money for whatever we so chose. I think the idea is that you're going to the taxpayers for a certain amount of money. Okay, if this passes, we'd have a little bit extra money in the budget. Well, we've done this override. Let's do everything we can do to make it successful. But we can put it in stabilization, put it in OPEB.
So I think the question that we had right now as a school committee is, if that money's going to be appropriated to the school committee at town meeting, and then there's the additional 4.7 million, but we were really only counting on the 4.2 million of that, then I think we would need to put the 500, well, we can't give it back right away because it's town meeting that makes that decision. So I think what we're saying is that we would add that $509,000 to our override budget, but we would put it in as probably under the school committee reserve line that we've used in the past for like collective bargaining and things like that. And then it would just sit there until, with the understanding that we would move it at fall town meeting.
Right, that's it.
Yeah. And the final determination of where that goes, be it override stabilization or.
We'd work that out later.
Time of town meeting, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Before the.
I mean, I don't think it should go to
You're
regular
pledging if you get the
stabilization. We
money
can
from
work
the
that out.
override,
Right.
you won't also spend the 5.
Right.
It's a gesture of good faith that would go a long way, and you would now go from 700,000 to how was it, 1.2 million in the stabilization?
Year one,
If
correct.
that's where you put it.
Yeah, but I think what we want is consensus that money should go somewhere, that it's not needed in that case.
That would extend the time you ever would, if you ever had another override, this certainly delay that.
Okay, I'm gonna jump in. I do think that we had a little discussion about our stabilization fund earlier, so, to ensure that we are looked upon well by our rating agencies, my thought is that after we put it into your budget and then take it out in the fall, that maybe we all give some serious thought and consideration to putting it back into the stabilization fund. That would go basically.
Well, the
So
rating
I think we
agencies
I think we've agreed, we can argue in
Right.
the fall where it should go.
That's gonna go somewhere.
Let's figure out if we have to argue about something.
Is there
But
a
for,
consensus
but for all of our understanding in the public's,
Mhm.
the schools aren't getting an extra 500,000 in budgeting to make sure that comes back
So
as
there's,
to how the town decides to spend.
there's consensus that money should go somewhere if it's unexpended. Is there consensus that maybe we should, when that discussion comes up, get a recommendation from budget balancing? I mean, they're sort of the ones who have orchestrated this, let budget balancing get together and say, okay, put it in the override stabilization or here or other,
We
because
get it from the finance commission.
Yeah, I think the finance commission would make the recommendation.
But I think the rating agencies, they add up all the stabilizations
they do.
together, so.
Yeah.
Which one we
It's all
choose
one
from
balance,
that
it's all
point
one
of view
balance,
doesn't matter.
yeah. Including whatever you have.
Right, I mean,
Yeah.
finance commission makes the motion, to put it in Fund X. Town meeting would vote yea or nay, or whether to put it somewhere else. I don't think you necessarily need budget balancing to do that.
Yeah, the thought there being that they sort of started the process, they could close the loop on a recommendation that that they made.
I don't even know what time it is, but I think we need to talk about the so-called MOU. And if not today, very soon, because there's a big issue before the town, the override.
Right.
As far as I know, different people have said they may, on their boards, may or may not take positions on it, but they're waiting for the MOU. So-
Right,
So we should
Right.
have a resolution to the MOU.
right, I mean,
I'm
from a,
fine with talking about the MOU.
from a,
if you want.
from a FinCom perspective, I mean, we've stated that, we're reluctant to take a position until we see the final MOU and we know what we're getting into, so I have no problem with staying, but if we don't, we're gonna have to get this resolved prior
Next
to town
Saturday, or
meeting.
sometime very quickly.
Very quickly, so that the FinCom can take a positive or negative
What
vote,
time is it?
So
depending
it's
on the override.
It's 10 past 12, we've got two options here. We can continue going through and work on the MOU, or if next Saturday works, we could reconvene next Saturday and finish the MOU and a couple other.
Can't do
Can
next
we cut
Saturday.
it, can we make an agreement to cut it one?
Yes.
Like, can we make like an agreement as to what the hard stop is?
Is there consensus, even head nods?
Well, maybe
Yeah.
we don't even have that much
Not till
discussion,
next
let's
Saturday.
try.
Well, all right, so let's at least start and we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
So this is the MOU, everyone has a copy, right? So I'll go through this briefly. Section 1, override funds will be made to last at least 5 years. No general override will be sought during this period. The plan includes an override stabilization account. Section 2, let me go through this and then we'll look at it. General government and school department operating budgets will be capped at 3.5% per year, subject to the availability of funds. That is a cap. That does not mean we can both start each year out with a 3.5% increase. It's just saying we will not exceed that. There is an exception here for certain qualified special ed costs that would allow an additional 3.5% on top of that for specific special ed costs that are mandated by law. This has come up, we've batted this back a few times. We're not talking about if Dave wanted to add another assistant superintendent for special education, not a non-necessary cost, but sometimes you do, as you know, get a special ed cost that is just above and beyond the normal cost of doing business. So there'd be an additional allowance for those qualified mandated special ed and ELL costs. Section 3, we're looking at limits to the number of benefited positions that will be added in years 2 through 5 on both the general government side and the town side. So we're saying we are limiting any growth in staff. It'll either need to come through reallocations or it's going to be very minimal. Again, excluding the SPED and ELL mandated positions because we don't really have an ability to say no to a position the state tells us we have to add. We're going to program health insurance costs at 5%. If costs exceed that amount, both budgets will be proportionally decreased by the excess amount. Our shared cost formula sort of takes care of that process. If the amount is less as a result of that or negotiated healthcare savings, that extra savings will be deposited into the override stabilization fund to extend the override period. Arlington's override was projected for 3 years. It lasted 7 or 8. The number one thing that did that was health insurance savings. They had about $6 million in health insurance savings. And just real quick, override updates around the state. Arlington is projecting in 2 to 3 years, they will need a $15 million override. So they're actually proposing this coming year to do a $6 million override, to do it now, to spread out that burden to make it a little bit easier. Melrose recently passed a $5.1 million override. They had no MOU, they did not even do a 5-year projection of where their costs were going to be. So you've sort of got different models in every community. Number 5, beginning in FY21, the allocation from the override to road paving will not be decreased or transferred and will remain permanently in the operating budget of general government. And general government will increase the total amount allocated to snow and ice removal each year until reaching a 5-year average snow and ice expenditure. That's just part of the commitment to the public to say if we're going to for an override for some money, additional money for roads, we're not then gonna cut it next year and put new carpet in the town manager's
But we
office.
can increase it?
Oh, absolutely. The goal would be to increase it. Paving roads is a good thing to do. And then the snow and ice, again, we're asking the public to help us fix a deficit on snow and ice. We wouldn't then, you can decrease snow and ice, you're not supposed to. But we want to then make sure that we're continuing to make progress. So that's where general government is saying, look, I want that new carpet in the town manager's office, but we've asked for money for this. We have to make sure we're solving these problems and not setting us up to just face the same problems 5 or 10 years down the road. 6, agreement will be reviewed if substantial changes are made to state funding of education. Document will guide budget preparation. So obviously I know some folks on the one hand, they say that, does the document have too many holes in it and it doesn't mean anything. The other side is you can't have something that's so strict that we don't review it. If all of a sudden in a couple of years we get another $7 million revenue stream from somewhere or state aid changes dramatically, of course we would take a step back and look at this. Maybe we don't need to appropriate the full amount. We're not gonna say, great, now we're gonna be able to tax A, B, or C, and we're getting millions of dollars, but we're still not changing this. So of course, if the situation changes, things would change. The economy could continue to grow, we could get some great growth and development in town. The economy could continue to crash, Prop 2.5 could change. So obviously, if there are major changes, we would make adjustments as well. Our annual contribution to OPEB will not be decreased during the 5-year period. That is programmed in at $250,000 for FY21, which is what it's been for a while. We want to increase this, but then again, we are not going to ask the taxpayers for a lot of tax money and then start making financial decisions that make things easy on us in the short term, but are just propelling problems 10 or 12 years down the road. And we want to talk about, we'll use state aid before maximizing the levy limit each year, and even consistent with being conservative in our state aid projections, we want to make sure that if there's other monies coming in, to the extent practical, we do want to use those and not just say, well, hey, we're getting $3 million a year for a leasing a project, but we're going to go spend that on something else. Let's do this. And that's not to say that we wouldn't get a specific revenue stream from something and want to allocate it to something, but in particular state aid, we want to make sure we're conservatively budgeting it, but using that state aid.
Just a question of timing of the state aid thing, Tony, I know
Yes.
before you wrap it up. So the H1 comes out in February, give or take,
Yep.
from the governor's office, but actually, we don't actually have, it's the legislature that approves it. So where do we fall in, the legislature has not yet approved a budget.
No, to be honest with you,
Therefore,
sometimes they don't approve it until July. So
Okay.
we've started the fiscal year based on a projection. April 15th, I think the House releases their version of the budget. The Senate will follow shortly thereafter.
So we're basically we're gonna use our state aid projection before max, okay, all right, we'll get close enough, I hope. Okay, thank you.
Just on that same line, why are we just limiting, when we say the town will use state aid before maximizing tax levy? Why aren't we saying that it's all local revenues, including state aid, before we maximize?
Well, because I think there's a potential that state aid could change dramatically in the next couple of years. It may not.
No, but why are you limiting yourself to just including state aid before you maximize the levy limit? Why aren't we including all revenues
So
available?
we
And then
generally,
say, what's the tax?
yeah, we generally do. This was just thrown there because somebody wanted to make sure we were trying to use other revenue streams. I mean, we do use all of our other revenue streams.
So I think we should state that, because before we go to the taxpayer, I'd want them to know that we
So we
used
could say
all
the
of our
town will
revenues
use
possible,
all available revenue streams,
including state aid.
Yep.
before
I get it.
maximizing the levy
Okay.
each year, consistent with our financial practices.
I think-
But what we don't, one of the concerns is what we don't necessarily want to do is lock us in. If we get a revenue stream for something small and we want to dedicate it to something specific, we don't necessarily want to always lock ourselves into that as well. We don't want something so strict that and again, if it's millions of dollars, that's great, but we lease out a property for $40,000 and somebody might say, that's great, that should go right into the general fund. Well, wait a minute, maybe we should use it for the maintenance of that property, something along those lines. The school department used to have a lease at the Savage Center, and that's a revenue. We may say, well, but that should be used to offset the operational expenses in that area.
It's supposed to go into maintenance of the facility that's being leased until the end of the fiscal year, and then if it hasn't been used, any balance goes to the general fund. That's Mass state law.
Right.
So, I think I had comments similar to what I think I just heard Dave saying, and I had sent out an email. Unfortunately, I don't know how to shrink emails, and I didn't all print off the page, so I don't know exactly what I said. But to me, 6 and 8 are very closely related, and that they're also stated, I think the intent's the same as mine, but the way they're stated, it's too weak, it's not strong enough for the public to understand. And that is, I think, at least my intention, maybe I was the only one, but my intention was that we get the override, we're pledging that we're resetting with that new amount of money we've been giving, and we're gonna basically maintain that for at least a 5-year period. And if we got additional revenues, like some more money might start coming in for the schools. But we've already reset the schools to where we want them, except for anything that's mandated. And then the mandate would come out of that additional cash. But otherwise, that additional cash would become part of our revenue source. And we wouldn't spend because we have it. We're still maintaining the budget at the 21 level, short of inflation, and that we would use those new revenues rather than additional taxation. In other words, we wouldn't use 2.5, the override, 2.5, plus the new revenue. The new revenue would bring down that. We'd be under the level capacity,
It's not a way to reduce.
taxation
the
level.
budgets,
We
it's
would have
just
to go to the
where
limit.
you're getting it from, that's all. Right.
But I'm not sure how the wordsmithing, I know I'm trying to express what I mean, and
No,
maybe
yeah,
you
so
get
an
what I
example,
mean,
the
but
state has
how you say that, I'm not sure.
the Commonwealth has available for the to double the meals tax from the local option from 0.75 to 1.5. I don't actually think that will go anywhere, but that would be an example where we might see an extra $900,000 in revenue next year. The goal is that we wouldn't then just say, good, we get $900,000 more to spend, what do we want to spend it on? We would say, book that as a revenue, and then use your sort of levy limit last. I don't think it was designed for, okay, you know, this one went up here, all right, great, we spent $25,000 more here, cut this back here, but to that
If we
point.
got another $1 million, we wouldn't just increase the budget $1 million, we'd come under the levy limit by $1 million.
Right.
We wouldn't go to the levy limit. I'm not sure exactly how you say that, but, and you might say that's what its intent is, and I think it was, but I don't think it's clear enough to the public, because people are gonna say, oh yeah, and then you're gonna get another, no. We're pledging, we're not gonna go above that level, we're not gonna use every penny just because we get an extra penny thrown at us.
What about just
Bill,
altering that to say all available revenue streams, including state aid and any new revenue growth, will be used before maximizing the maximizing the levy? That addresses any new revenues that could potentially come in. I mean, I don't think you can make it so ironclad because you don't know what those revenues are gonna be, but that at least addresses and says, before we go to Dave and say we're gonna tax you
And part of those
more,
revenues
we'll
particularly,
use that new revenue.
part of those revenues particularly if they're school related may have mandates.
Well, that's the thing I wanted to talk about, is
I
that,
certainly would expect that
I don't
that
think
there's
we're
things,
gonna cover that mandate, it's the
Well,
balance,
well,
it's any balance.
the tricky thing is I don't wanna tie us in with language of mandates, because the governor's discussion about the Chapter 70, but there's the foundation budget. His work on the foundation budget, he's been talking about doing things where he's not mandating new things, but he's incentivizing towns to do that. If you do this, then that will increase your foundation budget and it will give you, so then I just don't want to I want to be in a position where we can maximize what the state is giving us, even if the state isn't calling it a mandate.
But they haven't actually proved that yet. And if-
No, they haven't,
and if-
right.
and if-
It just may come.
And I guess some of the legislature's saying they don't. So
Oh,
I
there's a
just-
lot of fighting that's still gotta happen over that. No, it's not a real thing yet,
But-
but
but
it's
if that-
a possibility in
but
the
if
5 years.
But if I understood you right, he's incentivizing us to do that, and if we don't do it, we don't get the money.
Right.
So,
Right, so I just want, but it's technically not a mandate.
yeah.
So I just, that was my only thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, in this, you've got that overall budget increase cap in there, and, you know,
That's a
you're
good
gonna have,
point.
I mean, so you have a little bit of what you're looking for, I think, already in there in a reasonable amount. And just to give people out there an idea, we have gained 80 English language learning students since the end of July. We are now at 360, and that is going to continue to grow. So that's an additional 80 students that we have to service, okay? So a lot of these, FTE ads and that sort of thing are mandated. So if we don't meet that, we're violating civil rights, okay?
But I think those
So-
are you're mixing apples and oranges. One, you're talking about your actual operating budget.
Right.
The other one, we're talking about the actual source of that revenue. So I
Yeah,
don't
I'm
think it's
perfectly
fair-
fine
okay.
with that piece.
Yeah.
Maximizing those revenues that come in is exactly what we should do before we look towards
So I think
local tax.
what we're talking about as an example, let's say we had one less elementary school and you leased it to some private entity for $1 million a year. I don't think that would actually happen, but that's an example of, okay, this is an unforeseen revenue stream. We're getting money from something else, an increase in a local option meals tax or something, that we want to try to use those before we maximize the levy limit. That's what I think we're talking about. So let's say in 2 years, we get a $4 million increase in state aid. We were only projecting 200,000. We wouldn't say, great, that's $4 million of new spending. And to Dave's point, because I agree we should have something in there, we are capped at 3.5%. So if we get other revenue streams in,
You're still capped.
we still have a cap.
So, but I think you could just add a few more words on number 8 and you have that.
Yeah, so if somebody can wordsmith that and make it a little stronger, I'd be happy with it.
What was your
But
proposed
But I think
language,
it's
Kelly?
weak the way it is.
Kelly,
My
so the all
language was
available-
all available revenue streams, including state aid and new revenue growth, before maximizing the levy limit each year.
And new revenue growth.
Which is basically what this town has done for years, which is why we never had to be in this position, so.
So going along with that, then, number 6, it seems silly that we would only review if substantial changes are made to state funding of education.
Do just state funding.
Change to state funding, so that, who knows, maybe Governor Baker decides roads are a priority and he's gonna
Right.
throw millions at roads. We would come back and review it again.
That's a fair
So,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, say that,
Take off.
It's just eliminating of education in 6.
okay.
okay.
I wonder if we
Yeah,
should-
that down
Alright.
is one of my things, okay.
I have two concerns. One is on 4, with the programmed health costs of 5%. Those could frequently be higher than that, and I would hate to see us tied into not being able to increase the budget and have to cut services because of that. I would rather see language saying like the average healthcare cost as produced by the Government Economic Advisory Board or
So
whatever that is.
we based the 5% on our, I think our 10-year average was 4.7%,
3.5.
3.5.
Really? Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
so that's why we picked a number that we felt was
My
was
company's
safe.
higher than that, so.
Arlington, I think, was 6. We've done well since we're in the GIC. We are a relatively high claims community out of GIC communities, so we sort of benefited by going into the GIC because their pool's a little bit better than ours. But we based it on that. We talked about should it be 6, should it be 5.5? We felt 4 was too low because we have had increases above 4, so we based it on our actual
Okay,
number.
okay, that could alleviate that. My second concern is on point 2, with limiting the increase in budget even if it's mandated. So that's my concern, that we're gonna put a 3.5% cap and Governor Baker could come in and say, you now have to spend $6 million on teaching kids to use their left hand as much as they use their right hand. And so now you've limited that we can't increase more than 3.5%, and now we're gonna impact the everyday student at the effect of a mandate. So that's concerning to me.
Sure, but that's sort of what we have to do. We do that now, where we do impact the everyday student at the result, at the
That's what
cost
we're
of the
trying to fix
mandate.
with the override though.
Yeah, but you'll never really fix that at the end of the day. I mean, that's something that is almost impossible to fix. We have mandated costs, we have to pay them, it has to come out of somewhere. We likely won't average that 3.5%. I think the school's projections are at 3.2 is roughly what the budget
Yeah,
may grow
it
at.
starts and then it drops to like.
Starts at
3.4.
3.5, then 3.4.
Yeah.
Right, and then it
So
drops to like.
that's where we sort of picked up with that 3.5 number, and again, that's a top number. We may not actually have that amount of money. So in the special ed, there's a 3.5% increase on top of that if it's a mandated special ed. But just like everything else, we only have limited funds. If we have costs growing somewhere that we can't control, it does have to come out of somewhere else. That's what we do sort of all day and every day.
What's the average special ed growth cost per year?
We don't really have a good metric on that, because it's hard to figure out exactly what percentage of the budget is special education, because it's spread throughout the
The thing that
district.
concerns me is what Dave just said, right? Dave just said we've had 80 new English
Yes.
language learners since July, right? So that's extremely concerning to me. That's a considerable amount of students considering our overall population. So we have what, how many kids in our school system?
About 3,500.
3,500. So that's about 4% of our population we've increased in special ed needs. That's why I'm concerned. And I would hate to see us tie ourselves into something where we continue to squeeze funds out of our general availability of budgeting for the masses of our students, for something we have to do. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, we absolutely should do it.
Even with the override though, so assuming the override passes, there's really not more than a 3.5% available a year. Well, that's a value, I'm just gonna put out there that is a value statement.
We could
That
say we're
money is
not
out there
gonna, we're not
spent.
gonna repair our schools anymore, sorry.
That is a value statement, that money is spent on other things.
Yeah, and I, you know, and I do, you know, and I do wanna make a point with the override ask. In that ask is investing in research-based programs for our classroom, which will eventually decrease some of these mandated costs. And, you know, back to the you have to invest in order to save money, that's what we need to do. We need to invest in we need to fix the structural deficit, and we need to invest in our classrooms to move our kids forward and to lower our high needs. 44% is astronomical. And part of that is we do not have the capacity to invest in research best practice in our classrooms. We are the people to do it. We have not been giving them the tools.
Can you
So-
historically say how much that would reduce the number of special education cases, like in terms of percentage per year or something like that? So if we invest this money up front, over 10 years, we'll expect our special education qualification rates to decrease by X.
It's kind of tough because there again, you could get a high special needs case that you certainly don't predict for, and it doesn't matter what your programming is, and it's a $150,000 a year cost.
But what about in terms of numbers? I'm not even talking costs. I get the costs. You know, you could have an outplacement that's $500,000 a year.
Well-
But in terms, how much do we expect that to actually decrease our qualifications of special education in our school system
Well,
if
right
we invest
now-
this money?
Right now, our average is around 20% for special ed, which is at least 4% higher than the state. So I would like to be closer to the state average than I am right now. The cost associated with that depends on the needs. So
Okay. So it's
that
like a
would-
25% reduction, 20%
I
reduction.
would love to be at 16.
Tom,
That's my long-term goal.
So-
And not simply for cost purposes only, Kelly. It's about quality for kids and what's going to have them be productive citizens in this community and in this community as a whole.
Absolutely.
I just want to point out that although mandated costs are more common to the schools, the town faces those too.
Yeah.
If we're negotiating a contract and we can't settle it and it goes to the
Absolutely.
Police and fire, yeah.
and they say, oh, well, you have to go up 8% on this contract, that's a mandated thing that we're not expecting. So I just
Stormwater might end
think
up
to try to
costing us a
identify
couple
the
years.
money, both sides, I think it's really difficult. And, you know, there's some judgment, what's mandated, what's not, you know, are we meeting this or not? So I personally think that 3.5% generally covers that. And then I think in general, if we have some major increase, something that's mandated, we're all gonna react to it and say, well, yeah, we have to
Correct.
figure out a way to
I think you're right. I mean, this is an agreement based on if everything sort of continues the way we think it is. If the governor does come down and says, all right, now you have to do this and it's a $4 million cost, of course I think we would step back and look at it, or some other substantive change like that. Again, we're basing a policy on we think this is how things are gonna work, things are gonna change. I don't think we're gonna come back next year and say, well, we projected this at $108,000, it's $109, so can we adjust the formula? But if there's something substantial changes, of course we're gonna come back. Just like our financial policies, we're gonna come back and say, well, wait a minute, this just isn't working. Teresa and then Maya.
Yeah, first, Kelly, thank you for bringing this up. I think it's really important that not just the school committee is questioning some of this related to education. I know this percent has been discussed at some of our meetings. I have hesitation about it. I know Mara has some hesitation, or she did the last time we all met together. And, you know, Joan just said something that I think needs to be said again. It's a value statement. And I think this is related to one of the policies we decided to table with the split. I think it's also related to the policy about fees, because if special education goes up and we're mandated, and now it's above the 3.5, why are we saying that then it's the school budget for general education that has to lose that additional increase? Why isn't it then coming back to the entire town? And we have to figure out where that additional money has to be adjusted. Why is it on the schools?
Or additional special ed costs?
If special ed goes up more than 3.5, it very clearly says here that the remaining school budget shall be decreased by the difference.
Sure.
That's not okay. And it's not okay for all our general ed students. So if special ed goes up more than 3.5, which is not something we have any control over, I think somehow the language needs to say
So
that.
just real quick, the language, the additional 3.5 is sort of what's allowed in a given year. So to break this down and say, simply, let's say our budget's $100 on each side to make it even. You can't go more than $103.50. The school department's limited to going to $103.50, but they can go up a little bit more for special ed.
Right.
So it's a goal to try to control the spending, but we understand that special ed isn't something you can just say it's 3.5, so we said that 3.5 on top of the regular 3.5. So if Dave said, all right, my budget this year is $103, ooh, I got an extra $2 in special ed costs, so it's gonna be 105. You look at the numbers and you say, okay, these are all those special ed costs, that's fine. But remember, that's also subject to the overall availability of funding, and to the point, you could say it's a value statement, but there's only so much new money available every year. Why does that come out of the school budget? If the trash fee goes up, if the electric cost on the police station goes up, it generally comes out of the general government budget. Part of these numbers were based on the school staff feels that the budget over the next 5 years, after the override, won't exceed 3.5%.
And I trust our staff. I don't trust our state, and I don't trust our federal government.
Sure.
And in the 2 years,
Well, but, you know,
no, I want to be really, but wait, Tony, I'm
Sure.
trying to make a point. In the almost the 2 years that I have sat in this seat, things are increasing, and they're increasing astronomically. 44.5% of our students, as Dr. Thomas said, is high needs. I mean, the people in this room and watching this and in our town, they have to understand that. And if you look at the data and you look at the trends, it's increasing. So does this sound great today? Yeah. Can I promise it's going to be this next year or the year after or the next 5 years when I may not even be on the school committee? Because this is a MOU we're putting in place for a while. I can't promise that. And I need this town to understand it is not okay to continuously sacrifice our students. And if special ed goes up, it's mandated. We have to cover it. We should cover it. I'm not arguing that. What I'm having a hard time with is it's really inequitable to then say that if special ed went up more than 3.5%, the school budget shall be decreased by the difference, because we're then talking about every other student in general ed. So if that is really truly what everybody in this room feels is okay, I would like you to tell me why that's okay.
So what would you suggest is the wording in between?
I just feel like, I don't know, there has to
But
be.
to put it in perspective, so let's say the general government
Instead
budget.
of just the school.
Just the school,
But
yeah.
let's just say the general government budget has to go up 3.9% 1 year. I have no choice, my costs go up, and instead of 3.5%, instead of $3.50, I gotta go up $3.90. Where does that extra money come out of?
So I think Tony was trying to follow you, but I lost you.
So just to put it in perspective, I know it sounds like we're beating up on the school department by saying, well, it's gotta come out of your budget. The general government budget's limited to 3.5%. So if our budget's $100, next year I can only go to $103.50. What if I have to go to $104? I don't, I go to $103.50, and I've gotta cut that 50 cents from somewhere else in the general government.
Okay, so then where is the language in here that says if there's a mandate on the general government side, that it's also gonna be taken out of the general government budget?
General government
it's
and
not
school
really true.
department operatings will be capped at 3.5%.
Do you have a projection for increased mandates? Like, we know that there's a projection for increased mandates. We know that the number of special ed students is
Unfortunately,
rising.
the
We
general
know
government side, it's all over the place. The state looks at hundreds of bills a year that end up just whacking us worse than education. The only thing we might be able to look at would be stormwater could end up becoming costly. You can do a stormwater utility fee. Our mandates are always, it's not as easy to predict. They're usually a little bit more stable.
So your mandates are more stable, our mandates are projected to rise.
Correct, that's why that extra 3.5% number, which is what the school staff felt was appropriate, was in there for special ed costs. And that's why there's not a cap on the positions for special ed and ELL if they're mandated. So I think general government is limited to adding no more than 2 positions a year, it doesn't matter. So if I need 5 a year, we don't have mandatory, we may have contractual staffing, for instance, but if I need to add 5 rec coordinators, let's just say, I have to take it out of somewhere else.
But what you
Whereas
were
if it's
just
ELL
about
or
to say is
SPED,
the important piece, it's the mandated piece.
Right.
You don't have those projected mandates. We have projected mandates that we know are going to continue to rise.
Right, so
That's
that's why
what the
that
problem is.
extra
So
3.5%
what I-
and the no limit
what
on
I
the
think,
spending is
Teresa-
built in
3.5%
there.
for both
What I think-
general government and schools.
What-
And then if there's a problem in those areas, an additional 3.5% for the schools.
Pretty sure we can guarantee there will be a problem. But I think what Teresa was saying, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's the restriction to the school budget instead of having that become a town-wide problem, and a problem that we all work together on to try to solve, versus we are going to continue to cut from the school department. And if I'm overstepping.
No.
For example, so our budget, and if I have the numbers wrong, correct me, but, so for the non-override budget that the schools just approved, there's $60,000 that we had to add in for a para at the high school for the task program, because we have, not the task program, the autism program, because that's a mandated need, and if we don't add in that position, you're now talking about out-of-district costs, so we're being very fiscally responsible by adding that back in. But if that need didn't arise, and if there was not that mandate, that would have been $60,000 in our non-override budget that I'm like 1,000% confident had other uses. So these are situations that come up all the time for a school committee.
Would you,
Does that make
would you
sense?
recommend changing it, like, what I think I heard Joan and Teresa say was that they would feel more comfortable, and you correct me if I'm misstating, that you would feel more comfortable if you change the language that the 3.5% would come out of the overall town budget, rather than just the 3.5% would come out of simply the school budget.
Yes.
And the same thing
Well,
would
it's gotta work both
would
ways then.
happen.
It's gotta work both ways.
That's just
Yeah.
it,
Because
the
that's-
same
Yep,
thing
I
would
agree.
happen.
Well,
agree with
but
that.
hold on, let me, I guess the additional 3.5% in the non-limit, we'll call it, on ELL and SPED mandated positions was added in to account for the fact that special ed is different. So we can't overcomplicate it. I get what you're saying conceptually, okay, so special ed has gone up, where does it come from? But then you're sort of treating special ed as a school cost plus kind of a weird shared cost.
Well, I think what we're
How do you
saying is that,
operationalize that?
I think what Teresa's saying is that if the special education goes up significantly, then basically we have to talk about the split.
Yeah.
Right? That we can't say, well, it all has to come out of just the school portion. And I absolutely agree that if there's some mandated thing that happens on general government side, it might not be fair for general government to have to absorb that giant change.
Right.
I think this is gonna be kind of difficult, because once someone brings something up, something's gotta be cut from somewhere. So,
Yeah.
you know, we're asking an awful lot for the taxpayer to say, fund the $6 million, and we can live under the parameters, and now we're saying we may not be able to because of certain mandated
I'm saying we're gonna deal with it.
mandated costs,
Yeah.
and, you know, there's only a certain amount of money that can be spread around, and what we're basically saying is, you want the special education costs within your budget, but if there's an increase, you don't believe an additional 3.5% will cover it, or if it is, you wanna be able to come back and share that with the town, which, so someone else has to take a cut as well, that, I
Well,
think
what-
we're really
what we're-
confusing the issue here.
What we're saying though is you said it right, like the cuts have to come from somewhere.
Right.
And I think how I'm reading this is that you're artificially limiting the pool of where the cuts can come from. They can only come from the school budget.
Well, it's, I mean, Joan, I understand the point, but I mean, this is why we pay these people all this money to manage this stuff. I mean,
You can't manage special ed.
This isn't, I mean, this isn't, this override is not gonna pass without something like this, without a pledge to the taxpayers that we're gonna limit it. We have the numbers for the next several years. It's a 5-year plan. We've got to at least make it work 5 years. I mean, now you're saying you can't even make it work in year 1.
No, that's not what we're saying.
That's not what I'm saying at all. So,
That's what I was gonna have.
no, it's not what I'm saying. We're making a pledge to the community, and I'm not saying we need more funds. I'm saying we're working within a certain amount together, right? This is supposed to be a collaboration. I have to be honest, very often it does not feel like collaboration. And I think there's a lot of people who are advocating for this override, for the entire town, but sometimes they don't feel like it's collaboration either. And I think as a school committee and Dr. Thompson, we have been so transparent. And we are telling people, if there's an override, these are the things for the education system the override is gonna cover. So we're making that pledge too, and that's on us, and I take that really seriously. So 5 years out, something happens, state funding changes negatively, federal government takes away more grant money, 80 more ELL kids come in the next 6 months. Look at the trends in education. It's not a happy picture. So things change. We're now over this 3.5 number, and this MOU that you want me to sign, and all of us to sign, says that if those costs go up more than 3.5%, the remaining school budget shall be decreased by the difference. So what does that mean? That then means the positions that we are telling people with the override could be added because it's needed, whether it's the foreign language so we can meet state requirements or all the other great things that we know we need, those things are then gonna be cut. So then I'm also not staying within the parameters of an override and what we're promising the public. Does that make sense?
If we get a bad special ed year.
Excuse me, can I
Sorry.
hop in for a second?
Actually,
This is where we have to collaborate, because if those things happen to the school department, and the school department needs to go back and, as you say, sort of go back on their promises to the voting public that has given you money to utilize within the schools, the same thing has actually happened to the general government, because it would probably most likely depend on some economic news, and the general government at the same time, this is where the finance commission ends up in the middle, at the same time, that is probably also happening to general government. So general government is probably most likely looking at taking cuts themselves, right? And so this is where, our budget balancing, this is where we are working together. So maybe instead of putting some numbers in there, we put in a discussion where we will all collaborate and work together to see where best we can utilize the funds that we have.
I think that's fair. And if it comes back in that collaborative process that it does have to be reduced on the school side, okay. But just to right now say that is definitely what is going to happen, I just don't think you're going to get the support from the school committee if this language stays when we vote on it.
I think that,
If we don't, you're not gonna get the override passed.
yeah, I mean, that's, I think Bill's right on that. I mean, I don't think we're talking about, what we're talking about is just the normal, ordinary course of events. I think any substantial changes to anything on either side would bring everyone back to the table. So right now, we have to provide a paraprofessional for an ELL student, right?
But it's actually a teacher, paraprofessionals don't cost
I'm sorry.
That's all right, that's all right.
That's why I said
I just don't want people to
No,
think
it's
that.
the
Let's
teacher.
give
Yeah.
so, but as an
Yeah.
example, let's say the state came out and said, now you've gotta provide 2 for every ELL student. It's gonna cost us $800,000.
Right.
I get your point that it shouldn't be, haha, you guys got stuck with a really bad mandate and, we're buying new carpet for the town manager. I don't think that's the intention. I think any substantial changes to anything, the revenue, the expenses, or something like that, that all of a sudden is gonna put a huge burden on either side, we would of course be coming back to the table, because it's no longer a, haha, you signed up for 3.5%. So you have a situation in 3 years where the state doubles the number of paraprofessionals you have to hire, and then they go to the town and say, we're gonna go back to funding the Quinn bill, so now the town has $800,000 more in its budget. We would of course anything substantial. I think this is designed at saying in the ordinary course of a year, we're just trying to say it's 3.5, but we're making these exceptions for special ed. That's why they're in there, so that we're not just saying you only have 3.5% and we don't care about special ed. I don't wanna say there's no limit, but we've exempted mandated positions on special ed. And then you're talking about that additional 3.5. So I think anything substantial that the state would change, we would of course be coming back to the table if there was all of a sudden $1 million mandate. Or if you're getting a substantial grant for $700,000 a year from the federal government and that gets wiped out, we're gonna have to look at that. That would be one of those one-year adjustments where you say, okay, well, you make the change for anything substantial.
Doesn't this say that town government, which includes schools, general government and schools, won't increase their budget more than 3.5%. But if there are mandated, related, increased expenses to the schools in this area, they can go up to 3.5% more.
Right.
Correct.
So if we were at 50 and 50%, if we were at 50 and 50% of the split, they would get 53%, we'd only get 47%.
Yeah, to your point, you're right.
And then, if your cost is actually more than that, you have to find it in your budget. So the general government is conceding that if it's mandated costs, schools get that much more automatically. I mean, it's already here that we're contributing if we all collectively come into that situation.
I think there's a recognition that there are, I'm sorry, yeah, you have, Mr. Bishop.
There's been a lot of hypotheticals here going back and forth. I think what I wanted to bring out later, that this is proving my point, is there's a value in these joint meetings. And we've kicked the can around the road a lot today. We solved some problems, we haven't solved all the problems, we have a long way to go. But I think my point was communication. We have to meet more like this on some kind of a basis to communicate back and forth. I think it's been very healthy for me today to sit in front of the school committee and listen to them and sit in front of the finance commission. So my point is, at some point in time, I would like to have us think about further discussions. We're not gonna solve this problem this morning. And I respect your passion, you know I do. But there's a lot of discussion going forth, and we have to have that discussion.
Does this say what I just said it is, or am I misinterpreting?
That is,
Does it-
let's-
Bill, you are correct.
So
Voice of reason.
doesn't that cover your concern that
No.
schools aren't absorbing the whole thing? We're actually absorbing up to the first 3.5% of those costs. You only have to absorb anything over 3.5%.
On top of this.
Really over 7%.
Over
Yeah.
7.
So
Well,
Correct.
Right.
I would just like to
Which
make,
is not a real
make one,
thing, that's
Yes.
one observation here is that when this policy was developed, I mean, you go out and you look at other communities, you try to find their best practices. So this is the exact, virtually the exact language that's used in the town of Arlington. A town that has been able to manage its override for a 7-year period. So it might be interesting to go to Arlington and see if they've had that experience. But I think the tools exist to address the issues on special education. You have the split you can look into. The school committee could manage a special purpose stabilization fund to fund special aid funds to use in the future. There are tools there. I think if you start at this point to modify some of these languages that you have here in those first two, I think the approach that all three boards to agreement is going to be much more challenging. I think the criticism I've heard from the MOU, I don't agree with it, is that it has too many holes in it. I don't really think it does. But I think if we get to the extent where we're modifying the language, that's substantially, when we have other tools that can address those issues, I think that mitigates against modifying that language significantly. I just think the tools are there.
You know, one other quick item, the line 6 that says, you know, the agreement will be modified or looked at if there's substantial changes to state funding. You know, that could include mandates and other changes. I mean, the economy could tank 5 days after the override, God forbid, and we're all looking at a different situation. Again, if the state comes out with $1 million education mandate, we're all gonna be sitting at the table. If we have to do $1 million in stormwater work every year, we're all gonna be sitting at the table. If the state starts giving us $6 million for roads, I guess we would just spend it on roads. I don't know how that would necessarily impact things, but we would maybe move some of that money around. So I think it's 3.5% on top of 3.5%. Plus, we're not limiting the positions needed for special ed. I get your point that at some point the school department is absorbing all these costs, and if we're doing this to, I think the point is we're doing this to improve the school system and maintain where it is, and in 4 years of these costs eating up so much. But if it throws the whole financial balance out of whack, then the override itself isn't working. We've got a bigger problem. That's why, I mean, again, that language was in there to address that point.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I just want to clarify what Bill said, because I know what he's reading, but it's not 3.5% of the total budget that gets increased. We're talking about
Just the
3.5%
sped
of
portion.
the, of sped
But that's what she's
slash
concerned,
ELL.
but that's
Right.
what
I don't
she's
want some
concerned
friction
about.
out
Right.
there.
Going up.
When
No.
you say
Right.
57,
Right.
40, whatever it is,
Right.
it's not, it's that.
Right, right.
And I want to echo Paul's, I think this is very helpful, and I think we're all in agreement that we're going to work together to resolve if a major issue comes up. No one's going to be sitting on this table that I know of and say, well, that's your problem to deal with, you know, you got $48 million, make it work. Not when there's $2 million on the table that you didn't know about. So I'm not overly concerned. I think we will if something comes up.
So I just wanted to remind everybody that, like, the purpose of the MOU, and, you know, I think we have said that this is a promise to the taxpayers, that we're saying to them, like, look, this is what our plan is, but I also think it's a reminder. We have said that we've done 5-year projections. Based on those 5-year projections, we expect that this override will last for 5 years. But we need our own reminder of what we said what were the constraints that went into that plan. And we're not saying that the constraints will never change, but it's like, if something does change, we need to remember that, well, all these pieces went together so that we could get to that 5-year plan. And if things change, we have to then consider how all the other pieces change as well. So that, I just think is important that we think about that as we're working on this.
How about if we make some changes to this number 2, okay? So first of all, my thought is that when we're discussing this, number 2, we have to acknowledge that everything affects both the general government and the school committee. So how about changing general government and school operating will be capped at 3.5? Okay, so how about second line would be, an exception would be allowed beyond the 3.5% for both general government and school department for unfunded state and federal mandates, and increased costs for special education and early language learners. So that includes both the general government and the schools. So that's inclusive. And
My
then,
suggestion, if I could, the problem is with a statement like that, I think now, to Bob's point, you're putting a lot of holes in it. I think it might be better under line 6.
okay.
Yeah.
Can we do it?
Under line 6.
Think you take
Why
line
can't we
2,
just change the 2
the
for the
first
budget?
sentence and drop everything
Hold
else.
on, stop. Bill, then Alan, then Kelly.
I think you take your second paragraph, you put in the first sentence and drop everything else. Because everything else is then adjustments in the budget that we have to go through the budget process. The 5-year plan for this override working has been projected off of a 3.5% increase. How the lines that make up that budget change, we have to deal with every budget season.
So
That's what we do now.
So hold on,
What do you want?
Alan, hold on, we gotta.
just clarify what Bill says where.
The first sentence and drop the rest of it.
It's first sentence in number 2. So
I
you drop
actually
in-
think we should just change it to the town's operating budget. Take out general government, school department, and say the town.
Sure.
And that gives flexibility to say the 3.5% can come out of anywhere.
Right.
So maybe the town's budget goes up 5%, schools only goes up 2.5%,
And the rest
or that was
the rest
bad
we have
math.
to deal
Yeah,
with.
I like that.
You know what I mean, 2%.
This is supposed to say our pledge to the,
Yeah.
about the override, what we're gonna do with it. We're gonna
If
make
you
the
just-
town's budget, as
And if
you're
you say the
saying.
town, then that makes it generic enough so we can deal with fluctuations
You all right
and
with that?
differences.
Yeah.
And I think that solves the whole problem, I think.
Yep.
Teresa, you tell me.
Yeah, it was that one sentence that I just feel you're asking.
It looks
us-
like you're pointing out something specific about the schools, and that's not the
It's
intent.
not, it's just,
So
we should just
actually,
say the
it's
town.
just showing we're gonna
that we will
help.
not,
Yeah.
but,
So
I'm
then,
okay with that, I just want to make sure, are the projections we've done,
Yeah,
do they come to that?
Right.
They do,
well, and
right?
remember, this is a maximum, that money may not be there. We could see huge revenue streams decrease, and even next year, we could see a budget that gets submitted that's 4% lower than the previous year.
Right.
We're not guaranteeing that 3.5% is there. What we're all saying is collectively, and we'll probably have to throw a quick little capital aside in there, but we will not exceed the budget by 3.5% a year.
Right. If I could just jump in here, and the projections, I think it's 3.2, 3.23, and then it drops down to 2.5. And again, I mean, based on where we are now, as Tony had said, but 3.5% is a generous number, and having some flexibility beyond that should be doable, especially if we're investing, because we have not done it for a long period of time, investing in the tools the teachers have in the classroom. Okay, you're still gonna have your student that maybe needs an out-of-district placement for a physical or cognitive issue, and those come up, but we need to educate more of ours, and we've done a good job of that in the school system, keeping kids in the district with their peers in their community.
And I think we're there.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not done yet. So that 3.5% should be enough, based on the projections. And again, we don't know what the future is. But another 3.5 on top of that should also be enough. But I agree with my colleague, we don't want to get in a position where we are now, where we're stealing from the general education to supplement special education. And I'll be honest with you, more of an issue right now is the ELL piece. Because that is mandated, a certain amount of services, and the people to do it, we just don't have right now.
You know, David, though, you made a good, I'm sorry, but you made a good point earlier, though, about how getting them early will help you reduce costs later, which I think, Teresa, that might be some sort of a comfort in that sense, too. We talk about rising costs, I mean, that's the action that we're
But I'm gonna
taking
give you,
to sort of mitigate that. And also, I think the number of, this is totally out, maybe out of, the number of out-of-district tuition students this year is actually lower than last year, is that true?
Yeah.
So that might be a good trend, too.
right, and we can do better.
Okay,
If we have the tools, we can do better.
all right.
With our ELs, if we have the tools, we can do better. But we don't have all the tools. So instead of having kids for 2 years needing 4 hours a day of directed instruction, you move them out and move them up. Not only does that help your kids learn more and have a brighter future, but it decreases the amount of people you need. But if you don't have the tools to do the personalized learning with them, in that situation, they don't move as fast, so then you need more people. So this is the perpetual, this crisis budget that the schools have been in is actually costing more for specific populations. Okay?
So if we get,
Now,
if the override
and-
will help.
and with this is not a spendthrift thing. This is investing in what we need to do the job better, lower our high needs numbers, lower our out-of-district and our out-of-the-classroom piece, because you learn best in the classroom with your peers, with your content level teacher.
And I just want, the first year, by the way, based on, if the override passes the 5.95, the year one increase is about 6.2%, right?
Yeah.
On the school side, and then we get to the 3.5. So it's not the very first year of
Right.
3.5,
This
it's
is
subsequent years.
That actually
Okay.
should probably be clarified in there. So,
Okay.
as a suggestion, because Dave and I did work on the additional 3.5 language and the additional FTE language, what if we just say the town budget shall not exceed
I think that.
3.5%,
That's
but still keep that additional spend.
Yes.
And maybe we don't say it specifically, but just put a line in there about, something about exempting special ed, or not exempting special ed, but mandatory special ed, and just keep it to special ed, just because we would all come to the table if there was, special ed and ELL, sorry. But hold on, we would all come to the table if there was a fundamental change in, but hold on, we'd all come back to the table if there was a fundamental change in mandates as a whole. The concern, I think, with the special ed and the ELLs, you may have that one case where it's $400,000 and it eats up everything. So that might be where we say, okay, we're gonna go up a little bit more than this, or, we'll cut over here to allow for that. If we could add language to part 6 that would then say, of course, any major changes in revenue or expenditure streams or mandates, we're all gonna come back to the table. Bill, you had a point?
No, I was just gonna say, this is the overall 3.5% is what we've planned we're gonna spend or less a year through these 5 years.
Yeah.
And if there's any one line that changes drastically, within that cap, like every year we have a budget cap, we have to make an adjustment. So if schools get hit by a unforeseen tsunami and, they need another $10,000 or $30,000 or, more, $300,000, it might have to come out of general government. That's what the budget process we do, but we're telling the voters, we're not gonna do
More than 3.5%.
3.5% a year, and that makes the project, the plan work. That's all we're saying here, I think.
I think just changing that one thing from government and schools to just say the town, I think addresses it, and it gives flexibility to balance the budget however you want.
Right.
And I think it addresses everyone, and it doesn't weaken the language anymore.
Yeah.
I
Right,
think,
and it's
is
still-
that
and
fair,
it's still
Teresa? Because that was your,
Right, and it's still promising without putting, we've had this conversation about being in a position of breaking a promise to the town or breaking the promise, or breaking the law.
Yeah.
But it gives me enough flexibility that if we have another 80 PLLs move in next year, and right now, there are federal grants that help us cover some of those costs. We don't know if they'll be there in 2 or 4 more years, but right now there is. It's not enough to cover all of it, but if that swing happens, it gives me the flexibility where I'm not breaking a promise to the town.
And at the end of the day, it's the responsibility of everyone involved, but in particular the Finance Commission, to question the schools on what those expenses are. So as we said, we're talking about mandated special ed, so it's not, all right, let's just add 15 assistant directors of special ed. You would need to come in and say, we've got a $400,000 increase in special ed. Well, why? I had these 4, and I include ELL and special ed, but we had these 4 mandated positions, here's the proof of that, and then here's this one out of district cost. Because the taxpayer concern is gonna be when it sounds as if the school department or the school committee is saying, we can't limit spending, we have no limit on
That's
spending.
not what I was saying.
No, I understand that's not what you're saying,
I
but
just want to be
there-
clear, that's not what I was
Correct,
saying.
but it just sometimes it comes off as, well, you can't cap or limit the spending, but we understand your concern that, you know, certain costs you just can't control. So the check system there is, the checks and balances we have in, that when Dave submits a budget that has a huge increase, well, why? Here's what's mandated, here's the revenue streams that we lost, and then again, that's the budget balancing, well, let's have this conversation. It's one thing to say, well, all right, you had an unexpected $500,000 cost, well, general government's only gone up 2.2% this year instead of 2.5%, versus we just want, what some taxpayer fear is, you just wanna spend more on things as opposed to you have to, which we know is not the case, but that way, you know, sure, maybe you go cut the police and fire departments because we have to have this cost over here. There's a fear of people that, well, you're gonna go cut it over here just because you want more over here.
Tony, can I ask one question,
Yeah,
by the way?
sure.
Just in relation to Kelly's language, if we, I think probably you want to say beginning in FY '21, because the first year is
Yes.
higher than 3.5.
Yes, for everybody, yeah.
Also, Kelly said the towns, and I'm not sure it was capital T or small t, but do we want to make the distinction that that doesn't include utilities and
Well, I think
shared costs?
we should say non-utility, because at the end of the day,
The town's non-utility budget.
correct, yeah, that's probably what we should.
Sounds non-utility, non-shared costs, or
No, I would see, here's the thing with the shared costs, if health insurance went up 20% next year, nobody's getting 3.5%.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's not available, so.
so
We still only
non-utility.
have this much money for the rest of the
Yeah.
5
Right,
years.
right. You know, we have some control over the debt service, but, you know, the pension and the health insurance costs, we don't. So we don't want that to grow at 9%, but unfortunately, if that grows at 9%, it grows at 9%. And remember, that 3.5 is a aspirational goal. It could be 2 1 year, it could be 1 year, it could be negative based on how everything goes.
All right, so if you say beginning in FY '21, the town's non-utility operating budget increases shall be capped at 3.5% per year, and I would remove the parentheses, by the way, it's the old English teacher, it's not a parenthetical statement, subject to availability of funds, period.
Yes.
See, that's a
And
bureaucratic
that's
thing
my
to say, well, it's a parentheses, it's not really part of
So
it.
that's it for number 2. We're not going,
That's
we're
what-
not
that's what
taking
Kelly's
in the rest of
proposing.
That's my
that statement.
recommendation.
Okay.
Is there consensus on that?
Can somebody just go through that language, just, again, just to make sure? What's number 2 saying?
Beginning in FY
Norwood's
'21.
operating, beginning in FY '21.
Beginning in FY '21, the town's non-utility operating budget increases will be capped at 3.5% per year, subject to availability of funds.
Period.
Period.
Yep.
Right?
Could be less if the funds aren't available.
Yeah.
No
That's the subject.
ELL,
And
no
it'll never be
sped,
more.
no
That's
nothing
subject to
in there.
availability of funds. Again, it could be negative
Could be
1
less,
every
but it'll
year.
never be more.
Do we therefore need to make any changes to number 3, which does specifically reference SPED and ELL, grant-funded positions, et cetera? Should we just leave it alone?
No, I think we leave
Leave
it
that
alone, because
alone.
what we're saying is,
Okay.
look, we're not gonna grow our operations just to grow our operations. We're not doing this just to be a
Okay.
spendthrift. And what we're saying is that general government will limit its ads, the school department will limit what it's at in beginning in FY '21, absent the fact that there are special ed and ELL costs. I mean, the fact that, you know, no more than 5 benefited positions added in 1 year in the school budget, that's actually very generous. The best case scenario, you're rarely gonna be able to add 5 positions.
Our budget won't support adding it, you
Exactly,
know, like we'd
that's
have
why-
to,
So, I
yeah.
mean,
All
that's
right, and
you may have a good
That's
year or a
fine.
bad year.
And
but-
then the number 4, health cost increases, we're going to keep that the way it's
I'm
written
fine
here.
based on what, the research that Tony shared.
Correct.
Okay, and then number 5, allocation, road pavement, et cetera, we do make a distinction here, we're talking specifically about general government, but it is a general government function,
Sure.
so that's okay. I just say number 4, we say the town and school budget total shall be proportionally decreased. I think we probably have to leave the 2 in there, is that,
Well, I would say that should say general government and school, because the schools are part of the town.
Yeah, that's fair.
yes, I agree.
That's fair.
The GG, okay, and then number 6, agreement will be reviewed if substantial changes are made to state funding, period.
Period.
Actually,
This
no,
document-
sorry, just going back to number 4,
Yep.
we don't even necessarily need to say that, we can just say that, I mean, if healthcare costs go above that, the idea is that you're splitting it, it comes out as a shared cost for us anyway. That language we took in Arlington, they do it a little bit differently, so if health insurance goes in at 9%, guess what, that's less money available for everyone. So we can just wordsmith that a little bit, but I think that language was originally both sides, but we don't do it that way, it's a shared cost, it comes
It's
out
true,
off
yeah,
the
all
top.
right, okay, all right, so you'll make a couple of changes.
I thought from line 3 down, we didn't need in number 4. Same thing.
So,
Yeah.
my question, to Tony and the group, is this document only in effect if the override has?
Yes.
Yes.
So it doesn't say that anywhere,
That's a good point.
That's a really good point.
At the top, assuming the override passes, comma, this document shall be adhered to.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I think we should say that, because otherwise, it's just back to the
No, we would, it would be made very clear that this is only related to the override, and it's
Just
not,
remember,
and
Tom's
it's
right.
certainly non-starter
We can,
otherwise.
we can add that, but remember, number one does say override funds, so at least it starts off with
Maybe
discussion.
it should say an override promise to the provider.
Yeah.
Whatever.
All right, so, Tom, where did we leave off? We cleared number 5, number 6, we will change to say funding, and we'll put some language in there just about, I mean, obviously, if there's substantial changes to anything, we're gonna come back to the table. If the state next year, it's not gonna happen, but they pass a local income tax and we have $15 million more a year, of course, we're gonna come back to the table. We're not gonna sit here and say, well, you know. And number 7, and we talked about some, number 7, OPEB is fine, we just won't decrease that. And there again, if all of a sudden the state started funding our OPEB, I think we'd come back and say, well, yeah, we're gonna decrease the OPEB line. I mean, we can't have too many what-ifs. And number 8, we talked about just, yeah. Any other thoughts or questions on the override MOU?
No, that, now by eliminating all that language now, you leave a little room at the bottom for the signatures.
Yeah.
Always thinking, just one.
What increase?
Hold on,
What's the timeline?
to 4 points.
If we could, sorry, the,
With the timeline that all the boards are gonna vote on this, because I know FinCom.
I would hope early May before town meeting, if not by the end of this month. I mean, is there general consensus with the changes we've talked about? Can I get a head nod? We'll do the
Yes.
consent, Board of Selectmen.
Yeah, what?
That the changes we've suggested.
We're getting a clean copy.
Are you guys okay with this, with the proposed changes? I'm not.
Committee, there's at least 2 of you here.
I have one thing that I think we should consider when you make the changes, that everything that we've talked about has been basically, you know, an increase to costs because of mandates for the schools. I think you should also include in some way in the language that there also can be increased costs due to mandates for the general government's budgets.
Sure, I think that language in
So-
part 6 would be, we would
So,
have,
right.
we would come back to the table, so to speak, if there's any substantive changes that we
But
could.
use that consistently through the document.
Yes.
Any other challenges, questions, comments on the override MOU? So otherwise, we'll get this redone middle of the week and get it out to everyone for approval by the end of the month, as soon as your board can realistically.
The school committee is meeting on Wednesday, so if you can get us, updated language on Tuesday, we could discuss on
Yeah.
Wednesday.
Can you do it by Monday? We're meeting. on
Well, I mean, the FinCom meets on the 18th, so we can certainly take a vote before the 18th. That'll be well before town
Maybe
meeting.
either Tom or I will work over the weekend to make sure we get the updated language out to everyone for.
Oh, so we're meeting on Tuesday and then 2 weeks thereafter.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to take an opportunity to thank everybody. The crowd is starting to dwindle here. It's a nice afternoon, and I want you all to have a chance to get out and enjoy it somewhat. But I think this has really been, like I said before, a healthy discussion. I think we should do this in the future. Something may come up with your board or our board or your board, that we can come together and try to work this out. Communication, I think, is the key to it. And then lastly, I want to take an opportunity to thank Noah and Community Media.
Good job.
Poor guys probably didn't sign up for 4 hours on a Saturday.
Before everyone goes, we don't have to discuss it, but it was sent out, was the proposed MOU regarding facilities. There were substantial changes made at the request of members of the school committee. And at some point, we do need to discuss it, because it is a budget matter. Tony has included money to take care of some things, and I know the school committee has to, at some point, accept it if they want to go through with it this year. I think in general, everyone agrees it's probably the right move to make. The question is, are we documenting everything to make people feel comfortable that this is really how it's gonna happen? So I would ask people at some point, maybe the next time we get together, we can
All the more reason to come.
review it, right, but if they could take a look at it.
This year, because we already have adjusted the general government budget, and it's going to,
No, I-
pre-crest.
We could fairly easily move it.
Yes,
sort
so
of back
we're only
where-
talking 2 positions regarding for this year.
You can make that move at town meeting if we had to.
Okay.
Yeah,
It's not getting from the budget book.
No, I understand, Tom. It wasn't intended to, because we had said we wanted more time to walk through the process and the documentation, so.
Conceptually, I'd be okay with, even if we went back, whether we do it at town meeting, and budgeted for it to happen the way we think we will, and if it doesn't, I mean, money never gets lost, it's not like we're gonna go spend it otherwise. And then that way, if we do realize by summer, we're sort of ready to go at some point, it's sort of built in, ready to go. But Dave and I, Dr. Thompson and I met last week actually on facilities, or this week, I can't remember, it all kind of blurs together. We had a conversation at some point about it, and we're gonna meet again and spend a little bit of time looking at the shared cost formula, because that'll come down to sort of, if it all gets booked on the general government, that's fine, but only general government benefits from the savings we might see. So we sign a new energy contract, we see a lot of energy efficiency, it's great, general government is saving a ton of money, the schools aren't saving anything, so we might wanna be cognizant of how we want to do that.
Well, would the facilities department, maybe hadn't thought it out this far, would they be responsible for everything having to do with the facilities? Would they already be paying the utility costs? Or would the utility costs still stay in general government budgets, still stay in school
We
budget?
could do that either way, realistically.
If it's in the shared costs, then you don't have to worry about the savings, it goes back to the shared cost.
Right. So those are some of the details that, we just gotta sit down and see how it would impact the formula. We've covered just about everything on our agenda except the FY '21 budget process, but we can talk about that a little bit later, because we're, not yet in FY '20. Does anyone have any further questions? So we've come to an agreement on our financial management policies, we'll update those and get them out. And, we've come to an agreement on an MOU that I believe every board will be approving. Any further questions, comments?
Move to adjourn.
Declare us adjourned.
Second.
Thank you.
Tony, I give you 9.5 for today's performance.